He leaned in and bared his past, an orphan since childhood who fought monsters for coin. Later he learned the kingdom already hailed him as the #1 A-rank adventurer. The main character and several others rode the platform as a grinning, toothy monster's severed head rode before them. Jubilant crowds surged in from every side, and a massive arch towered behind the platform. Aldred flashed a grin and waved as people of every age burst into cheers, shouting his name. He began to lower her hand and thought he no longer had problems in life and was no longer hungry. Aldred stood in the spacious room, flashing a sweet, practiced smile at the people around him while several round tables dotted the floor. Aldred's grin vanished. He released a heavy, ragged breath and dropped his eyes to the floor as a small cluster a few steps away watched him, faces tight with embarrassment. Aldred strode down the street, 27 years old and wondering how much longer he could stay an adventurer. Lately he'd been living in the capital, and strange personalities had begun reaching out to him, and he pictured the faces of the women and the man. Aldred sat in the open field, staring skyward as a sprawling mansion loomed behind him. Flowers ringed him, and a tailwind snatched their petals into the air. Darkness swallowed the outside as the mansion's lights guttered out, and windows across the city suddenly flared to life. Aldred sat hunched at a round table in the room, a candle flickering and wooden mug sweating with drink on the table. 3 others pressed around him. Then a man suddenly roared that Aldred really wanted to disband the team. The dark-haired man closed his eyes and declared he'd foreseen this outcome. The blonde froze, stunned by the revelation. The girl's cheeks burned as she whispered that it might actually be true. Leaning on the table, the dark-haired man growled that the leader had made the decision himself. The guys might still be young, but he was almost 30, and Aldred looked away, saying maybe the guys had already figured out what they'd do next. The blonde flashed a grin and announced he'd been invited to join the Royal Knights, and the guys reeled, stunned into silence. The dark-haired guy declared he was setting off on a trip. The girl flushed and confessed she'd been invited to the Royal School of Magic and planned to study there. They pressed Aldred for his next move. Aldred's smile softened as he confessed he longed for a peaceful life in Norland. The men gaped at their leader, stunned. They kept debating Aldred's plan. Aldred instantly regretted confiding it, and the blonde guy stepped up to back him. Aldred shut his eyes and admitted he'd long dreamed of seeing one flower field again. The guys gaped. They'd never seen him like that. Aldred drained his mug as the dark-haired man pressed him again about his plans. Aldred set the mug on the table, bowed his head, and declared he was no longer hungry. From now on, he intended to live carefree. The guys locked eyes with Aldred and backed his decision, then snatched wooden mugs and smashed them together in a thunderous clatter. Aldred rode in a creaking cart, staring out the window as he replayed breaking the team up to silence needless noise. He's convinced he did the right thing, but the road ahead is long. A month later, Aldred perched on the wagon's roof as it slammed to a stop. Someone shouted they'd arrived, and he cracked his eyes open, hauled himself to his feet, and swept his gaze across the scene. Aldred gasped as a tiny settlement slid into view, grapevines coiling around the crowbars. He breathed the permitted name, Norland, and eyes wide reached out and touched the grapes. A girl in a hat cut straight up to Aldred. The guys clustered, arguing about where he'd come from. She tipped her hat and said her name, Aisha. The guys wove through a sleepy rural settlement, bright blossoms crowding the street, and Aldred savored every sight with a smile. Along the trail, the guys ran into locals busy harvesting crops. Aisha announced they'd reached the elder's house, and Aldred grinned at the flowers in front of the house. Aldred grinned. He'd been here 9 years ago, and the flowers still took his breath away. Aisha stepped into the house and a girl met them inside. A blonde woman barreled up to the guys, scoffing that Aisha had really shown up with company, and Aisha slammed her hands on her belt, proclaiming, "He's from Avalon and he plans to live here." She snapped her hand up and told the men to turn to her husband. Aisha jammed on her hat and braced to leave. Aldred gave a sharp, grateful nod and thanked her for her help. The woman spun to warn the head that they had a guest from Avalon. The men clutched books and declared him an elder. Albus burned to know why Aldred had come to them. Aldred's cheeks flared as he confessed he'd fallen head over heels for this place's beauty on his last visit. Albus flashed a knowing smile and said other villagers had come for the same reason. The blonde woman chatted nearby. Aldred's cheeks flamed when the tea's aroma struck him. A steaming cup of apple mint tea rested on the table, and he lifted the mug, sipped and sighed. This is so relaxing. The man and the woman beamed, exclaiming Aldred had finally relaxed after being so gloomy. Aldred flushed with embarrassment, and Albus urged him to drop the shyness and just be himself from now on. Aldred shot his hand up in joy. The man and woman locked eyes and burst into laughter. Albus reassured him he could stay with them for now and they'd find a place for him later. Aldred sank into a chair and abruptly dropped his head, and the woman laughed again. Albus planted his hands on the table and snapped, "Whatever you're plotting next, Aldred, lunch is still a long way off." And Aldred's cheeks flamed as he paused to think. Aldred suddenly stood in the street, locked his gaze forward and breathed, "At last. I'm back in this place." Petals whirled around Aldred as he gaped at the vast field of flowers, tears welling and tracing wet paths down his face. Aldred froze as shock slammed into him. He frantically wiped tears with his sleeve while petals spiraled and plants erupted into bloom, his cheeks blazing, and when he stared at his hand, a single flower petal lay there. Aldred strode across the field, thinking how the flowers here shift color with the seasons. He couldn't even remember who'd told him. Then he froze, looked up in surprise, and saw the girl standing ahead. Her long blonde hair cascaded down her back, a braided flower ornament crowning her head. She felt someone's presence at her back, spun, and Aldred stood there. Aldred. She sat amid a sea of blooms, a tiny bouquet clenched in her hands, and Aldred felt a jolt of curiosity. Who was this girl swathed in flowers? A single bead of sweat sprang to Aldred's brow as he gaped at the girl, jaw slack, while her cheeks flamed crimson with embarrassment. Aldred locked his gaze on her and murmured a shy hello. Her cheeks flamed hotter as she stared at him, clutching a bouquet. Then she began to fidget and make strange little noises. She snapped into a quick bow, chirped, "Good morning, Aldred," then bolted, and Aldred, wide-eyed, blurted that he really did look terrifying. Evening fell, darkness spread and stars pricked the sky, and Aldred strode into Aldous' house shouting that he was back. Heat flamed across Aldred's face as a blonde woman stepped before him smiling. He told himself it was fine if someone waited at home, while Albus set plates on the table, and he and Aldred slipped into a spirited conversation about the flower field's beauty. Aldred sank into his seat at the table, heat rushing to his cheeks when Alba whispered, "This place is magical." Rolling onto the cool grass felt like pure relief, and he and the other residents always went there to relax. Heat flooded Albus when his wife said they'd met under that tree, the exact spot where he'd dropped to one knee. He implored Fiona not to humiliate him, then told Aldred he had to meet their daughter. Aldred's cheeks flared crimson the moment he spotted the blonde at Albus's side. Albus announced she was Flora and that Aldred would now be living in their village, while she clutched a handkerchief, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Flora stared straight ahead and spoke Aldred's name aloud. Albus shot back that the guys had already met. Aldred confessed he and Flora had seen each other under the lone tree in the field. Fiona hovered at the edge, chuckling. Aldred froze, bewildered. Aldous declared Aldred would spend the night with them, and Flora would have to take care of him. Flora paused a heartbeat, then tore off and ran. Aldous apologized for his daughter's behavior. Aldred scratched his neck and told himself Flora was just shy, but a small twinge of unease knotted in his gut when she bolted like that. Everyone crowded around the table as it groaned with mountains of food. Aldous boomed that it was a feast today, and Fiona added that a new guest had arrived in the village, definitely worth noting. Albus gripped the bottle, grinning as he announced he'd pulled out a 10-year-old drink made from grapes grown in Aisha's garden. He tipped it and began pouring while Flora stared at the filling glass, baffled. They hurled back their drinks in a boisterous toast to the village's new resident. Aldred took a sip, grinned, and declared it delicious. Everyone beamed with joy, and a lone wedge of cheese sat on the table. Flora jabbed her fork into the food and dug in, then looked up and locked eyes with Aldred. His mouth flew open in delight as he thought the cheese and bread were delicious. Plates of food sprawled across the table before Aldred. He snatched the boat and began packing it with food, the plate growing steadily emptier with every scoop. The girls gaped at Aldred when he burst out that the food was incredible. They could make money off it. Fiona gushed over Flora's dishes, and Flora flushed, thanking the guys for the praise. Aldred kept eating with his spoon when a baffling, inhuman noise cracked the air, and in an instant every gaze snapped to Flora, stunned. Embarrassed tears sprang to Flora's eyes as she stammered that maybe Aldred wanted more. Aldred lifted the plate and slid it into her hands. Crimson flooded Flora's cheeks. She shut her eyes and whispered she was going to put on a supplement. Then she extended a full plate of food toward Aldred. Aldred stared at Flora and watched her shyness crumble until, after a while, they became friends. He hoped that next time they'd meet they wouldn't bolt, and night fell as stars began to dot the sky. The next day the guys swarmed over to Aldred. A pile of things lay beside him. The girls clutched baskets. Albus said Aldred was welcome anytime, and Aldred thanked him for his hospitality. Albus sized Aldred up, guessing he might hide useful skills or be eager to find work. Aldred stared at the flowers, thinking he'd love to take on and finish quests. Aldred declared he wanted to hunt. Albus answered he'd be invaluable. Their village had hardly any hunters. Flora sidled up to Aldred, cheeks flushed, and confessed she'd cooked his dinner. Aldred thanked her. She stared at her hands in embarrassment and stayed quiet instead of telling him not to, and Aldred thought she was very nice. Aldred and Albus strode through the village, laying out that Aldred's future home should stand out west, closer to the flower field. Sunlight drenched the vine. Albus announced Aldred could claim one of the vacant houses out west, and the guys wound up at the riverbank. At one of the suggested houses, Aldred shrank back, cheeks burning, and rejected every house they approached. They came upon another house, hemmed in by trees on every side. Aldred scratched his chin, eyes narrowed, then they pushed on. The guys strode across the wooden bridge. Aldred grinned, watching silver fish flash in the river. Aldous surged ahead toward the last house. The guys barreled into the house. To the ladies it felt suffocating, dust everywhere and a heavy gloom. Aldred dropped his things at the entrance, spotted a box and smiled. They sprawled on the curb in front of the house, tearing into sandwiches while Aldred declared he'd move in, if anyone in the village could make furniture. And Aldous shot back that the man lived right across the street from Aldred. Albus jabbed a finger at the house, turned to Aldred and declared the master's name, Toke, adding they could visit him tomorrow. Aldred thanked him for his help, and the men said goodbye. Aldred snatched a dustpan and broom like weapons and dove into cleaning the house, scrubbing and sweeping the floors so hard he wound up filthy himself. Aldred scanned the room. It gleamed spotless. He realized he'd have to go to Toke's tomorrow, resolved to bathe now, and tilted a bucket to send water splashing into the wooden box. Aldred slid 2 bracelets onto his arm, thrust his hand forward and launched a conjuration, and water gushed up from the sigil. A flame erupted from the magic icon, licking the water until steam billowed up. Aldred stared in panic, angrily insisting everything should have gone smoothly. And he was in the water. Aldred sprang from the tub, draped a towel over his shoulders and tore through the room for his clothes when a figure from the street barged in. It was Flora, beaming as she said she'd brought dinner. Aldra's towel tumbled to the floor, leaving him naked before Flora. She flung her hands up as tears gushed down her face. Flora tore out of Aldred's house. He thought the gap between them had closed a little. 1 step forward, 3 steps back. A tiny village sat hemmed in by vineyards on every side, a wild forest fanning out beyond them, the sun burning high overhead. Aldred lay sprawled on the floor with sunbeams slicing across him. He sprang to his feet and yelled, "It's really morning!" Aldred's small 1-story house, a chimney jutting from the roof, shimmered as sunlight danced across its tiles, and Aldred proclaimed he had his own house now. Aldred yanked on his clothes and headed for Toke, but as he walked, yesterday's run-in with Flora exploded into his mind. He tried to get along with her, and it went the exact opposite. Aldred reached Toki's house, strode onto the veranda, began scaling the stairs, and the veranda held a weathered table and 2 chairs. Aldred dove into the chair and howled, dazzled by its beauty. Toku peered out the window and blurted that he was stunned to see a man utterly entranced by an ordinary chair. Toku beamed and declared he was grateful to Aldred for the praise. Aldred stared in surprise, and Toku beckoned him into the house. Toku cradled a bundle of vegetables and shot Aldred an inviting grin. "Want breakfast?" Aldred slipped into the house and agreed. Aldred burst to the table, mouth watering for breakfast. Then he dropped onto the tabletop, grinning as he reveled in how pleasant its surface felt to the touch. Plates crowded the table as the guys pounced on the meal. Aldred savored each delicious bite while Toku rattled off the breakfast recipe, and Aldred kept devouring greedily. A sink and a stove sat in the room as Toku's worry for Aldred exploded. He hadn't eaten since last night, and Aldred calmed Toka with a steady, reassuring voice. Plates and boats sprawled across the table. Aldred, ready to tell Flora about yesterday, bit back the words. And Toku stepped forward, pressing him to speak. Toku slammed his hand down and demanded to tell yesterday's story. Aldred, convinced Toku had hooligan tendencies, bristled. Then Toku shouted that Aldred was having an affair with Flora, and Aldred began to tell what happened yesterday. Toku clasped his hands, burst into laughter, and crowed that Flora had actually seen him naked. Aldred burned crimson and pinched his lips into a thin line. Toku howled with laughter until Aldred barked at him to stop, and he squirmed in front of Flora, convinced they'd drift even farther apart as he admitted they barely ever spoke. Aldred mused, "It's not because your face looks too scary," and Toku's scowl clenched tighter, frown after frown. They crashed at Tawaku's house, flooded into the workshop, and Aldred demanded every basic household item. Wooden planks lay beside Aldred as Toku ran a hand through his hair and declared, "You'll have to live without furniture for a while. I have too many orders, but I'll make you a bed." Toku jabbed at the sofa and blurted that Aldred could buy the sofa. Aldred dropped into a nearby chair, and Toku roared that he hadn't finished fixing it yet. Aldred slid into the chair and, grinning, declared it perfect for his bedroom. Toku stepped aside. Tawaku jabbed his chin to the side and said he'd drag another chair from the warehouse in case Aldred had visitors. Aldred's chest tightened. Had he grown too used to being alone? The guys ended up at Aldred's house. Toku flopped onto the sofa, admitting he was wiped out but insisting he still had to measure the space under the bed, and Aldred slid a drink into his hand. Toku seized the glass as yesterday's memory with Flora slammed into him. Aldred snarled that he was acting like a child. Toku exploded into bright, merry laughter. Aldred snatched the glasses, strode to the wooden table and set them down with a grin, proclaiming that the furniture in the house had become more comfortable. A closet, a table, and several chairs suddenly materialized in the room. The guys launched into a heated debate over every comfort detail, and Toku planted himself on the couch. Tawaku flashed a grin and vowed he'd personally lead you to every hidden spot piled with cozy home comforts, and Aldred thanked Tawaka for his help. The next day, Aldred and Aisha ran into each other on the street, and Aldred told me he lives next to Tokuku. Aisha mopped sweat from her face with the towel. The guys hunched together and argued fiercely about the move, and someone closed in on the group. Flora loomed behind Aisha. Flora and Aldred locked eyes in raw horror, and Aldred's mind screamed, "Why was she here?" Aldred's face burned crimson as he froze, head bowed. Flora's head peeked out from behind Aisha, and Aisha shut her eyes and released a heavy sigh. Aisha shoved Flora aside. Flora stumbled back, flustered. The guys fumbled through awkward greetings. Aldred and Flora stood facing each other in a heavy silence. Aldred's gaze snapped to Aisha. Gloom carved into her face. He shut his eyes as a cold thought hit him that she knew everything. Then he abruptly dropped to his knees before Flora. Aldred blurted an apology for yesterday's incident. Flora shot back that it wasn't his fault, then suddenly bent down and begged for forgiveness. Flora clutched her flushed cheek, and Aldred thought she held no blame. She was even apologizing to him. Aisha hacked a cough to yank his gaze, then snapped that she was going back to work and the guys could head home together. Aldred and Flora flushed crimson, staring at Aisha in mortified silence as the guys gaped at her audacious suggestion. The guys strode through the great plantation when a man walked the other way, trailed by a small, heavily laden pack horse. Flora burned with curiosity about Aldred's plans for the day, as Aldred strode forward and declared he wanted to meet the village hunter, and Flora snapped that he'd only been in the village 4 days. Wasn't he in too much of a hurry? Aldred and Flora closed the gap. The guy declared he wanted to be useful to the villagers. Aldred snorted they'd have plenty of meat soon, and several girls strode toward them, laughter spilling loud and bright. The girls swept past the guys. Aldred whirled, his eyes pinned on them, and blurted, "Why does everyone here dress so brightly?" Flora swept her hands across the blooms and flashed a smile, announcing these plants flower year-round, so everyone hustles to keep up. The guys ended up at Flora's house, bumped into her father on the street, and Aldred beamed that furniture had finally made his home comfortable. He wanted to meet the village hunter. Aldred locked eyes with Flora and flashed a grin, then blurted he couldn't wait to start working, and Flora's father replied he'd introduce him to the village hunter. Aldred snapped into a new suit. Gloves clicked onto his hands and a bow and quiver strapped to his back. He decided his sword wasn't needed. It was time to move out. A man and a short girl loomed before Aldred. The man announced he was Lawrence, a village hunter, and Aldred shot out, "Are you father and daughter?" They spun apart, displeasure crackling between them, and the girl snapped, "Aldred is wrong." The claim landed like an outrageous slap. Lawrence shot back that the girl beside him was Karina, his student. She introduced herself as 12, and Karina bristled, furious that Aldred wouldn't even acknowledge she was a hunter. Aldred smiled and shot back that gender meant nothing. What counted was deadly hunting skill, and Karina beamed, echoing him and volunteering to help the village. Lawrence locked eyes with Karina and warned she'd have to study. Only time would make her a hunter. Karina shot back she'd master it in record time, and 2 girls suddenly appeared not far from the guys. Karina jabbed a finger at the mountain. "That's where they're going." Lawrence thanked Aldred for her support. Aldred smiled and said he looked like his father. Lorenz blushed and slapped Aldred on the shoulder. The guys threaded a narrow path with trees pressing in, mushrooms clustering at the roots, and they buzzed about how perfectly the village was nestled there. Aldred skidded to a halt and called out, "What fruits can be grown here?" Karina paused, then named several different fruits, and Lawrence leaned in and asked if Aldred had ever heard of any of them. Voices snapped through the forest. Aldred said he'd heard of some. Lorenz shot to his feet and raised the very fruit they'd been talking about, and Aldred clapped a hand to his mouth in surprise as he inspected it. Lorenz lunged at the fruit bowl and pushed some toward Aldred. Aldred chewed, a flash hitting him. As a kid, he used to gobble everything in a row, and it always landed him in trouble. Karina perched in a tree heavy with fruit, plucked one, handed it to Aldred, and declared, This is an alloy. Its peel's tough, but the flesh is delicious. Karina shot her hand up and warned a razor-sharp bitterness clung to the fruit's peel. Lawrence burst into laughter and insisted that bitter edge was actually the most delicious part. The guys thundered through the forest until jagged mountains rose around them. They slammed to a stop at a scraggly bush and found fresh tracks from some kind of animal. Lawrence dropped beside the animal tracks and barked, "Deer, fresh!" while the others leaned in around him, hanging on every word. The guys erupted into a plan to hunt the deer, urgently warning each other to stay on guard as Karina and Aldred crept along the bushes, scrutinizing every twig and shadow. Aldred stomped a branch to splinters. Lawrence stood behind him and stared at Aldred, and an eerie radiance began to erupt from him. The guys hunkered shoulder to shoulder in the bushes, locked on a deer standing just a few paces away chewing grass, and immediately leaned in to plot their attack. Aldred snatched up his bow and arrow, took steady aim at the deer as Lorenz and Chris stood close watching, and after a tense beat he loosed an arrow that flew straight to the target. The arrow slammed into the deer's head. He let out a heart-rending gurgle from his mouth, and a thunderous sound ripped across the neighborhood. They closed in on this deer sprawled on the ground. Lorenz admitted Aldred's aim was deadly, maybe even sharper than his own. Aldred's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and Karina grinned, saying he really shoots better than her teacher. Tears flooding his eyes, Lorenz roared at Karina not to say such things about him. She shot back. She'd become Aldred's student, and he grabbed her head and shook her. They stumbled into the village hauling a colossal deer carcass. Villagers gaped at the fallen beast, and Lorenz declared Aldred's abilities would give them more than enough deer meat. Aldred beamed, strode into the circle of villagers and introduced himself. They erupted into joyful cheers, and he smiled back, thanking them warmly for their hospitality. Aldred and the villagers tore into the carcass, carving up the meat. Aldred figured some portions would be handed out to residents, some sent to market, and the rest kept for household use. Then he went to Flora's house and she opened the door for him. Flora's cheeks flamed as she greeted Aldred. He ran a hand through his hair, flustered, pressed the bundle into her hands and announced it was a gift for their kindness. And Flora smiled, thanked him, and urged him to stay a while. Flora shot him an invite to dinner tonight. Aldred's face flushed scarlet as he blurted, "Is everything going to be all right?" And she met him with a warm, confident yes. Aldred thundered up to Toke's wooden house, past stacked wooden barrels, and at the door he declared he had to open it. He'd brought meat. Aldred reached for the doorknob, but Aisha stepped squarely into his path, scowling as she greeted Aldred. Aisha clasped her hands and announced she'd given Tauka a chair to fix. Aldred gripped a fistful of nuts and began handing them out to the children. Toku gripped a stool, eyes blazing as he glared at the girl who said his shaky chair nearly caused a disaster, then grabbed the bar and snapped that things need to be handled with care, not like Aisha. Aldred slammed his eyes shut, blaming Aisha alone as Toku jabbed a finger at the warehouse and vowed he'd stop giving her any more discounts. The workshop door slammed. Toku's grumbling rattled the rafters, and Aldred burst into laughter. Aldred ripped open a slab of meat and growled it settled Toke's debt. Then the guy launched into a mouth-watering rundown on how to cook meat to perfection. In an instant, Aisha materialized in the room, hovering over a slab of meat and proclaiming it begged for a grape drink. The guys gaped at her in stunned silence. A battered wooden stool sat beside the guys as they dove into plans for Aisha's new chair. Aisha piped up that maybe Aldred had a reward for her too, pressing a hand to her cheek as she molded over. A dense forest pressed around Tuaku's house. Aisha urged them to go to all those houses and feast on venison. A girl in a dress with her hair down stood in the doorway. Aldred's cheeks flamed as he stammered, bewildered. "Who is she?" Aisha pressed the basket into Aldred's hands and snapped that she didn't always wear the same thing. Aldred froze, eyes wide. He didn't even recognize her, while Toku laughed and taunted her until she barked, "Shut up!" Aisha clutched Tokaka by the ear as Flora strode up to the guys with a basket in her hands. They greeted her, and Toku introduced himself with a grin that chilled the air. Heat surged up Toku's neck as the guys scrambled to defend his terrifying expression, and Flora flushed, laughing as she introduced herself to the guys. They spread the groceries across the table like a battle plan, then launched into a fired-up discussion about making a stew and who would tackle each stage of the cooking. 2 pieces of meat sat on the table. Toku gripped the spice boxes and boasted he'd prepared well for the cooking. They chimed in one by one, rallying behind Towaku as he parceled out the kitchen jobs. Aldred handled the roasting. Aisha took charge of the meat. Flora was tasked with pairing sake with a wine drink, and Towaku himself grabbed the vegetables. A basket rested on one table while a row of long looms stretched across the other. Aldred cradled vegetables and raved that Toku's soup was amazing, and Toku flashed a sly grin, saying he had a few secrets. Aldred and Aisha hacked through meat. Aisha spun, threatening Toke with mushrooms trembling in his hands. Aldred dove into chopping vegetables and hurled them sizzling into the pan while everyone else stayed hunched over their work. Aisha shut her eyes, drool sliding from her lips as she said some smells were heavenly. Toku gripped a cabbage and told her to control herself and cut the meat. And Aldred tossed vegetables in a frying pan while Flora stood beside him, smiling. Flora grinned and declared Aldred looked like he was having the time of his life. Aldred flashed a matching smile and agreed. Toke leaned in, curiosity burning. Who had Aldred once been? And when he told them about his past, the girls stared at him, jaws dropping. Aldred snatched the meat with tongs, and when the girl declared they'd be safe with him, the one who could fight monsters, a sheepish grin crawled across his face. Aldred slid the meat into the sizzling pan, announced he'd retired from the case and told them not to rely on him, so the guys dove headfirst into brutal cooking drills. Aldred and Flora locked eyes and smiles flared across their faces. Tuku fixed his gaze on Aisha, who looked deep in thought. The guys fried the meat until it sizzled, then sliced it. Steam curled as vegetables simmered in pots and pans. Aldred and Aisha laid plates on the table. Flora and Toku stood at the kitchen tables, and Aisha speared a piece of meat with her fork and fed it into Aldred's mouth. Aisha thrust up a finger. Aldred tore into the meat, chewed, and declared it was pretty good. Toku fixed Aldred with a sharp look and said maybe something had happened between them. Aldred shot back that they were fine. Aisha clutched a plate of meat and pivoted away from the guys. Flora strode up, set the plate on the table with a wicked smile and purred, "Aldred, you've got sauce on your mouth," leaving Aldred blinking in confusion. Aisha hurled insults without so much as turning to Aldred. Aldred gaped in surprise. Smoke billowed from the chimney on the roof. The guys finished cooking the food. They dropped into their seats around the table. A riot of different meat dishes sprawled across it, and they leaned in, eyes greedy as they admired each plate. The guys burst into a loud scramble for more meat. Flora and Aldred kept scooping bites even as they cooked. The girls flared into an argument, and Aldred froze at the edge, fear written all over him. They snatched forks like weapons as Aldred yelled it was time to try the food. He hoped everyone would like the cooked food, so they skewered the meat with their forks and tore in. Aldred shut his eyes and trembled with pleasure. She lavished the guys with praise for their cooking, and Flora shut her eyes, clapped a hand over her mouth, then said Aldred had done a good job too. Aisha's cheeks flared as she thrust a finger up, backing the guy's words, and Toku eyed the slab of meat, declaring she'd given it her all. Toku averted his eyes and declared Aisha's steak a touch overexposed. Aisha fired back that she was perfectly satisfied. Aldred rallied to her side, and Flora insisted the wine must come with bread and salad. Toku stabbed at his food with a fork while Aisha whipped up a sandwich. Aldred echoed her praise, calling it really tasty. Flora smiled, and Aisha dove into the soup, declaring it just as good. The guys tore into the food and traded recipe secrets. Flora plucked a berry and popped it into Aldred's mouth. He ate it sheepishly. Aldred's eyes flared to life as it dawned on him. These were pico seeds, each one packing its own burst of flavor. He turned to Flora and thanked her, and she gripped a spoon and cheekily stuck her tongue out at him. The guys polished off their meal. A tea set suddenly appeared on the table, Aldred exclaimed. Flora's tea was delicious, and Flora thanked him, while Aisha and Toku sipped theirs with their eyes closed. Aisha whipped around to Toke and asked if she looked like a princess. The guys exploded into a debate about who drank tea, how they took it, and what to do next, while several empty cups littered the table. The guys burst onto the street. The girls dashed after one another in a wild chase, and the boys huddled, plotting the fishing trip they later went on. The guys spilled out onto the riverbank. Flora hung back, pressing her palms to her knees as she fought for a moment's rest while they launched into a debate about Aisha's stamina, before kicking off their shoes and leaving them on the shore. They dunked their heads in the river to cool off. A grin spread across Aldred's face as he lifted his head from the water, smoothed his hair back, and locked eyes with Tuaka. Aldred sneered that Toku's wet hair looked ridiculous, and Toku's cheeks burned as he met Aldred's gaze. The girls sat on the shore with their feet in the water, and Aisha burst into a teasing mimicry of Toka. Toku locked eyes with Flora. She jabbed at his hair, calling it strange, and he bristled, flopping onto a rock while Flora bounded over, grinning and offering to cheer him up. Aisha burst into loud laughter, mimicking Toku, when suddenly a jet of water blasted toward her. It came from Toku, drenching her and leaving her baffled about why he'd done it. Aisha blasted Tokaka, and a stray jet soaked Aldred. The guys exploded into a frantic spray fight, pelting each other and trading furious shouts. Aldred stood drenched, water dripping off him as his gaze snapped forward to Flora. her face blazing red and her hands reaching toward the water. Flora's clothes clung to her, drenched, as she and Aldred hurled water at each other while Tawaku and Aisha traded wild splashes. Flora stood dripping, hair and clothes plastered to her, cheeks blazing red as she splashed Aldred and laughed uproariously. Aldred plunged his hands into the water and announced he'd spray it too. Then he froze, his face flushing crimson in an instant. Flora flung her arms wide in surprise, stared down at her damp clothes and let out a mortified, ear-splitting scream, while the boy's shoes stood unmoving on the shore. Toku wrung the water from his sodden clothes and snapped that Aisha lets herself get away with way too much, even though they're not a couple, while Aldred stood there with a spare outfit over her shoulder and a playful smile. Toku snatched a towel and mopped the water from his hair. Aldred's face flared as he stared at the girls perched on the log. Aisha glanced at Flora and scratched her head. Flora clutched her dripping body with both hands. Aldred strode over and pressed a towel into each girl's hands. Aisha draped towels over her head, averted her gaze, and whispered thanks for his help. Aisha gushed over Flora's gorgeous legs just as Aldred was mid-towel handoff. Flora yelped, yanked the towel up and insisted Aisha's legs were prettier, while Aldred went beet red and stared straight ahead, mortified. Aldred spat more curses and choked back a silent scream, then pressed the towel into Flora's hands, convinced he was staring at her legs as Flora glanced down, sheepish and flushed, and thanked him. Tawaku brandished a fishing rod and barked that he was off to fish. Aisha called back they'd join the guys a little later. Aldred's chest tightened when he saw Aisha drenched to the bone. She grinned through the wet and waved off his worry while the shore bristled with rocks. After a while, the river erupted with bites. The guys stood on the stone bank as Aldred hollered he'd just caught his 6th, Toku pulling a sour face and snapping he'd only caught 3 and it wasn't fair, and a fish sliced through the water. Silver shoals churned beneath the surface as the guys crowded the shore, hauling fish from a wide river squeezed between dense forest. Aldred snapped his jaws again. Toku erupted in fury, and Aldred peered into the bucket of thrashing fish and declared they'd caught enough to feed the whole village. Aldred hoisted a bucket, crowing he'd landed a massive haul. Toku simmered with rage and clamped his jaw shut. The girls stepped up to the guys, certain they'd already finished fishing. The girls swarmed Aldred, buzzing about his triumphant catch, while Tokus hung back, stung and brooding. Then his rod twitched and he heaved on the line. Aldred and the girls stepped aside, eyes fixed on Tokaya as they urged him with every shout and gesture. Toku began to yank the fishing rod and roar. A massive fish leapt from the river. When Tokaka scooped it up, it was tiny, and the guys erupted in praise for Tokaka's skill. Aisha shot Toku a look and warned the fish would slip from his hands and plunge back into the river. Toku's glare snapped to life and he unleashed threats at her. The guys swarmed the fish, shouting out wild ideas for how to cook it. Aisha jabbed at Toku over his botched catch, then everyone split into pairs and hunched close to trade plans. Toku gaped at Aldred, utterly baffled by his strange fiddling with the fish, and Aldred snapped into a brisk, no-nonsense lesson for me on how to cook it right. The guys turned to Aldred in surprise. Caught off guard, he flushed red, while they kindled a fire, skewered fish to roast, and someone behind them called Aisha's name. The apron-clad girl jabbed a finger at Aisha and snapped that she was shirking work again. Then she started talking. The stranger's eyes widened. She dropped into a low bow before Aldred and said, "I'm Ayena, Aisha's sister," and Aldred introduced himself. Toku barked that Aisha had to get back to work. Aina backed him up. Aisha eyed the sizzling fish and vowed she'd spring into work the moment she finished eating. Then Aina started calling for the guys. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Avalon, a grand hall of breathtaking architecture shook as a blond man erupted into a furious shout, outraged by Aldred's disappearance. Riveted to the king's screams, the dark-haired man recalled Aldred's companions telling him where he could be and kept grilling everyone about Aldred's whereabouts. The king crossed his legs like a coiled serpent and, menace in every syllable, declared Aldred's rest over. He must return to the kingdom immediately. The dark-haired man bowed low and said he understood everything. Aldred, Flora, and Toku snatched skewers of fried fish and dug in, then exclaimed in perfect unison that it was delicious. The two sisters ate the fish in silence, savoring each bite. Aina grinned and declared it wasn't bitter this time, but delicious. Aisha cheekily parroted Aldred's words about cooking such delicious fish. Toku's eyes widened, stunned by Aisha's cunning. They huddled around the campfire as Tawaku declared Aldred should start selling fish, then grinned, pulled ripe fruit from his pack, and started handing it out to the guys. Flora bit the fruit and her cheeks flamed. Toku squeezed its juice over the sizzling fried fish, and the two sisters dove back in, relishing every bite. Aldred clutched the fish, drank in the guys' beaming faces, and knew today was amazing. He wanted every day to feel like this. They sprawled on logs, tearing into leftover fish, backpacks, and empty wooden buckets scattered at their feet. And behind them a breathtaking sweep of river met a wall of dense forest. A massive bird soared through the sky when an arrow struck it. It screamed, flinging its giant wings wide. An arrow-struck bird plummeted to the ground. Karina dashed over, scooped it up, and declared Aldred a shooting master. Aldred lifted a finger and said he'd only felt the wind moving well. Aldred, heavy with hard-won years, realized he'd lived far more than Karina probably had, and declared that only experience and hard work would help. Karina said she was going to fetch some fruit as Aldred was hanging carcasses on a tree. He skidded to a stop by the bushes. Karina grinned and declared a good hunter always draws the ladies. She was right, and Aldred flushed with embarrassment. Aldred flashed a sheepish smile as the men plucked berries and swapped stories of love affairs. Then they trudged back to the village where excited children rushed out to meet them. Kids leaned in, dying to know what Karina had caught this time. She'd snagged a rabbit. Aldred warned rabbits are blisteringly fast, but Karina spun, grinned, and said, "Let the one who knocks down birds in the air be the judge," and the guys burst into delighted whoops. The children dove into the fruit they'd picked. Aldred spun on his heel and strode away from the guys, crossed paths with a girl, pressed the gathered herbs into her hands, and she thanked him. The kids peeled away from the guys, waving goodbye, and Karina shot Aldred a grin, saying he'd managed to get used to the kids. Aldred waved back at the guys. Sunlight poured over the village as Aldred flung open the wooden windows and drank in the breathtaking panorama beyond the sill. Aldred's room cradled a sprawling bed, a plain closet, a lone bedside table, and a tiny chair. Aldred and the rest of the villagers swarmed the well, dipping buckets and hauling up water. Aldred was home before a table piled with plates of every kind of food. He devoured the dishes, then looked at the spread with a wide, satisfied grin. Aldred burst onto the street and met Flora. The guys exchanged quick, delighted greetings, dove into harvesting while trading excited chatter about the vegetables, then started tearing into them to taste. Aldred stepped in front of Flora and launched into plans for the day, saying he wanted to develop the land near his home. Flora hung on his every word, then went crimson. She shot her fist into the air and vowed she'd help Aldred till the soil beside his house. Aldred hesitated a beat, then nodded. Flora's eyes flared as she promised to ask her father for tools and race back. She bolted home, leaving Aldred breathless at how incredible she was. They found themselves beside Aldred's house. Scattered tools littered the ground at their feet, and they huddled, plotting exactly where to begin. The guys snapped on gloves, gripped gardening tools like battle gear, and decided to try planting radishes first, then carrots and cabbage. Flora smiled sweetly. Flora dropped into a squat and started slicing through the grass. Aldred crouched nearby doing the same, inspected his gardening tool, glanced at Flora, and then began to mirror her every movement. Flora grinned and said he was a natural with the instrument. Aldred averted his gaze, cheeks aflame, convinced he'd learned every move just by watching her. The guys ripped up tufts of grass and stacked wicker baskets, then plunged into Aldred's past life as he flickered between a crooked smile and nervous under-his-breath whispers about various monsters. Panic clawed at Aldred. He'd nearly blurted out the fights and everything else. Then he spotted Flora behind him, murmuring to herself, and spun to ask if she was all right. Flora sprang up and snatched another instrument. She confessed that the moment she saw a monster, she'd bolt in a panic. The guys jumped to their feet, ready to start plowing the land. Aldred heaved his tool and pounded the earth, the men nearby tearing through the furrows without stopping, and he dragged a hand across his brow to wipe the sweat from his face. Aldred raked a hand across his face and stared at the fresh, furrowed earth while Flora stood beside him, cradling a small vessel and showering him with praise for the work he'd done. Aldred snatched Flora's mug and drank. She immediately launched into explaining how Aldred needed to use the plowing tool correctly. Flora's cheeks flamed and a broad smile blossomed across her face. Aldred stared, thinking that with a girl like her at his side he might still be able to live a conscientious life. Aldred burned through his days hunting and sweating in the fields, and soon the first fruits thrust up from the soil. The men pressed on, tending the land and fertilizing the crop. Aldred stared at the sprouts as Flora snapped that delaying the harvest was mandatory. Clutching a basket of plants in her hands, Aldred crouched in the field, hands plunging into the soil as he tended the plants. He was certain the field devoured most of his days. Flora plunged into the field beside him, laughter bubbling as they worked, and soon they hoisted a grass-filled basket together and unearthed their very first radish harvest. Aldred toiled in the field when Flora strode up with a basket and greeted him, and the guys erupted into a spirited discussion about the harvest and helping one another. Flora's cheeks flamed. She averted her gaze, pressed the basket into Aldred's hands, and, voice trembling, asked if he'd like to have lunch with her. Aldred agreed. The guys headed to the flower field for lunch, planted themselves among the blooms, and raved about its breathtaking beauty. The guys leaned over the flowers, debating every bloom, while Flora turned away and sank down beside a bush. Aldred fixed his gaze on her, utterly baffled by what she intended to do. Flora clutched a handful of blossoms and declared, "Some will feed you, others will heal you." Aldred drank in the flowers and hung on every word Flora spoke about them. Then he pressed his hand to his chin as a sudden thought ignited behind his eyes. Aldred's mind burned with the image of the girl's legs and the sway of her dress. He blurted that someone had told him the same thing 9 years ago. Then a sudden crash hurled terror through him. Flora tumbled to the ground, scrambling for her basket as Aldred snatched it up and stared at her tear-streaked face. Aldred grabbed a handkerchief, wiped the tear tracks from Flora's cheeks, and urged her to be patient for a while. Petals whipped through the air around the guys as Aldred's eyes snapped to Flora's face in stunned surprise, and she met his gaze with tear-streaked eyes. Aldred pinned his gaze to Flora's face, drinking in every flicker of expression as her cheeks bloomed crimson and she opened her mouth, struggling to speak. They froze, staring each other down as flower petals spiraled around them. Then Aldred's stomach suddenly roared. Flora clapped a hand over her mouth and burst into laughter. Aldred went crimson, scratched his head like he was untangling a knot, and hurriedly apologized for the misunderstanding. Flora strode forward, grinning as she announced lunch had arrived and it was time for them to go, while flower petals swirled around her. Aldred trailed her, eyes fixed on the petals, and right then his stomach growled. Flora opened her mouth, but he cut her off. She might speak later when the time came. Flora's cheeks blazed and her lips trembled. She was on the verge of tears, and Aisha fixed her with a suspicious stare before snapping that Flora still hadn't told him today either. They sat at a table with a tea set between them. Flora folded down, clutching her feet as she shrank into herself. Opposite her, Aisha clasped her hands and glared at Flora with sharp displeasure. Flora fixed her gaze on the tea set and shot back a confident yes. Aisha beamed, certain her best friend had come to her for advice. Aisha ushered Aldred forward and stared at Flora's clasped hands. She realized Aldred liked Flora, but Flora's shyness froze her and she couldn't admit it to him. Aisha watched Flora's puzzled face and suspected this always kind, impossibly beautiful girl was quietly suffering, her shy, self-effacing nature keeping her from admitting her feelings to Aldred. Flora's cheeks erupted crimson and shame flooded her when Aisha blurted she'd liked Aldred 9 years ago. Aisha slumped against the table, a long, weary sigh escaping her. She realized she didn't know all the details of the past, and the guys had already crossed paths 9 years earlier. Aisha replayed their interactions and realized that back then, Flora was 9 and Aldred 18. That's when Flora fell hopelessly in love with him. Aisha locked eyes with Flora and declared Aldred himself remembered her from that meeting. Flora's gaze dropped, a shy smile blooming as she began to fidget in her chair. Flora shot back that Aldred had recalled a piece of those events from 9 years ago, and Aisha cried out, stunned that Flora had figured it out. Flora blurted she'd told Aldred about the flowers, and he snapped he'd already heard it from someone. Aisha balled her fists and shouted that everything was going well. Flora clapped her hands to her face and squealed that the instant she realized Aldred had remembered her, she was overwhelmed with joy and burst into tears. Aisha's cheeks flamed and she pressed a hand to her face. Then she blurted that Flora had really been thinking about Aldred all these 9 years, and she couldn't help admiring how clever Flora was. Flora pressed her hands to her face and started turning her head, then blurted she was so wildly happy she couldn't think. Flora fixed Aisha with a fierce stare and kept repeating it. Aldred wiped her tears with his handkerchief. They stood inches apart with the air crackling and Aisha's face twisted. Aisha clapped her hands over her face, burning with exasperation as she decided Flora was utterly hopeless, while Flora's voice shook as she insisted she couldn't have done anything else. Flora steepled her fingers as the girls kept tearing into every twist of Aldred's story. The cups on the table sat empty. Flora snapped a finger and declared she and Aldred spent a lot of time there. Flora hesitated, then averted her gaze. Flora lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, and blurted that they'd accidentally touched each other while working. Aisha fixed her with a strange stare, drool leaking from the corner of her mouth. Aisha slammed her palms on the table and roared that Flora was still a child. Flora's voice trembled as she asked if there was anything more she could do. Aisha pressed a hand to her chin, jabbed a finger into Flora's side, and snapped that Flora must sidle up to Aldred, curl into him and pour out her feelings. Flora slammed her hands over her face and screamed, mortified she'd bungled it so badly. Aisha snapped, "So what can you offer, Flora?" Flora's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide, when Aisha snarled that if she didn't move this instant, another girl would snatch Aldred away. Aisha grasped a cup as the girls buzzed that Aldred was an enviable groom. Cup in hand, she urged Flora to confess to him. Tears welled in Flora's eyes as she choked out, voice trembling, that she was painfully shy and couldn't bear to lose even the current relationship. Aisha fixed the flowers with a thoughtful stare, a plan sparking. "Flora can speak through blossoms, just like your father did," she exclaimed. Flora slapped a hand to her cheek and whooped, "Brilliant!" And Aisha charged in, hyping her up and warning that other girls could swoop in and snatch Aldred. Flora's cheeks flamed as she vowed she understood. She'd gather those flowers for Aldred, hand them to him, and finally spill her heart. Aisha watched her with a smile. Aldred and Karina cut through the forest, lush bushes crowding one side while makeshift tables and gnarled tree stumps jammed the other. A strange sound sliced the air and the guys slammed to a halt. Aldred peered ahead, every muscle taut with wariness, and Karina planted herself right behind him. Aldred raked a hand across his face and growled, "This forest feels very strange today." Karina snapped that the animals were too quiet. Then a sudden clatter of hooves shattered the hush and Aldred snapped to attention. Aldred snapped his bow free and nocked an arrow. Karina copied him instantly, and the guys leveled their bows, whispering that 2 deer were slipping in from the west. Deer with branching horns burst from the bushes. Aldred and Karina spotted them and loosed their arrows. They loosed their arrows, which slammed into the animals' heads. The creatures crumpled to the earth, and the hunters dropped their bows to the dirt, staring at the fallen bodies. They sprinted to the fallen beasts, trading triumphant shouts about today's catch, then turned back toward the village. A man burst from the bushes, Karina's teacher, smiling broadly, and Karina hadn't seen him coming, fear crashing over her. Karina balled her hand into a fist, voice trembling as she blurted, "The bear's coming right at me!" And the man scratched his head, admitting her fears weren't in vain. He thrust a scrap of wool at them. They snapped into a tense discussion. They'd found bear tracks nearby, so they vowed to rally the other hunters and warn them. Karina's breath hitched as she locked onto the guys who stepped forward to calm her. The men exchanged tense glances, and the teacher warned that bears don't always storm villages. They can still reach the flower garden. The teacher gently patted Karina's head as Aldred's mind snapped into action. Help was needed to handle the village, but the guild sat too far away, so he steeled himself and went on high alert. The teacher ruffled Karina's hair and laughed. Aldred pictured a field of flowers, looked away, and hardened himself. He knew he had to protect the villagers from the bear by any means. Aldred locked his gaze on the forest, muscles coiled, and knew he'd have to draw his sword again. The others decided to turn back to the village. Karina's teacher roared. He'd talked the elder down, ordered Karina to race south to raise the alarm, and told Aldred to warn the people in the flower field. They tore off in every direction, sprinting to carry out the orders. Aldred barreled past the vegetable fields toward the village. The children were harvesting, and when they saw him they shouted greetings and swarmed him with questions about the hunt. Aldred excused himself, bolted past the children with dust billowing behind him, charged up to the man and shouted that a monster had appeared in the mountains and he'd come here to warn the people in the flower garden. The blond man let out a raw, bone-deep scream. He and Aldred plunged into a frantic exchange about the monster and the threat it posed to the villagers, and Aldred tore off through the streets to find others and warn them. The blond man bellowed warnings about the monster to the residents. Karina's teacher echoed the alarm, and panic seized the villagers. Aldred burst into the field, spotted a woman with her children and warned them of the danger, then launched into a raw, urgent shout, calling for anyone who might be in the flower garden. The flower garden lay empty. Minutes later, the guys ended up at Tuaku's house. Toku gripping a bow with the string taut, the others tearing into talk about the red bear, and Aldred smiling as he watched Tuaku practice. Toku trembled with tension, claiming he could craft bows but admitting he still couldn't shoot them well. Then he fired an arrow at the target. Toku's arrow punched into the tree trunk. Toku went rigid, statue still. For a long beat the guys stared at the style, utterly silent. Toku clamped his eyes shut, blew out a heavy breath, and declared he was already better than before. Aldred stepped aside, sweat pouring off him, while the guys eyed the target and traded sharp tips on archery technique. Aldred spoke with a girl and an elderly woman when Alba barreled toward them, shouting that he couldn't find Flora. Empty streets swallowed the village as Albus and Aldred exchanged worried whispers. They hadn't seen Flora in ages. Maybe she'd slipped into the vineyards. Albus dropped his gaze, frustration coiling in his words as he blurted he desperately hoped Flora was in the vineyards, and his face sank into even deeper sorrow. Albus dropped his gaze and grimly hoped the nightmare from 9 years ago wouldn't return. Aldred opened his mouth to speak, but someone suddenly recognized him. Aisha barreled toward the guys, tears streaking her face. She seized Aldred's hands, gulping for breath as she fought to speak. Aldred's breath hitched when he saw Flora. Something had gone wrong. Aisha clung to him, shaking. Aldred pushed for answers, desperate to know what had her so terrified. Aisha couldn't settle. Her face flushed crimson and tears streaked down as she could only choke out, "Aldred, Flora." Aldred stared at the girl in fright. Aldred shook with terror, his head snapping up as he clutched tearful Aisha's hands, while Albus planted himself at her side and tried to calm her. Beyond the trees' lush crowns, towering mountains loomed, and far off the thunder of hooves rolled in. Several deer, one missing a horn, sprinted from someone, vaulting stone to stone while drool streamed from one deer's mouth. A one-horned deer plummeted from a towering stone, crashing into the ground as the rocks convulsed and split apart into a spray of tiny shards. A colossal beast exploded from behind the rocks, maw gaping and fangs bared. Then it lunged forward, jaws open as it tore after a lone one-horned deer. The monster reared, its clawed paw whipping down as its jaws snapped shut, and the deer bolted, weaving frantically between the thick trunks. A deafening blast ripped through the area, and a towering column of dust shot up as deer began to fall, severed tree trunks and stone boulders whirling through the air, fervor and fragments of stone filling the area. The deer lay sprawled on the ground, surrounded by shredded tree trunks and shattered rocks, while a drooling monster pried its maw open. Someone walked through the forest when the monster snapped alert, its ears pricked, hearing razor sharp. It rose and prowled the shadows, drool and blood running down its muzzle. A black monster erupted onto a giant boulder, claws hooked into the stone as he swept the area with a predatory gaze. Then he spotted someone not far away. The monster towered on the cliff, staring down as Flora knelt at its base, plucking herbs with a small basket at her side. Aldred stood in his house, nerves coiled. He swung the door open, stared at the bandage's sword, and snapped that he couldn't imagine ever using a sword again. Aldred remembered finding Aisha soaked in tears, screaming that Flora might be where the red bear had shown up. He ground his teeth and began peeling the ribbon off his sword. Aldred tore through the forest and burst into a field of flowers with a sword thumping against his back. His limbs felt like lead even after hunting through mountain passes. Training had been far harsher, and as an adventurer he couldn't afford to hesitate. Aldred tore across the flower field, crushing blooms beneath his feet as his face burned crimson and he gritted his teeth. Dusk crept over Aldred and pale petals spun through the air. He sprinted, desperate to avoid the monster. He'd come here to retire. Aldred gripped his sword, cloak whipping behind him, and felt the dream that once drove him, a peaceful, carefree life after getting everything he wanted, crumble, leaving him with no reason to keep fighting. Aldred tore forward with the sheathed sword at his back when a flickering light sprang up. Suddenly he felt the blade in his hands like before, but he couldn't fathom why he'd need it now. Aldred replayed Flora's smile like a battle cry, convinced each fight would carve him a priceless place in friends, and he vowed to shield the one he loved, Flora. Aldred replayed every expression on Flora's face. The moment they met, he knew he'd fallen in love and had to protect her by any means. Then he skidded to a halt, lungs burning as he gasped for air. Aldred slammed to a halt and stared into the dark forest thicket. A sheathed sword was strapped to his back as he fought for breath and pushed into the tangled, bristling scrub. Sweat beaded on Aldred's face as he frantically scanned his surroundings, thick bushes surging up to hem him in. Aldred's ears snapped to a heart-rending scream. He pictured a terrified Flora frozen in place, clutching several flowers, and his cheeks flamed with fear. A clawed, gaping monster tore after Flora and swung a savage paw. She hit the ground and slapped one hand over her head. Aldred exploded into view beside the beast, barreled at it and screamed for Flora to duck. Flora obeyed Aldred. She dropped to the ground and clamped her hands over her head as Aldred lunged between her and the monster and landed a crushing blow. Aldred's punch smashed into the monster's neck. It staggered, drool spilling from its maw. Flora lay crumpled on the ground, and Aldred, sword in hand, held the beast away from her. Flora clutched her head, shot upright and fixed Aldred with a terrified stare as he stood in front of her, and the monster's grin widened, rage smoldering beneath it. Aldred asked if she was all right, and Flora choked out, "Aldred!" in fear, staying planted on the ground. Rage snapped in the monster. It bared its maw and locked onto the armed Aldred. Flora's face streaked with tears as she stared at him in terror, and Aldred met her eyes, barked that it was far too dangerous and she had to get out. Aldred's face flared crimson and he froze, staring at Flora's tear-streaked face as a memory slammed him. A little, tear-stained girl who looked just like Flora. Aldred's memory snapped to that moment. A blonde girl stood before him, smiling as she thanked him. He scooped her into his arms, charged across the field, remembering her story about flowers. Aldred stared at Flora, crumpled on the ground, and a fierce question burned inside him. Could this terrified girl be the very one he'd saved 9 years ago? The monster split its jaws, poised to charge, and Flora snapped her gaze away, startled. Flora's scream ripped the air as the monster's clawed paw hovered over Aldred. He dodged and slammed his sword up. The beast's strike crashed into the blade, and its paw clamped around the hilt. The monster reared onto its hind legs and clutched Aldred's sword. Aldred pinned it, trembling with raw tension, and yelled that Flora had to run and he'd be fine. Flora tried to argue. Aldred locked eyes with Flora, grinned, and vowed he wouldn't lose to the Red Bear. Flora still remembered that incident from 9 years ago, and she stared ahead, mesmerized. The moment Aldred spoke, Flora's expression snapped to life. Her cheeks flamed with a rosy blush as tears of joy welled in her eyes. Flora clutched the flowers and sprinted away. Aldred and the monster grappled, each holding the other in place. Aldred ground his teeth and roared that he could finally feel his sword. Then he swung it, and the monster staggered backward. The monster prowled in tight circles, baring its fangs. Aldred yanked the hand gripping the sword aside, and the blade erupted in a blinding pulsing light. Aldred dropped into a fighting stance, his sword blazing brighter by the second. Flora pressed herself behind a tree, watching in stunned awe as the monster charged at Aldred, and he struck back with a furious assault. The monster gnashed its teeth and lunged at Aldred with a clawed paw. Aldred swung his sword in a savage arc, and the paw crumbled into pieces. The monster gawked at its paw as chunks tore away and clattered to the ground. Aldred snapped into a fighting stance with his sword leveled, and Flora's mouth fell open in stunned disbelief. Aldred dropped into a fighting stance and surged at the monster as blinding lights erupted around them and the beast bellowed, shaking the air. At last the monster crumpled to the ground, broken tree trunks and a scatter of leaves littering the earth beside its body, and Aldred stood before it with a sword clenched in his hands. Aldred watched the sword's glow fade away, slid it into a sheath behind his back, and pictured pouring mana into the blade to sharpen it until it could pierce a dragon and smash a giant's hardened defenses. Aldred's cheeks flushed faintly as Flora dove into his arms, her face scarlet and tears brimming in her eyes. They faced each other, eyes locked. Aldred asked if she was okay. Flora admitted she was a little scared, but Aldred sprang forward and saved her. The guys pressed through the flower field in silence, confusion hanging over them. Aldred stared at Flora, thinking the girl he'd saved 9 years ago was her, stunned that he still remembered that day. Aldred's cheeks flared crimson. He knew Flora was more than a friend, but the words died in his throat, and she stood to the side, staring straight ahead. Flora skidded to a stop before the tree standing in the flower field, fascination rooting her in place as leaves and petals swirled through the air around her. He skidded to a stop in a sea of blooms beneath a lone tree as Flora's memory slammed back to an incident 9 years ago, and Aldred blurted that he'd only just remembered it and apologized. Flora squeezed her eyes shut and confessed she'd fought to wipe that incident from her mind, and failed. Aldred opened his mouth to speak, but Flora snatched the words away. Flora's cheeks flushed as she flashed a grateful smile and thanked Aldred for saving her. Aldred laughed, rubbed his nose, then froze in surprise when he saw Flora standing before him holding a flower. Tears brimmed on Flora's cheeks as the wind whipped her hair. She smiled and confessed she'd loved Aldred for the past 9 years. Aldred's face flushed crimson, and his jaw dropped in surprise. Flora closed her eyes and stood smiling, and he rubbed his tear-streaked eyes, wondering if Flora's words could be true. Aldred snatched the flower from Flora's hands, and she grinned. "Give this to someone you like, and you'll be together, no doubt." Aldred's smile lit his face as he locked eyes with Flora. He declared, "I love you too," and Flora's cheeks flamed as tears welled in her eyes. Aldred cradled the flower Flora had pressed into his hand and swept her into a sudden embrace. Flora stared straight ahead, stunned, then melted into him and hugged him back. The guys clung together in a long, aching hug as tears carved tracks down Flora's cheeks and flower petals spiraled through the air around them. Flora reached up and cupped Aldred's smiling face. Aldred returned the touch, sweeping his hand across her flushed cheek, and then the guys started reaching out to each other. The guys dove into a kiss in a flower field beside a towering tree as petals and leaves whipped through the air. They tumbled into the village, bright flowers hugging the low-rise buildings as villagers rushed forward to greet Flora and Aldred, relief flooding their faces when they saw the group unharmed, and Aldred and Flora strolled off hand in hand. Albus whirled in terror when a villager shouted that the guys had returned, and he, his wife, and Aisha sprinted to meet them. Aisha burst ahead and reached them before Albus. Aisha hugged Flora, tear streaks down her face as she kept calling Flora's name again and again, and Albus stared at the girls, wide-eyed with surprise. Aldred froze, terror flashing across his face as he stared at the fallen girls. Flora and Aisha sat on the ground, Aisha leaning over Flora with trembling concern and blurting an apology for what she'd done. Then the two gripped hands and hauled themselves back to their feet. Flora planted herself beside her parents. Albus let out a relieved laugh. Apparently she wasn't hurt. Flora nodded in agreement, and the rest of the villagers surged toward the guys, cheering to see them back. Flora flung herself into her mother's arms. Albus rose and beamed at the girls. Aisha stepped aside and wiped her face with her hands. Aldred lingered to the side, grinning as he watched. Ancient inhabitants surged up, slapping Aldred hard on the back as the crowd chorused that if he truly risked the danger zone for Flora, only Aldred could decide, and he suspected they knew nothing of his past. Tawaku pressed his palms together and beamed, proclaiming everything was safe thanks to Aldred. Aldred thanked him, gratitude ringing in his voice. The girl stepped aside and recounted the monster that had attacked Flora. When the villagers finally saw that Flora had truly been attacked by a red bear, shock froze them in place, and a suffocating hush swallowed the air. Flora's memory ignited, Aldred carving into the monster with his glowing sword, and she began to tell how a bear lunged at her while Aldred threw himself between her and the monster. Fear rippled through the villagers as they whispered about Flora's past, until Flora sliced through the panic and declared the residents had nothing to fear because Aldred had already dealt with the monster, and Toku and Aisha gaped at the guys in stunned disbelief. Aldred snapped his eyes shut, dove his hand into the back pocket of his trousers, declared he was a former adventurer, and whipped out the jagged fangs and hooked claws of the defeated monster to flaunt before the stunned inhabitants. Karina's teacher snatched up the monster's claw and studied it with hungry eyes, then growled, "Did Aldred face such a savage alone? No one knew he was this strong." And Aldred wondered if he was that fated. Silence hit the village like a fist. The villagers stared at Flora in terror as she waved her hands and breathlessly told how Aldred fought the monster. Aldred melted into the sidelines, cheeks flaming with embarrassment. Toku and Aisha stood tight beside Flora. Karina jabbed a finger up and shouted that Aldred was amazing, and her teacher eagerly backed her up. Aldred raked a nervous hand through his hair as Karina unleashed a barrage of curses at the boy. Karina's teacher snapped that they had to fetch the red bear's body, and Aldred shot back that he'd come with them too. The teacher flicked a wink and barked that Aldred should rest. They'd handle everything, and he had to stay right at Flora's side. Karina stood next to me, smiling sweetly as Aldred's eyes fixed on Flora's flushed body. When the teacher and Karina decided to move out, the whole neighborhood sprang into action to help. Aldred and Flora's family offered a humble bow of thanks to the residents. Toku beckoned Aishi to come back, and Flora cheered Aisha on. Toku spun away, sneering as he mocked Aisha. Aisha's eyes flared and she snarled for him to shut up, while the girls clasped hands and started cheering each other on. Flora's cheeks flamed crimson. Then a shy smile curled her lips as she confessed that without Aisha, she'd have kept everything to herself. Aisha and Toku shot Aldred a grin and teased that Flora would have to spill the full stories to the guys. Then they slipped away, and Flora's parents, who'd stayed with Flora and Aldred, stood up and left too. Flora locked eyes with Aldred, his cheeks flushing as he realized the day had worn him down and decided Flora would be better off spending time with her family. Flora's mom pressed a hand to her shoulder, smiled, and told Aldridge to take care of their daughter. Albus grinned and backed his wife's words with a firm nod. Flora's face flamed crimson when her parents' words struck, and Aldred stared at her, surprise breaking over his features before a slow grin spread. Flora spun to face her parents, flinging her arms wide as she screamed that she didn't understand what they meant. Aldred stood aside. Flora's parents locked eyes and burst out laughing, saying Aisha had told them Flora had dashed into the forest for that very bloom, and for the little flower peeking out from behind Aldred. Aldred and Flora recoiled when Flora's parents announced the confession had worked, and the two were a couple. Flora's voice died in her throat as heat flooded her face, and Aldred's eyes shot to the flower behind him, panic written all over his expression. Flora's mom pressed her hands together, smiling, and declared the guys had been through a brutal day, so they could stay at Aldred's house. The guys froze, eyes wide, staring at Flora's parents in shocked fright. Aldred jolted and demanded what those words meant. Albus's eyes overflowed with tears of joy as he said his girl had grown up and would soon be a bride. Aldred stepped aside, his cheeks flaming with embarrassment. Flora's parents burst up to Aldred and blurted they'd gladly call him father-in-law. Flora leapt in to calm them, and Aldred's hands began to tremble. Flora and Aldred's cheeks flamed as they locked eyes. Then Flora's mom shoved her and snapped that Aldred should take care of their daughter. Flora landed in Aldred's arms. The children stood shoulder to shoulder, blinking in confusion at Flora's parents, who waved at them and clasped each other's hands. Aldred and Flora froze and threw themselves into a tight hug, cheeks flaming with embarrassment, while low-rise buildings and scraggly shrubs stood behind them. Tension crackled between Flora and Aldred, until Aldred finally cut through the quiet. "We can go home," he said. Flora jumped at the chance with a nod, and above the village the sky rolled out, fluffy clouds drifting across it. The boys strode side by side to Aldred's house as silence wrapped the place. Aldred opened the door to Flora with a smile, and she froze, staring straight ahead. Right before he stepped inside, Aldred locked eyes with Flora and declared his house would be open to her from now on. She could come any time without hesitation. Flora's cheeks flushed as she stared at him. She smiled and replied she understood everything. Then she and Aldred stepped into the house with Aldred gripping the door handle. Flora swept the room, a wooden table ringed by chairs, sunlight slicing through a small window. And the girl vowed that soon this house will belong to both of them. Flora flashed a smile at Aldred and announced she'd make tea for them so he could start resting now, kicking off her outdoor shoes and sliding into slippers. Flora burst into the kitchen, pots and pans scattered across the counters. She snatched a clear jar of dried leaves and darted to the teapot where several more jars of food clustered beside it. Flora shut her eyes and kept making tea, a gentle smile resting on her lips. Aldred slid into the chair opposite and watched her, a slow grin spreading across his face. The kettle on the stove screamed to a boil as Flora kept mixing the tea ingredients, and the girl tore the dried fruits apart, scattering the pieces into a glass teapot to brew. Flora seized a scalding kettle and set to brewing tea, flinging fresh mint leaves into the roiling water as the aroma lunged across the room and Aldred closed his eyes, savoring every breath. Flora flashed a grin and declared she was almost done. She grabbed a paper bag and piled sweets onto a plate, then strained the tea and filled the cups. Flora cradled the tea set on a tray, carried it to Aldred's table, and announced she'd brewed tea with apples and mint. Aldred thanked her, took the cup and sipped. Aldred's cheeks burst crimson with pleasure, joy radiating from him as he exclaimed the tea was exquisite, and opposite him Flora settled, cradling her cup with a shy glowing smile. Flora closed her eyes, lifted the steaming cup to her lips, and began to savor the piping hot tea as steam curled up from its surface. Flora hoisted the teapot and slid a refill Aldred's way. He reached out, accepted the cup, cradled it, flashed a smile at her, and she admitted she might be doing something wrong. Aldred's cheeks flamed as he grinned, and declared she was doing everything right, joy surging through him. Flora smiled and met his gaze, and his ears burned scarlet with embarrassment. Tea still clings to the cups as the guys keep cooking shoulder to shoulder in the same kitchen. The table piled with plates of different dishes, and they spend the whole time laughing. They talked until the sun sank. Flora gripped a fork, roaring with laughter beside Aldred. Then they dove into washing the dishes as complete darkness fell and bright stars blinked into the sky. Aldred and Flora slumped at an empty table. Eyes dropped as embarrassment burned them into silence. A ribbon braided with flowers was tied on Flora's head. Aldred lifted his head and locked eyes with Flora. They sat in a tense silence until he let a smile curl and a heavy sigh rumble out. Sometime later he called her name and she flinched, fear spiking through her. Aldred blurted he wanted to take a bath with Flora. She sprang from her chair, screamed she understood everything, and bolted for the bedroom to sleep. Flora froze, hands braced on the table as she echoed Aldred's bath request. He shot back that he was dripping with sweat and had to wash. Bodies must stay clean. So Flora said she'd go after him. Aldred thrust his hand toward Flora and barked, "No, we're going to the bathroom together." And Flora's cheeks burned an even deeper red. The guys tumbled into the bathroom, and Flora, cheeks blazing, shouted that the bathtub wasn't even ready. Aldred, basket in hand, shot back that his magic would have it ready in no time, and Flora pressed her hands to her flushed face. Aldred tapped a finger to his cheek and shot back that he was embarrassed too, but if they bathed separately, it would take much longer. Flora stared at him, wide-eyed. Flora clutched her chest as Aldred closed in. She dropped her eyes to the floor and turned away from him without a sound. Flora turned to Aldred, locked eyes, and declared she agreed with his words, her cheeks still burning crimson. Flora's back was to Aldred when he snatched at her corset and yanked a thread. Her cheeks flamed and she whipped around, shouting his name. Flora clutched her hands to her chest, eyes fixed on the floor. She shut her eyes and, with trembling fingers, slowly stretched the button on her dress inch by inch. Flora's cheeks flared crimson as she undid her corset and stood in nothing but a shirt, hair tumbling to nearly hide her burning face, while Aldred found himself without clothes and whipped around to stare at her. Flora gripped her chopper as a strap slid off her shoulder. Aldred stepped closer. Their faces flushed with embarrassment. He offered a hesitant smile and asked if she was all right, and she wouldn't meet his eyes. She only nodded. Aldred's hand shot to Flora's shoulder, brushing another shirt strap off her shoulder. Flora clamped her eyes shut in embarrassment, then eased her hands down to the hem. Flora's shirt slid off her body and crashed to the floor. She slammed her hands over herself. Flora turned away and snapped at Aldred. "Don't stare!" Flora clamped her hands over her body, loose hair tumbling free, then paused a heartbeat and met Aldred's gaze with a timid, searching look. Flora gasped and blurted, eyes wide, "That magical objects are incredible. They can fill a bathtub with hot water in seconds." A guy and a girl press into the same tub, sitting completely submerged and bewildered at how close they are. The main character grins that it's convenient and cheap and he still has a pile of them in stock. Then Flora chirps she'd be willing to bathe every single day. And nobody answers. Still sitting in the bathroom, the young man flushes, the hot water and raw embarrassment setting his cheeks ablaze as he turns his eyes to the girl sitting beside him. Flora's gaze dives into the water, thin wet strands clinging to her face. Her cheeks blaze, drops slide from her face and hands, and she sits frozen and silent, mortified to be so close to the main character. They sit shoulder to shoulder, dread tightening in their chests. The guy turns to his companion, confusion flickering across his face as he parts his lips, ready to speak. He pivoted his body toward Flora and asked if she'd sit closer. She immediately trembled, her face folding into deeper shyness as she pretended she hadn't heard a word. Aldred takes matters into his own hands and slides right up to Flora. She instinctively recoils while he wears a contented smile that stakes its claim. He won't let her go. He grabbed her right shoulder and yanked her close, snapping for her not to be so timid. Flora squealed but clung to him under the pressure, shouting, "I'm too close to Aldred!" She still squirmed, clearly uncomfortable. He slips his hand into hers, cradles it and asks, "Time to wash away the foam and soap?" She doesn't pull back, simply lays her palm in his. Burning with embarrassment, she clenches her fists, closes her eyes as her cheeks flame redder than ever. Flora's voice trembles as she says she'll rub the guy's backs herself, and Aldred doesn't resist. He only lifts a single questioning eyebrow. Steam still on their skin, the guy and girl sit side by side as the young man drops onto a stool, twists, and shoots a quick look over his shoulder at Flora. She snatches the towel and scrubs it down his back. He arches his back a fraction. Oblivious, Flora kneads the young man's back. His cheeks blaze a deeper red, unseen as she beams and diligently foams the main character's back. Joy sparks in her eyes as she delicately studies his body. Suddenly kittenish, she presses her hands to Aldred's shoulders and gasps, "Aldo-san is so muscular." Flora suddenly closes the gap, her palm landing on the soft skin of his back as she rubs against him in complete silence. A sharp teeth-pressed hiss rips from the guy as his eyes snap wide in shock, and Aldred's cheeks blaze crimson, mortified as Flora burrows up against him. Her fingers dig into her back harder and harder. Maybe she doesn't even mean to. She has no clue about the hero's reaction. He squints until his eyes sting, clawing himself not to stare at Flora's body, and my thoughts twist into a knot, making me painfully awkward. She watches a huge tremor race through Aldo, grins at his soapy back and teases the hero. "Does it really feel that good?" He chokes out, "Yes," scrambling to hide his burning cheeks and bury his face. She snatches the basin beside her and pours a rushing stream over his back, sweeping every last soap and foam away, then finished with his back. She asks the hero to stand up and turn to face her. The young man shot up from his stool and let the girl rub his body. Flora carefully draped a towel over her chest, and foam cloaked the hero's whole body again. Her thin hands whip the towel up and down her chest as foam swells into bubbles. And a sudden flash hits the young man. The soft towel against skin delights him. Awkwardness slams into him, cold sweat trickling down his face as he braces. He already knows exactly what's about to happen. She rips the towel away from the soft spot, surprise slamming into her face as she drops her eyes. He shudders and begs her to stop. Flora's eyes snap wide with shock. A shudder tears through her and she screams as her cheeks blaze crimson. And suddenly she understands everything. She leaps back from him, screams, locks eyes, and blurts an apology, cheeks burning. She wasn't thinking anything bad at all. He shrugs, calling it a natural reaction of the body and insisting this happens. She purses her lips, fights to steady her breath, and says her mother warned her about this. Still confused, clarity snaps into place and she knows what she must do. Heat rushes to his face as he gapes at the girl in stunned confusion. Everything's gone too far. He already guesses Flora's next move, but he doesn't stop her. She drops to her knees, bewilderment clouding her eyes and discomfort burning through her. But she forges on. She's already gone too far to turn back. He shouts her name, desperate to stop her, but she snaps that they can't keep washing unless he chips in, even a little, to fix the problem that just popped up. She grips with both hands and presses hard. He instantly shudders from head to toe. He shuts his eyes tight, sweat beads trickle down his cheeks, and his forehead flushes crimson as Flora edges closer. He balls his hands into white-knuckled fists while the girl in front of him kneels. He shushes softly, presses his gentle lips together, and knits his eyebrows tight toward the bridge of his nose. The strain claws at him. Sand's breath catches. The girl's touch hits him in a way his own hands never could. Hands still move, sweeping from beginning to end. The hero exhales, cheeks aflame, snaps his eyes open and pins his gaze on the young maiden. He snaps for Flora to squeeze what she's holding tighter and hurry her movements. She halts, looks up at him with a faint blush, then nods and says she's figured out how to act now. She clamps onto the long part of her body harder than before, and drives her arms with savage intensity. I can't control myself. Amid the chaos, a daring idea ignites in his head, and he knows he has to try it. He crushed his once limp hand into a tight fist and snapped to Flora, pressing the piece toward her lips. She opened her mouth in a surprised, duck-like gape, eyes glowing. Flora parts her lips and exhales a furnace-hot blast that sears the already hot par, then pins her gaze on it with razor focus. Then the girl cracks her plump lips open. A man's face detonates into the main character's companion's mind. His earlier, awkward stare frozen on him. And it hits her she loves Aldo-san. Flora's mind flashes with the hero giggling at tiny things, his hair soaked and gloriously messy. A radiant smile as he hands her flowers. She's desperately searching for why she loves him. Aldo's flashback snaps to the first time he met little Flora. She beamed up at him, squinting in a magnificent dress, and in that heartbeat he knew she liked him. Seeing Flora slams him back into memory. He remembers saving her, and now a more grown Flora stands before his eyes, basket in hand, dabbing sweat from her brow. Her tearful joy when she received flowers surges up, and he realizes he's in love. The young man staggers under a brutal truth. He's falling for Flora, while wet squelches and muffled grunts spill from the bathroom. Gasping, she props herself up with shaky hands to keep from collapsing as his praise floods her, sending a hotter rush of pleasure through her quivering body. He murmurs, "Flora is simply incredible. The young heroine is killing it." And when she hears the guy's already on his way, she slams it into overdrive and steels herself to claim the fruits of her labor. She mutters, whipping her head in rapid jerks. You never have to order her. She knows exactly how to behave. Flora halts, tears welling in her eyes. She lets out a questioning hum as warmth floods her mouth. And she doesn't flinch. She swallows wave after wave. Warm liquid trickles from the corner of her mouth, slick with saliva, and she buries her nose in a soft place. He doesn't even twitch to pull her away. Her hands quake, and only bracing herself against the floor keeps her from collapsing. Tears drip from her lashes as she mumbles softly and squints, pulling her brows down to the bridge of her nose. When it's over, silence devours her. She never speaks again. He zeroed in on his companion, still dazed and slightly blurred after the spell's end. Flora held his gaze as he gently cupped her cheek, and they stayed locked in a silent look. Everything already said. Silence shatters as the guy's quiet voice thanks the girl for helping him. And the young maiden beams, a smile bursting across her face because she's pleased the one she loves. She grabs his hand and presses it to her flushed cheek, eyes closing as a sultry smile blooms. Aldo thinks tonight's going to be scorching. The guy and the girl burst from the bathroom into the bedroom. The hero presses Flora to the bed and kisses her with fierce hunger, their fingers braided together, not an inch of space between them as soft mumbling drifts through the room. He pulled away, pressed the tip of his nose to someone else's, and poured warm breath into the girl's parted lips. Flora cuts the kiss short. A ragged gasp rips from the man as his eyes slam shut. Flora rips the air with a scream, accusing the main character and his unrestrained touches of causing it all. In a heartbeat, he clamps onto her inner thigh and, with one sharp jerk, flips her from her stomach to face him. Flora gasps, cheeks igniting as her eyes slam into the young man's gaze. Aldred's voice steadies her, insisting this is normal and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Then the girl trembles, a soft, sweet moan escaping as she presses her hands over her eyelids. She snaps her eyes open, feeling the end within reach, and tells the guy, "Keep this pace and I'll finish the job." She claws at the sheets, fingers digging in as her whole body trembles, while screams and guttural grunts reverberate off the walls. She parts her lips a hair, gasping for air as pleasure floods every inch of her, her left fingers curling as she turns away, eyes moist and glassy. He shoots. "Flora, you okay?" She snaps back. "Yes, I'm ready," then reaches out and lets her hand land on him. Aldo-san thunders he'll step in. The young man parts his lips, only to falter and fall silent. She screams shrilly and strains to crawl upward, crying, "It hurts!" as she squints, blindsided by the sharp jolt and dropping into a silent moan. He freezes when his eyes meet Flora's, refusing to hurt his companion. So she clamps her palm to his, laces their fingers together, tears glittering as she begs Aldo-san not to stop despite the pain. The heroine slings her arms around the man's neck, clamps him with both hands and pulls him tight against her. Flora squints, lets out soft moans, and draws her brows down to the bridge of her nose. She peeled her eyelids open, parted her lips in a faint, puzzled gasp, and locked eyes with the young man opposite. They'd crossed the point of no return and both burned for the same pleasure. Hands locked together like a lifeline, he crushes her fingers and pins her to the bed as the room erupts in ragged grunts and ecstatic cries that swallow them both. Flora opened her mouth to call the main character by name but couldn't. Only clear, clipped syllables escaped as her hair tumbled over her face, masking it. Aldred steps up to Flora's flushed face, exhales straight into her lips, locks his gaze on her clear eyes, and says nothing. Words would be wasted. They already know the full weight of their love. Flora and Aldo lock their feelings in a soft, breathy kiss that sets their cheeks aflame. They cover their eyes and murmur into each other's mouths. The main character's companion snapped her leg up, and, as she pulled away, felt the man surge forward again. She dug her left fingers into the crumpled sheets and screamed, raw and uncontrollable. Flora, cheeks reddened, confesses that something big and solid thrums inside her and that she loves every sensation it stirred. Her gaze locked on the guy's face as tangled hair falls over her eyes. He snaps to Flora that he's almost there. One last push and he'll finish. He grits his teeth, lets out a ragged exhale, and drives himself forward, desperate to reach the end. A trembling voice chokes out permission for the young man to finish and swears everything will be fine. The man narrows his eyes and hisses that he's almost ready. After exchanging emotions, Flora and Aldo lock eyes in admiration and erupt into laughter. Cheeks flaming, sweat beading on their faces, embarrassed but victorious. They'd done it. Flora tilts her head, plants a playful kiss, and nips his lower lip. He props his broad arms on the bed, shields his eyes with one hand, and lets a fingertip ghost across someone else's lips. The next morning, the sun's first rays pierced the glass and spilled across the fields as the main character stirred awake in his companion's arms, both wrapped in a blanket on a soft, pillowy bed. Sunlight bursts into the room and he squints awake to find Flora dozing on his chest, utterly spent after that brutal, storm-racked night. The main character snaps his head toward the sleeping young maiden, his eyes still squinted and raw, fighting the sudden light after a long night. Flora's lashes quiver, a soft sniff escapes. She won't open her eyes yet, and she melts into the protagonist's warm chest. San stretched out a hand and let a single fingertip ghost across the heroine's cheek, sweeping the hair from her eyes as she slept in sweet dreams, utterly unaware of his touch. Flora hummed softly. His eyes snapped open, surprise blazing. And it looks like he's finally figured out how to rouse his stubborn sleeping companion. He presses the knuckles of his palm to her cheek and strokes her. She mumbles softly in her sleep, oblivious and feeling nothing, her lips pursing into a thin line. The young man amps things up, jabbing the other's cheek with his index finger over and over while Aldo bites back a laugh and keeps running his fingers through his companion's hair. She buries her face in the pillow, desperate to shake the guy off like an annoying fly and seeing no other option. Aldo darts to Flora's ear and sinks his teeth in, and she snaps her eyes open with a scream. He giggled, crowing that she'd finally woken up. Flora snapped, "Did the main character see everything?" The man, touched by her reaction, flashed the girl a bright smile and she froze, even more nervous. She buries her face under the blanket, yanking it up to her nose and fretting she looks a wreck at dawn. But he softly cups her sharp chin and pulls her close. The young man says he saw only a sweet, sleeping face, then leans in and plants a sleep-soft, lazy kiss on Flora's lips, careful and gentle. They both press their hands to their eyes, flushed and embarrassed in front of each other despite the night before. At the same time, two cooing owls fix on the lovers in the window, break into sly grins, then drop low and silently peer at the main character and his companion. Aldo and Flora press their foreheads together, eyes closing in relaxed contentment, and Aldo murmurs, "Waking up next to someone you love is an incredible feeling." Flora shoots out her hand and presses it to the young man's cheek. His eyes snap open in surprise, and he stares at the heroine questioningly as she trails her fingertips across his skin. Beaming, Flora squints at the hero and offers to cook together, share laughter, and welcome guests. Above all, they're not alone anymore. He pressed the other's palm to his chest, and a memory slammed into him. A knight in a dark cloak, sword at his hip. Silence held for a heartbeat. Then the guy nodded. He vows that from this moment on, he and his companion will do everything together, and fires off a suggestion to start by cooking breakfast. She smiles, closes her eyes, clearly delighted. Flora springs up from the pillows and whips the blanket off, nodding as she asks if she and Aldo can cook breakfast with the radishes he grew, twisting the fabric between her fingers and locking her gaze on him. She slid out of bed, the covers falling away to reveal her curves, and he shot his eyes open, cheeks blazing as a shocked shout ripped from him. The scene snaps to a sun-scorched vineyard where two figures in wide-brimmed hats stand with woven baskets, plucking massive grapes hidden deep in the tangled vines beneath a glaring, cloudless sky. An eerie calm that foreshadows rain. All morning, Ina's been glued to her sister and friends' breathless tales of Aldo-san single-handedly toppling the Red Bear. Her eyes snap open, and she balls one hand into a tight fist. Aisha snaps a knowing nod and teases that she never expected this from the young man. Aina, the white-haired guy, beams that he's glad the main character arrived from Norland. Aina gushes that Aldo is ridiculously cool, and the three of them cram around a table in the clearing, trading juicy news. Toke chuckled, declaring Aisha had crumbled into panic the second Flora was threatened. The girl beside him crossed her arms, pinched her lips into a hard scowl, and stared blankly ahead. At that instant, cutting him off, Aisha slams her heel into the young man's bare leg with every ounce of strength. He howls in pain but clamps his mouth shut, swallowing any protest to protect her reputation. Toki crushes his face into the table, choking back raw moans, while the girl turns away, pretending nothing happened and sneering that everyone was saved by Aldo. They'd have been doomed if they'd trusted an idiot who couldn't even handle a bow. Rage and irritation flare across Toke's face. When Aisha asks if she's wrong, he refuses to answer, snaps up from the table, spins away, and storms out, abandoning Aina in the dark. She watches the boy walk away in silence, then snaps her gaze to her sister, displeasure carved into her face. Aisha looks away and hisses, "Nothing was as it seemed." Aina lunges to object. Toke said the opposite. But Aisha springs from the table, shuts her eyes and says, "Everything is as it is," then drifts off, stretching lazily like she just woke from a dream while her sister is left speechless. Aina forces an awkward laugh and snaps that, at this rate, her sister will never become a sister. But she no longer hears those words. The scene snaps to the village. Villagers freeze, eyes glued to the radiant garden as their children romp and laugh through the flowering bushes. At the same moment, the main character and his companion perch on the hill, staring down at the village from a bird's-eye view. Wooden houses huddled below, plowed fields etched into the earth. He slings an arm around Flora's shoulder. She tucks one hand behind his back, presses the other to his chest, and gazes into the distance with a soft smile as Aldo breathes. The view is so beautiful. The young man feels memories of Norland surge back, those days blazing alive, and relief floods him. He's finally free of the royal capital. The main character, in his memoir, flips through photos of his return to the capital, bathed in honors, drowned in thunderous applause and jubilation, yet joy never touched him. He snaps his head toward his companion, calls Flora, and confesses his love to her once more, his eyes burning with joyful, tender fire. He planted himself in the heart of the clearing, confessed he'd never felt anything like this, and thanked Flora for opening him to these new emotions. And Flora murmured through barely parted lips that she hadn't felt that way either. Tears sprang to the heroine's eyes and ran down her cheeks. Joy, not sorrow. Then Flora declared, "I love you too, Aldo-san," and met his gaze beaming. He hauled her against him, his hands locking behind her back as he covered his eyes while she buried her face in his shoulder, crying with pure joy. He pats her head to calm her, shuts his eyes and smiles in quiet relief. Flora seizes the young man's shoulder and buries her face in him, sobs ripping free, and they both realize the legend of the paired flower was true. Meet Karun, long hair flowing, an A-rank adventurer and ex-Black Silver Squad member who finally took the chalk at the magic school she dreamed of as a kid. But there's one catch. A girl with a high ponytail stormed into the School of Magic's headmaster's office, straight at a woman in glasses with painted lips. Karuna squared up, declared he was quitting, and strode out. The director scoffs at the teacher, vaults down from the table, pleads with Kirina-san to wait, and vows to handle the problem. but she cuts him off, refuses to listen, and walks out of the office. Karun burst from the school building, clutching her wand. She spun, blinked for the last time, and strode straight toward whatever her eyes sought. The magic school was nothing like his girlfriend had imagined. A jagged image hit her, the headmistress and 2 teachers closing in, the school ruled by class prejudice, and every meeting soaked in stiff noble ceremony. Karun snaps, refuses to take it any longer, and storms out of the school of magic. Regret tugs at her heart, but she knows leaving beats staying around those people. One dragon slayer's meteoric fame drew aristocrats hell-bent on marrying Karuna. While the girl sealed off a long corridor, she spotted a white-haired man striding toward her, flowers clenched in his hands. He halts before her, flashes a smile, clutches a lone rose in his hand, and greets Karuna-san, Earl Clark Raymond, head of the Raymond family. The young man closes the distance and slides a flower into Karuna's hands. Awkward, she accepts in silence, eyes fixed on the bloom as she wrestles with what to do. The man before her is a royal knight who snaps for Alda's whereabouts every time and, without missing a beat, relentlessly presses a marriage proposal on him. Karuna realizes with cold clarity that Earl Clark Raymond's smile is a sham. Even now, he lifts the corners of his mouth and stares her square in the eye with that confidence-inspiring grin. She'd had enough of swallowing the aristocracy's arrogance. When Karuna heard Aldo was walking away from the team, she couldn't even make sense of him at first and bristled, slightly offended. Now the heroine understands him perfectly. A vision blooms before his eyes as the young man grins radiantly and tells his companion he's off to Norland to finally live a calm, measured life. The girl plunged deeper into the dark alley, a magic wand clenched in one hand and a bag of things in the other, when a flash seared the heroine's mind. Of course Aldo had said where he was going, a small village in the countryside. When she spots a blinding light at the end of the transition, the former teacher of the School of Magic chooses to slip into a quiet life among ordinary people, teaching them magic and passing on her knowledge. Cut to a sun-drenched city, thrumming with life. People stream down the streets, chattering and hustling through their day. Horses clatter by, hauling sleds piled with goods. Shops fling open and merchants call, beckoning customers inside. She forces out a ragged sigh, snaps her eyes shut, and whispers that maybe everything happening to her is for the best. The village boys and girls Karun passed burned with hunger for magic, their eyes sparkling far brighter than the noble kids, and this was the very dream the School of Magic's teacher had longed for, to become their mentor. Pressed in the crowd, she can't stop thinking about Aldo, a man who lives to swing a sword and hunts with lethal skill, but who can't even grow a single vegetable. Perched in the creaking cart, her thoughts snap to Aldo. He shrugs off courtship, so she knows he won't land a girlfriend anytime soon, and is probably lonely right now. A smile betrays Kirune at the mere thought she might one day be a young man's bride, but she snuffs it out, shoving away the fierce joy it ignites. They push the action back by several hours as the royal capital is swallowed by ink-black clouds and hammered by a deluge that wipes nearly everything from sight. The hero in black robes splashed through puddles, a dark hood masking half his face as his lips stayed sealed. Not a single word escaped. Clad in dark clothes, a stranger halts at the Raymond's house, a magnificent mansion, and stares up at windows where light blazes. Knight Zolak peels off his drenched clothes, water streaming from his soaked hair and suit, fists balling as he snaps at the prince. "Why did you even come here in this weather?" A young prince plants himself before a middle-aged man and razor-quick and unmistakable, announces the king's order. "Return the killer of the dragon Aldred." Zook snaps. "Are Aldred's men looking for the king?" And a blinding image crashes into my head. The kingdom's ruler planted on the throne in lavish robes, talking about something. The prince grins and declares it's doable, but only Zoak can actually shoulder this brutal task. Smelling a setup, the man snaps, "Is Clark up to something again?" The young man chuckles, lounges grander on his couch, and fires back. "Dark-haired old man, you sulking right now?" Clark feels it. Zoak is still obsessed with Aldred and hell-bent on revenge. Zoak's face blackens, his lips clamping into a thin, cold line. No answer comes. The Count feels the mood shift and snaps. What twisted face is Zoak wearing now? The question dies unanswered as the man turns his back and vows he'll find Aldo. The Count declares fresh intelligence. A shadowy suspect slipped out of the kingdom and headed west. Zoak hung on every word. Clark reports he can rule out the Empire of Vespania, and even the kingdom of the Sylves. The witness's account locks onto the exact moment he vanished, and every clue points to Aldred as the wanderer who headed west. The farmer he helped along the way proves it with his own words. Sighing, Zoak notes the main character still pokes his nose into other people's affairs, so help will hit him from the side this time. With the man still in the room, the Count reads his hesitation, nods, and fires the question. Can Aldred be brought down by any means? Clark locks eyes with the mercenary and snaps he can do whatever it takes. Just don't kill him. The main character has to stay alive. The Count crosses his legs and narrows his gaze as the dark figure melts into the distance. Zoet steps into the night rain, heading back out to do his job again. Lips sealed, he stares ahead as rain carves cold lines down his face, a fierce promise exploding inside him. This time he won't let Aldred escape. In the garden, the young man and Flora sit together as he eyes a radish jutting from the earth and asks if he can yank it free. Flora leans down a breath and nods her consent. Aldred clamps his fingertips around a stubborn radish, bellows, "Go ahead!" and rips it from the earth with every ounce of strength. The girl beams, thrilled he pulled it off. He cradled the perfectly round radish like a gem, eyes wide, and blurted, "It's simply wonderful." At last he grasped what Joy Flora meant about harvesting. Clapping her hands, the girl exclaimed she understood Aldo-san perfectly. She'd felt that exact same thing, bent over the garden, picking her own vegetables with her own hands. He pushes the next stalk into Flora's hands. They raise this crop shoulder to shoulder, and he won't let one person claim all the glory. She flinched, crumpled to her knees, trembling, and the young man surged forward, leaning close and asking, "What's wrong?" Flora whispered that everything hurt after that very night. It had been her first. Guilt slammed into him and he choked out an apology for going too far. She brushed it off, saying she's fine, just a little uncomfortable. She plucks a radish between her fingertips, yanks up another just as mouth-watering, and both of them agree. Delicious. The guy presses the fresh harvest toward her, and the hero and the young maiden sink their teeth into freshly picked radishes. Crunching the vegetable, Aldo grins and says it's surprisingly sweet with a spicy kick. Flora calls that mix perfect. Aldo boasts he could eat a whole mountain of radishes, but the other guy scoffs that it's impossible. The heroes race to whip up a radish salad, grabbing every scrap for breakfast. Aldo, baskets clutched, discovers radishes can't be planted in the same spot, and Flora snaps they must harvest the old crops first. She says you can only plan new plantings after that. Hauling bulging baskets of crops back to the house together, the main character fires off a plan to expand the field so the next harvest will be even bigger than before. Flora steps over the threshold and blurts a sheepish apology for intruding. Then it hits her. This isn't someone else's house. Mortification washes over her and she goes mute, not answering Aldo's soft, amused giggles. Clutching the basket to her chest, the girl flushes and murmurs that after yesterday there's nothing to be done, while the main character chuckles warmly and apologizes for his behavior. Flora throws the question aloud. Can he live in her house like it's his own? The main character snaps that it would be impossible for Elgeson. It would overwhelm him. He scooped the basket from Flora and stepped in to help, but she waved him off. It's fine. Won't take long. I want to cook for the main character myself. Aldo's resistance shatters, confusion flickering in his eyes as he breathes a shaky thank you and lets her set every plan in motion. Flora grabs an apron and asks if she can slip it on. The main character nods, eyes fixed as her companion knots a perfect bow at her back. She spun to face the young man and asked him to wait a little while as she whipped up their food, an apron tied tight to keep her clothes clean, and a wreath perched on her head like a cheerful ornament. All those cheeks flush scarlet, he can't tear his eyes from the heroine, struck by how unbearably cute she looks in that outfit and apron. After a while, Flora sets the table and flings out an apology for the long wait. But he ignores her. He's fixated on the dish's shocking red, stained that way by radishes. The girl beams, convinced the dishes look even more mouth-watering now, and the main character devours each meal with their eyes, admiration blazing in their gaze. The young man eagerly offers to start eating right away, and Flora grabs a chair, shoves it back and collapses into it, still uncomfortable and aching from last night's ordeal. She clenched her hands into tight fists, daring him to start eating so she could feast on his reaction, and the hero chirped, "Enjoy your meal," as he lifted a spoonful of soup to his lips. After that, he seized each bite with careful curiosity to taste it, and noted the food was simply excellent. The radish aftertaste hit last and stole the show. He noticed Flora's plate untouched and asked what was wrong. She smiled and said she just wanted to watch how the guy would eat. She'd always dreamed of cooking for someone she loved. He cleared his throat to smother the embarrassment of what he'd heard, then blurted, voice shaking, whether Flora had really stared at him the entire first time he set foot in her house. The young maiden burst into a defense, pleading she couldn't help it. She'd already accepted she'd never meet a man she liked again, and then he appeared on her doorstep. He only smirked. Locking onto the young man's grin, Flora snaps, "Was that really funny?" then fixes me with a pitying stare and nibbles a tiny bite of the food she'd prepared. Lighting up the girl with a dazzling smile, the main character grins and says he's just been picturing how even an ordinary breakfast turns into something magical when his beloved Flora sits at the table. A lightning bolt thought hits him. Living with a loved one at his side turns the dullest, most mundane moments into tiny, crackling adventures. Meanwhile, the former teacher of the School of Magic leapt off the cart and bolted down a different path, hunting Aldo. Zolak, a blade for hire, tails them, stalking the main character with lethal intent under direct orders from the king and the count. Oblivious to it all, he savors breakfast with his companion, clinging to the quiet and praying it will last forever. After a few days staying with Aldo and Flora, she must return home. She bears everything to her lover, and Haroldne's declaration knocks him sideways. Flora piled the laundry and every loose thing into a neat stack and said her mom and dad had allowed her to stay here. But her voice broke. She desperately wanted to visit them because she missed them so much. Flora stares at the hero with hope burning in her eyes, silently begging him to stand by her on the trip. She won't go alone. Flushed by the surprise offer, the hero blurts that of course he'll go with his companion. They're a couple now, so he must stand before Elgis and Fiona, the parents of his chosen one. He hesitates for a heartbeat, his unfinished words hanging in the air as his companion stares, rapt and expectant, waiting for him to speak. He fumbled behind his ear, words stumbling out as he sheepishly confessed he wanted to ask Flora's parents for her hand in marriage. Wedding rituals twist with the setting, city bustle or village calm, and if a church stands in town, the couple swears their vows beneath its rafters. You can shout the news into the roar of a packed harvest festival. In a tiny village with no celebrations, you have to go door to door and win each parent's consent. Flora drops into silence, clutching her hands to her chest. The protagonist locks onto her, frozen and speechless as dread tells him something's wrong. He leans down a little, peering into the girl's hair-veiled face, and just as he starts to ask a question, Flora explodes into bitter sobs, clamping her hand over her lips to choke them back. Aldo collapses into a stunned daze, frozen as he stares at her tears, utterly clueless how to act around her now. He blurts out, convinced he's been rushing everything. Through tears, Flora insists he didn't. Her tears come from something else. She lifted her head and beamed, rubbing her fingers together as she confessed she was just so happy about what she'd heard and apologized if her crying had scared him. Right then he knows he chose her. A radiant grin splits his face as he reaches to cup her cheek, gently caresses it, and wipes away the burning tears. They lock together in the room's center in a tender embrace. Flora buries her face against Aldo's shoulder, while the main character's heart swells with fierce gratitude for the companion who accepts him just as he is. The instant Aldo's lover calms down, the guy pushes her to finally leave on business. It doesn't happen. Karuna meets the guy and the girl on the threshold of the open door. Nobody expected this visit. He freezes, stunned, forces out a greeting, and prays she won't blurt a single needless word. Karuna barged into the conversation, giggling and tossing out wildly inappropriate comments. She squealed that Aldo and Flora finally hooked up, confessing she thought it'd take forever since our hero is hopeless at love and Flora's such a late bloomer. Rage boiled over in him. He slapped the girl and barked, "Shut up!" Karuna screamed instantly, stunned and bewildered that the main character would hit her, and he coldly shot back that it was for prevention purposes. A little calmer, the girl beams that Flora and Aldo are the loveliest couple, then catches herself with a grin. They're no longer mere lovers. They're the bride and groom. The young man bellows that right now he and his beloved are going to get official permission, but Flora flushes and insists there's no need to shout about such private matters. And Karuna, mortified, yells even louder that the news will sweep through Norland. The girl ducks behind his shoulder, so he pivots and fires a question at Karuna about the chaos in the forest. She chuckles, then answers, because fixing this is exactly why she came. She flings her hands up, gesturing wildly as she shouts that the red bear was delivered. Then she and her squad swarm in, scooping up every scrap of meat and usable material. Tarina remembers gathering materials with her companions when small monsters swarmed to the red liquid's scent. The hunters drove them off without a scratch, and she exhaled in relief that it ended without needless trouble. She had meant to bring meat to Aldo yesterday, only for the teacher to bark that she should ditch the guy and bring jerky next time. He cleared his throat and fired off the question. "When can we enter the forest?" Karuna's eyes narrowed. "Unless more deadly monsters appear, they'll most likely be able to go in 4 or 7 days. The young man throws a grateful thanks for the help and sets off with Flora for Elgis's house. Karuna calls out a fierce good luck and warns the heroes to be careful on the road. They hug tightly, then press onward. After a while, Flora and Aldo reach the girl's parents' beautiful house and are swept into warm embraces by her mom and dad, who exclaim they'd been waiting and congratulate them on their return. The girl's father pumps the young man's hand with an easy, friendly grin. The main character wishes him a good day while sizing him up, and the girl's mother suggests they continue in the living room. Flora surged closer. Her mother blinked, stunned. Flora was brighter, happier, more beautiful than before, and urged her to hurry before the food grew cold. The dining table groaned under a lavish spread of steaming dishes, the man's eyes devouring the sight as his mouth watered, and Fiona thought if her daughter turned up with her lover, there was no point holding back. She'd cook like crazy. They sat at the same table like a real family, 4 glasses colliding in a ringing clink as they toasted the birth of their new family. Flora's father beams. The girl asks what's wrong with his bass. He cradles a glass, joy glowing on his face. The man beams, he's over the moon. Flora's no longer just a friend. She marched Aldo into the family home as her boyfriend, and the mortified virgin frantically begs her dad to stop. Fiona stood by her husband, saying she'd watched alongside him since Aldo-san from Norland arrived, and had been itching to see when they'd finally pair off, and she melted at her daughter's shy, flushed face. Elgis swings his glass side to side and declares that every time Flora invites Aldo to lunch, he and his wife trade glances, wondering if the relationship has actually moved forward, while the main character lowers his head and apologizes for his weakness. Flora rockets to her feet, screaming that Aldo-san isn't really a weakling and that she wants to protect him now. She keeps talking, confessing he failed to catch the desperate clues and can barely recall the events from 9 years ago. Flora's parents lean in, demanding she keep going, while Aldo reels, unsure if his beloved is defending him or humiliating him all over again. Flora presses on, describing how Aldo cared for her with fierce tenderness and charged the monster to drag her to safety. And she pleads, don't call Aldo a weakling. The heroine's father drinks in her words, a soft smile unfurling on his face. He shuts his eyes and exhales a quiet, weighty "I see." Elgis meets his gaze and says, if Aldo hadn't stepped in, our daughter wouldn't be in this room. My wife and I are forever grateful. Fiona and Elgis drop into deep, grateful bows before him, but he lifts a hand to halt them and says, that's not necessary. He argues it's instinct. He'd risk everything to save the woman he loves. But the family head snaps that even if Flora is his beloved, not everyone can stand against a monster and conquer their own fear. Flora and Aldo lock eyes, share a sly grin and a decisive nod. Flora's cue for him to lay down the offer they'd planned that morning. Cutting through the tide of thanks and honors, Aldo turns to the stunned head of the family, cheeks burning with shyness but swallowing his fear and forcing himself to stand tall. He shoved his chair back and stood, eyes sweeping to his parents and his beloved, nerves crackling through him, and his voice catching before he spoke. Aldo thundered, Elgis! Fiona! And the hero's companion stared, breath snagged and both hands clamped to her chest, while the family head's wife flew a hand to her mouth and let out a stunned exhale. He thundered that he would marry Flora and begged the family for their approval and blessings. Flora's breath catches. She snaps her gaze from the hero to her parents, heart hammering, waiting for an answer with the same raw, trembling dread as her loved one. Aldo-san sinks into a deep bow to honor the family, clamps his eyes shut, and prays they'll grant their blessing so he can marry her. He misses it. Elgis and Fiona lock eyes and share a smile that screams everything, and the girl senses it but stays silent. Flora's mother throws her blessing behind Aldo-san and invites him to marry their daughter. Elgis shrugs that he'll object to nothing if Aldo-san is the intended, and suggests they announce the wedding at this year's harvest festival. Both parents are all in. He bolts upright, eyes wide in stunned disbelief, and when Elgis not only grants permission but pledges to back the marriage he spins to his bride-to-be, and joy exploding from him calls her to his side. Aldo and Flora, finally allowed to marry, glow with joy as Flora hurls herself into Aldo's arms, buries her face in his neck, clings tight and sobs with happiness, blinking away tears while her parents watch with equal delight, and Fiona wipes her own eyes. A brand new life ignites. Standing before the family head, he gasps and blurts, "Am I really going to be Norland's next elder?" Aldo rubbed the back of his head as Elgis slammed the question. The main character didn't know and forgot Flora was his daughter? And Aldo, flustered, mumbled a shaky, "Yeah." Realizing the truth, the man snapped, "Did you forget Flora's father is a village elder?" The boy flushed, apologized, and admitted he'd always assumed Elgis was Flora's father. He isn't angry. He laughs, teasing that Aldo-san can be hopelessly absent-minded. Elgis's wife turns to Flora and asks her to take good care of her betrothed. Flora rolls her eyes in embarrassment and gives a reluctant nod. Conversation wrapped, Dessert time. Over steaming tea and decadent cheesecake, Flora and the main character huddle over their own secret, laughter spilling as they beam with pure happiness. Aldred shatters the silence, grinning as he admits seeing his daughter with the young man always makes him smile. And the man then blurts out whether Flora's long-cherished wish has finally come true. A question that leaves the future newlyweds squirming. Fiona rips her daughter's secret into the open. She says 9 years ago Flora sobbed herself raw after Aldo left the village, and the girl lunges to silence her mom, desperate to stop her from telling stories. Remembering the nights Flora sobbed into her pillow for hours, the girl's mother explains why it had to be this way, wanting Aldo to feel even a sliver of the struggle an adult endured trying to calm her child, while Flora presses trembling palms to her reddened cheeks, and the main character looks on with a soft smile. A brittle chuckle escapes him as he pivots to his betrothed and murmurs thanks, heart pounding with relief that she'd been thinking of him every single moment. Tongue-tied, she squeaked, "I'm happy too," her cheeks burning crimson after all those stories and words. Aldo zeroes in, determined to pry the rest of the story out of Fiona. The girl, utterly at a loss, buries her face in her hands and lets out a strangled, embarrassed mumble. The father leaps to Fiona's defense, declaring she was so wrecked that not even her favorite meal could steady her. Her parents' pleading did nothing, and the girl stares at them, panic in her eyes, afraid they'll blurt everything. Aldred's wife revealed how Flora, crushed that she couldn't answer the main character's question about the flowers, begged her mother to spill every secret about them. And it was heartbreakingly sweet. When Flora's mother finally spotted her tomato-red cheeks, she burst into laughter and dared them to continue. But the young maiden, mortified, begged them to stop. Her father finally barked that by then Flora burned with determination, and the girl was already screaming that it was time to finish. His body quakes, tears carve tracks down his cheeks, and he can't stop the avalanche of emotion crashing through him. Tension explodes around the table as everyone freezes. The main character's beloved lashes out, "What happened?" Their voice raw with worry for him. His voice cracked as he blurted, "I'm sorry I never had a family like that." And experiencing this now flooded him with joy while Fiona and Elga shot each other worried looks. He clamps a hand on the hero's shoulder to steady him and snaps, "We're a family of 4 now. I won't hesitate to rely on you," while Fiona beams, glowing with how happy she is to have such a son-in-law. He starts to apologize, but Flora suddenly bolts forward and flings herself into a tight, desperate hug, pressing him to her chest as she covers her eyes. Tears burn her eyes, but she steadies the one she loves and insists, "It's okay now," while Aldo freezes, utterly bewildered and at a loss for how to respond. He clenched her hand until his fingers ached, tears slipping from under his thick lashes. Flora said, "Now we have each other, nothing to fear," and he breathed a raw, grateful thank you. She stepped into the yard, eyed the trunks bristling with gear, and insisted they be moved first. The young man nodded, agreed, and readied himself to help. Aldred hauls a wheeled cart behind him and thrusts it toward Aldo. "Use it, it'll make this easier." And Aldo exhales, thanking him for his care. Elgo steps in to help Aldo so he won't have to lug the weight home alone. They drive the cart together, Elgos pushing from behind while Aldo takes the lead up front. He juts his head out, glares at the guy, and snaps that talk of him becoming the village elder isn't happening anytime soon. The main character doesn't have to take that role. The family head snaps that Aldo isn't old enough to step down. First, Aldo must learn to live at his own pace. Aldo exhales hard, agrees, and his mind flips through one brutal question after another. Why did I choose this? Why must I become an elder now? He rushes home, thanks the man for his help, and vows he'll handle the job himself. Elgas smiles, says Aldo's worked hard all day and urges him to dig into a proper hearty dinner. The scene snaps to Karina with 2 sisters and their friend, as the girl reels off every detail she dug up about Aldo and Flora in a single steady voice, and then asks if the main character is planning to get married. Karina shrugs off every question, awkwardly blurting that they'll go get official permission or something, tosses a quick, "good luck," slips away to cook red bear meat, then asks if she can help. Aisha's jaw drops. She can't believe 2 people who could barely speak to each other until recently have forged a bond stronger than lovers or friends. Toku already pictures the newlyweds hauling in furniture, convinced Aldo will have to build an addition onto the house to make room for Flora. Aisha slaps a hand over her face, grumbling that the very girl who only just came to her for love advice because she was inexperienced is already getting married. Horror locks onto Aisha's face as she pictures Aldo and Flora, at this rate, soon having children who'll call her aunt. And Tok can't fathom why his girlfriend is reacting like that. Tok sneers that Aisha will become an aunt. Aisha bristles with resentment. She feels she has more chances at this than a guy. Toke declares he'll craft furniture for the couple, saying where there's demand he'll supply it, while Aina watches in silence. The argument surges. He snarls that no one would ever spend their life with Aisha. She snaps that she can't imagine any man staying with even one person. They haven't even hit the kids' debate yet, and insults ricochet between them. Seeing, Ayana fixates on the couple in silent longing, aching to see the moment they finally start dating. Fiona cradles every bag and jar into the box with surgical precision, while her daughter crackles with fierce passion for something else. She snaps her head toward Flora and spots a long-haired girl cradling a painted plate in her hands. Flora's mother steps forward and says Flora can take the plate. Flora whips toward the voice, heart racing, pleading if she really may. It's her mother's favorite in the whole collection. She cradles the dishes into the girl's hands and tells her these plates can forge bright new memories with Aldo. Gripping Flora's hands, her mother cries out, "Don't ever forget. You always have a place to come back to. Your family home." Tears blur her vision, but she won't look away. She locks eyes with her mother and squeezes her hands until they ache. After their final goodbye, mother and daughter clung to each other in a wrenching last embrace, letting tears and raw sorrow pour out, while the head of the family stood in the room's corner, burying his face in his hands and weeping, not interfering with their farewell. Aldo and Flora are heaving a cart piled with goods together. Aldo strides in front, hauling a crushing load behind him, and then Flora's foot catches and she screams. The youthful, pleasant moment evaporates as he asks what happened, and she peeks out from behind a pile of things, saying she just stumbled. A voice suddenly rips through the air, calling to the heroes. "Are you all right?" And the residents rush in, offering to shoulder the cart if it proves too heavy. But Aldo shakes his head and insists he doesn't want to be a bother. A neighbor barrels over, voice shaking as she asks if Flora's all right after word a monster attacked. Flora shrugs. Unharmed, the whole ugly episode already over. But when the neighbor demands to know why such a young girl ventured so deep into the forest, Flora freezes, scrambling for an answer. Another resident burst into the conversation and blurted that the girl then dashed off toward that very special paired flower. After a while, the villagers hoisted and pushed the cart of belongings to the newlyweds' house, and the couple showered everyone with grateful thanks. A voice from the crowd cried, "What became of the flower in the end?" And someone snapped back, "It's plain." The moment Flora moved to Aldo, everything clicked into place. His grin lit up the room as he strode to the woman he loved and tenderly cradled her hand before the gathered crowd. Flora lets out a terrified scream, spins toward the man and clamps a hand over her mouth as the main character declares he and his beloved girlfriend will marry at the Harvest Festival. The crowd erupted into delighted cheers and joyful cries, and one person bellowed he'd deal with Aldo if he dared harm their plants. All day the crowd swarms the heroes, clamoring for answers about their decision and bombarding them with questions about the wedding. Anna and Aisha rushed up to the guy, beaming as they congratulated him on his upcoming wedding and cheered that Elgus and the others had finally recognized them. He beams, thanks the girls for their congratulations, admits he wanted to tell them himself sooner, but got swamped with other things, and now he decides to lay it all out. Aldo spots Toke and strides over, hands on his hips, snapping, "You actually decided to get married?" The question lands like a punch on the hero. Bursting into laughter, his friend says Flora is painfully shy, and Aldo brutally insensitive. Nobody ever thought they'd pair up this fast. And regret claws at the young man for even coming to talk about his relationship. Toke dropped the jokes and sharpened his reasoning, insisting the brand new family would need furniture. And while the protagonist turned that over in his head, his friend stood baffled, unable to grasp what else to consider. The guy throws out a plan to expand the house, jolting the main character from his reverie as he stares, pulse quickening, wondering what expand really means and why it's necessary. Toka snaps that family fights erupt all the time. Sometimes you even need separate rooms, and the guy was floored he'd never realized couples bicker this often. They ditch the choral chat, and a friend blurts that once the couple has a baby, he'll still need his own room. Aldo's blood runs cold, panic shooting up. Does he really have to shill up so soon? The friend pounces, grinning that baby cots are always in use. Rage explodes in the guy. He snaps, demanding if Toku's having fun, but Toku just stares, utterly baffled by the question. He explodes into a sprint after the blonde guy, swinging to land a hit as he grumbles that he'll still dance when he finally decides to get married too. Hearing wedding talk, one sister's pulse spiked. Has Toke finally decided on marriage, and is she ready to offer his older sister as his bride? Aisha hangs back, apart from everyone, stunned at how far Flora has come during this time. And Flora still clings to those same love tips. Grinning with his friends, Aldo knew the royal capital would never let him live in peace, and he couldn't even bear to think back to what had happened before. The scene slams into Avalon as the king roars, "Barak!" The old ruler lunges from his throne and snaps. "When will you finally find Aldred?" The man mutters to himself that the guy slipped through like a shadow, left almost no trace, and hunting him down will take time. The old man erupts, screaming louder than before, snapping, "What if another kingdom or some aristocrats find Aldred first?" And he demands they move. Everyone in the throne room is blind to it. Only the Count knows a lone figure is charging in, almost within arm's reach of his goal. Karuna rockets toward Northern, map clenched in her hand as she traces the route and knows she's heading exactly where she needs to go. The sorceress stares as an image of the main character swirls before her and pictures Aldo meeting her again. His stunned shock, the way he'd be moved and yank her into a fierce hug. Then a short, rueful laugh smashes the daydream and drags her back to reality. That can never happen. Karun shrugged and brushed it off, the same thoughts still buzzing in her head, and she strode back onto the road, humming to herself. He's on his way home, clambers up the mountain, and when he eyes the house, it hits him. He's not the only one living there now. The guy flings the door open, grins and declares he's home, his eyes snapping wide like it's the first time he's seen a girl. Flora stands over this kitchen table, spreading out every item, even the plates her mother pressed into her hands, and when she spots her lover at the door, a grin explodes across her face. She shoves her work aside and erupts with joy at Aldo-san's return. At last they're alone together, a calm island away from all the fuss. He presses a hand to his heart and blinks back tears. When the girl asks about Aldo-san, he smiles and says he's never been happier, more and more sure he's exactly where he belongs. She mops others' tears with a handkerchief, smiling because she believes it too. She's spent the whole day waiting for her loved one to come back. They sink onto the same sofa and fold into a warm hug as Flora thanks Aldo for hauling every last box into her new home, and the young man shrugs it off with a grin, promising he'll always be ready to help. Her grin flares. She declares she'll rely on her lover this time, and he vows he'll rely on Flora too. Their eyes lock, and the words fall away. Flora and Aldo reach for each other, fingers tangling, and at last crash into the long-awaited kiss. Finally, their lips collide, pouring into each other every ounce of tenderness and care they've been starved of. Flora murmurs into the kiss, then slowly eases away. She breathes 2 words, "Take me to the bedroom." And he gets it in a heartbeat. No teasing, no questions. He wants the same thing as his future bride. He scooped the stunned maiden into his arms and carried her into the bedroom, the air crackling with shared embarrassment yet carved into memory as Flora burrowed against the hero's shoulder, and he tightened his arms around her. The young man crossed to the bed and eased Flora onto the soft, spotless sheets, and she dropped her gaze to the hem of her trousers and shot him a questioning look. Right as she opens her mouth to ask the painfully obvious question, he fumbles and stammers that her blush came from nothing more than a tiny kiss. Aldo tells the heroine she doesn't have to interact with him at all today, carving out space to ease the tension because last night still leaves her hurting. Flora shrugs off the warning, insists she's fine, and says Aldo practically moved mountains helping with the move. She wants to thank you properly for your help. Aldred rubbed the back of his head, ready to protest, but the girl planted herself and refused to budge. She knew she could still help another way if he couldn't do it now, so he relented, itching to try the daring idea brewing in his mind. She peels off her clothes inch by inch, left only in a mercilessly tight corset, cheeks blazing as she asks him again if he truly means to carry out his plan with her Kirby forms. He braced himself on the bed with his hands and swore he was stone certain. After that, Flora could bury her hands in his muscles as much as she wanted. But when Virgo reached for the corset bow to untie it, he begged her to keep her clothes on. 2 hands clamp her curvy forms as a proud hairline sets a solid, dignified ridge between them, igniting fierce friction. She feels the air between them already blistering, and she only fans the flames, pressing the soft, round discs in her palms and grinding them together. That movement sends his body into a violent shudder. He digs his thin fingers into the bedsheets and snaps his head to the side. Flora leans in and clarifies. "Do I have to do it exactly like this?" He lets out a ragged exhale and says yes, clearly delighted. He really likes it. Gazing down at the dignity between the forms, Flora moves exactly as ordered while the main character pleads, begging her, "Don't stop." The action explodes. She screams that her forms are about to change now, but her cry cuts off as her clothes rip from the sudden, brutal contact. She blows out a hot breath and hisses she's burning up, her clothes ripped and Aldo finished. Drained by a new, oddly fascinating experience, he flopped onto the pillow, head sinking as sleep edged in. Flora, propping her chin on her hands, watched him with keen interest. Flora remembers the promise, unties the knot on the main character's shirt, slides her hand across his muscles, then clutches her own chest and nearly squeals with joy. Aldo can't fathom if his beloved is utterly captivated by muscles. The question hangs as she keeps tracing their curves, pressing and exploring, then nestles down on his chest. Flora plucks the guy's hand, tucks it under her cheek, curls up beside him and drifts off, buzzing with joy over everything that's happened recently, especially last night. The next morning, the young man bursts into the kitchen and tells Flora, who's working there, that Aisha and Tok have arrived. She scrambles to finish, and the hero, curiosity burning, leans over the wall to get a look. His eyes lock on a spread of irresistible lunchboxes, each crammed with stacked sandwiches and tempting snacks. Grinning sheepishly, Flora admits she went a little overboard. She hasn't been on a picnic in ages and had no idea what to cook. He hoists overflowing baskets of food, practically buzzing as he declares how ecstatic he is for their planned first picnic, and his beloved lights up with the exact same joy. They'd been camped at the house entrance forever when the main character finally burst out, hat perched on his head as he greeted everyone. Tok noticed the young man glowing with joy. Flora sidles up to Tok and Aisha and whispers that Aldo's heading out on his first picnic, practically vibrating with excitement. Aisha scowls. That makes no sense, the four of them already decided together. While Aldo just stares into the distance, soaking up the perfect weather. The young man plants his feet and declares it's time to hit the road, but Aisha cuts in, interrupting the idyll and snapping that their primary task is to collect the fruits of the eco. The heroes burst into the wheat and cornfield as the bright, scorching sun blazed overhead. Wheat shoots thrust toward the sky, countless stalks rising all around them. All four strode shoulder to shoulder, laughter and quick jests flying as they headed out to start work in the field. Today, Flora looks breezy and adorable in her new summer clothes. The compliment thrills her, and she bursts into a bright, delighted smile. She snaps a grin and gushes that the hero's outfit makes him look razor-sharp and impossibly fresh. Compliments and questions keep flying as Flora presses the hero for his verdict on her hat. He beams that it's gorgeous and fits perfectly, and she flashes a smile, promising to make an even cuter straw hat next time. Dazzled by the couple's radiant joy, Aisha missed her footing, tripped, and went sliding down. In the same heartbeat, Tok snatches her by the waist and snaps. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" Mortified, Aisha pivots and rushes off the other way. She only slipped. It happens. They surge up to the eco tree, branches bowed under fruit. Flora asks what they're for, and someone laughs. "We make an insanely tasty jam from them." Aisha snaps her head up, scanning the branches for any leftover fruit. Tok shakes his head, convinced the villagers will snatch every last one for themselves. Leaving the baskets piled with food, Tok barked for everyone to spread out and scour the area for any trees heavy with the fruits they needed. The four explode into a frantic search for fruit, while the main character's mind snaps to something else and he hangs back, refusing to join. Aisha snaps to Aldo to find out what he's doing. Aldo's voice stays eerily calm as he says he's scanning the area for dangerous animals. She chuckles, seeing how he'd been all smiles a heartbeat ago before his expression snapped into something terrifying at the click of his fingers, and she pleads with him not to pull that scary face on her so suddenly. The main character jabbed a finger at a hollow tree and shouted that ferrets were hiding inside. Aldo and Aisha leaned in to check. A tiny ferret rockets from the hollow and locks eyes with the guests. The young man says the noises came from the tree and the creature's habits match this species. Aisha snaps, asking why the hero is so obsessed with that. He grins, boasting it's a skill from his adventurer days. So don't worry about it. Then, mesmerized by the ferrets, the girl and the guy are jolted when a voice shouts that the tree has been found. All four sprang to their feet and stared up. Tok scanned the branches and was convinced the fruits were there, just maddeningly high and out of reach. Flora's face tightens. Collecting them will be brutal. Aisha echoes her worry. Tok eyes the other trees and says it's the same. Then the main character's beloved pipes up. What now? Do we go search for fruit somewhere else? A spark flashes in the hero's eyes. He'll scale the tree, grab the fruit, and tells the girl not to worry because climbing's his specialty. Back when Aldo was an adventurer, he scaled towering trees. Aisha swears Flora has nothing to fear. He's a former adventurer you can count on. The young man implores the girls to show him exactly where the fruits hang on the tree, and they agree to help. He vaulted into the branches, bellowed he'd fling the fruit down, then had to scoop everyone into his shirt. He vaulted onto a high branch, a sudden jolt of, "It's been forever since I climbed trees," hitting him, and he stayed to drink in the breathtaking view. Coiling his focus into muscle, he strides up, hurls the first fruits to Tok, snags them cleanly in his shirt, and hoists it up without missing a beat. Fearful he'd miss those fruits, the boy snapped that his reflexes weren't as slow as Aisha claimed. Then Flora cut through their argument, snatched a fruit and dropped it into the basket. Aisha jabbed left at 3 fruits. The hero spots them, but hunched in the bushes, fear coils in his gut. He's terrified he'll miss the catch. Flora cries that on the other side there are 2 more, maybe even 4. And the young man rockets over like death on his heels, snatching the fruits. A few stubborn fruits still cling to the treetop, but everyone agrees it's enough. Time for the main character to clamber down from the high branches. More trees demand inspection. Don't stop at just 1. From this dizzying height, Toke realizes he can't possibly catch Aldo if he suddenly plummets. At last he vaulted into another tree, dancing across every branch with masterful agility, hurling fruit into a friend's shirt that then tumbled into his beloved's waiting basket. At first everyone scoffed that the forest would give anything. Now Aldo's masterful hands have crammed the fruit baskets to bursting. Exhausted but thrilled, the 4 threw down a blanket and dove into their long-awaited picnic. Aisha noticed Flora fidgeting and making excuses because she feared her boyfriend might fall. But the mood warmed her up and she soon jumped in, even handing out directions. She turns away from her friends and confesses, "Aldo moved like lightning, so nimble I actually had fun." Toke watches as Flora's words lift the main character too. He snaps back to life, bursting with energy. The girl swivels to her lover and asks if he's angry, and he just grins. There's nothing to be mad about. The hero swoons at her naughty streak. She buries her face in her hands, cheeks burning, and goes mute. The young man's friend fires off, "Is her mischief in her blood?" And she erupts, screaming it might be, yet insisting she's nothing like her mother. Aisha abruptly launched off the blanket, planted her bare feet back on it, spun to face her friend with a hard, serious stare and declared, "It's all really great." After that, Aisha bolts forward and crushes Flora in a tear-soaked hug, begging whether 9 years of waiting were worth it. And she instantly figures the girl is drunk, because Flora emptied a whole bottle of wine by herself. Turning to the protagonist, Aisha snaps at the guy to be careful with Flora. Make her cry, and Aisha vows she'll never forgive him. Flora reels, cheeks burning with shock and embarrassment. He flashes a soft smile and soothes the drunk girl with a calm promise that nothing will happen. He knows how fiercely he must protect his beloved. The white-haired young man licks a finger, leans over the girl crushed in the blooms and taunts, "Why are you crying? Does alcohol really make you this sensitive?" She snaps and lashes out with an irritated kick. The boy barked, "Don't be embarrassed!" while Flora and Aldo watched the whole scene unfold, never once stepping in to interfere. Toke hauls drunk Aisha onto his back. She clutches his shoulder with one desperate arm while the other dangles lifelessly, and Aldo stands frozen, eyes wide and jaw dropped in stunned amazement. Toke flung the girl onto the sofa, exhaling like he'd run a marathon after hauling her from the forest to the house. Hands on his hips, he pleaded for calm, and she only shrieked incoherent nonsense, louder, grinning, thrilled she'd managed to drink so much. Flora's lips curled into a sly grin as she watched Aisha sip with careful restraint. She almost never overdid it, shockingly rare. The irritated man clicked his tongue, scratched the back of his head, and noticed Aisha had been acting suspiciously lately, especially since she learned about Flora's upcoming wedding. He steals a look at his girlfriend, wrapped in a hypnotic, peaceful sleep. And as his best friend says, "I do," a swarm of strange, confusing thoughts storms his mind. Toke spots Aisha asleep and snaps, bellowing her name until he's hoarse. She lies utterly unmoved, deaf to his screams. Flora lets out an awkward laugh and, trying to smooth things over, suggests they let the girl sleep a little longer. Aldo flips her focus, snaps his head toward Flora and fires, "Can you eat eco-fruits raw, or are they only good for jam?" Flora turns, flashes an approving smile, and assures him they're fine to eat as is. Rows of fruit and custard sandwiches sit pristine on the table, the same fresh fruit stacked in the tray beside them, steaming mugs of tea lined up like soldiers, and the hero bellows for everyone to dive into the feast. Toke perches at the table, arms folded and grinning, while Flora stands beside him balancing a tray of teacups and cheerfully announcing the tea is ready, and he stares at the feast, mouth watering, blurting out a delighted cry of admiration. Aisha, mumbling in her sleep, suddenly inhaled the irresistible scent of tea and sprang upright, covered in cold sweat. She whipped her head toward the dining table, fury flashing. Outraged the treat had started without her, she demanded, "Why didn't you tell me a thing?" and snatched a goodie, tearing into it. She hauled herself off the sofa, staggered to the table with a dull hangover clutching her head and froze at a plate of eco-fruits. Still holding her hand to her head, Aisha began to complain of migraines, and Toke spun on her and snapped that it was her own fault. She'd emptied an entire bottle of wine alone. The hero grins and booms that he's prepared sandwiches packed with Stewart and custard, inviting everyone to dive into this wild combo, then points to a platter of freshly sliced fruit and offers to dunk some pieces in jars of floral syrup, hoping the girl will find something she likes. Soon, Aisha beams and announces she handcrafted syrups in every color for Ren, Ka, Sia, and Marie, flaunting her kitchen victories, then nods. She knows exactly how to enjoy these fruits and eagerly spills her thoughts. Aisha springs from the table, confidently brandishing a fork and lifting it high. Toak and Flora beam approval as she cries with delight that the meal can begin, and the table erupts in a chorus of warm, enjoy your meal wishes. He rolled an eco onto a fork, eyed it like a prize, then popped it into his mouth. Flora, intrigued, bit into a custard sandwich with both hands, savoring every detail, while Toak, all in, shoved a whole piece into her mouth and chewed it thoroughly, clearly enjoying it. Aldo, mouth full, beams as different syrups drench the fruit in lush, layered flavor, sweet syrup colliding with tart fruit into perfect harmony. Toak shut his eyes in bliss, declaring sweets banish fatigue after he'd been hauling heavy loads. Someone immediately demanded he be silent. Aisha bit into the fruit and snapped that the jam tasted completely different, while Flora, cheeks aflame with surprise, insisted you always mix sour ego with sweet syrup to hit peak pleasure. Aldo studies it with admiration, pointing out how swapping syrups reshapes the flavor. And Aisha, peering into her mug, grins that the Mari flower syrup delivers a bright sweet and sour kick she loves. A friend of the main character blurts that Aldo has a wonderful wife, then lifts a mug and sips his tea. Flora stares at him baffled. She snaps, demanding he stop embarrassing her. She just married the main character. And Toak's grin widens, utterly entertained. Spotting Aisha pale and shaky, he thrusts a spoon of syrup from the ran at her, insisting it will smash a brutal hangover. And a sharp question about that syrup cuts the air immediately. The young man declares the syrup hits like a storm, flooding you with strength, silencing your cough, and, because it isn't bitter, going down easy. Of all the mixtures Flora prepared, this one packs the most healing power. Flora gapes at Toak's uncanny knowledge, and Aisha fixes him with a hard look, blurting, "I really feel a little better. But how does my friend know all this?" Toak remembered teaming up with his beekeeper friend to harvest honey. Between swatting away relentless bees and diving into the craft's finer points, he peppered the work with fascinating facts. A thunderous knock slams the door. He whirls and snaps he'll open it himself. Aisha begs Toak to take her to that aviary friend, but Toak flat out refuses. Aina storms onto the doorstep, plants her hands on her hips, fury blazing as she screams, "Is your soulmate skipping and shirking work again?" A dagger of a migraine rips through her. She pleads with her sister to stop screaming so much, and Aina erupts, snapping at Aisha. "Did you really get drunk again?" Aina's fury boils over as she screams. "Didn't my sister come to work because she got drunk here?" The girl clutches her head like she's ill. Flora watches anxiously and reaches to smooth things over, and Toak insists Aisha isn't always like this. Aldo dropped the bomb that Aisha's friend was getting married. A tidal wave of joy and sorrow crashed through her, and she drank herself senseless. A friend of the main character snaps that if she'd told the whole truth from the start, none of this would have happened. And every attempt to shield Aisha only fans her fury. Flora sidled in to hijack the conversation, shoved the eco-fruits they'd gathered under Aina's nose and dared her to taste them. Aina pressed again, asking about the fruits. With her hair pulled up, the girl planted her sister on a chair and set a plate with a sandwich and eco-fruits before her. The sister eyed it skeptically, then wrapped her arms around the food and bit down. Her sister's eyes glitter with how much she loved it. Flora beams, jubilant, and Ina teases that Aldo's the lucky one. He gets to eat food this delicious every day. The younger sister's gambit paid off. Ina's fire went cold the moment they skimped on the whipped cream. She thrusts another plate with a sandwich forward, announcing Aldo hauled in a whole bounty of those fruits so her sister can gorge herself, and she beams that the main character is insanely cool. Everyone crowds the same table as Flora beams at her husband, praising him, while Toak can't resist teasing a friend by calling him a monkey. The hero shrugs. Compared to the old days, this was a breeze, nothing special. He remembers that on earlier missions he had to scale far higher heights than when he plucked the eco-fruits from the trees, and I picture Klein weaving a quick, crackling spell to lift him. Each time he slipped and tumbled in sharp pain, his companion would swoop in, hauling him upright with razor skill and blazing magic. Now she wrestles with what kind of wedge the teacher's role might drive between them. Even in her adventuring days, she clicked with the kids, and now that bond is stronger than ever. Memories of Keel and Elliot slam into his head, leaving him desperate to know where they've gone and what they're doing now. The scene careens northeast of the Empire of Vespania. crashing into the village of Legacy and straight into the hotel where the former magic teacher now stays. She sipped her tea as the boisterous adventurers at the next table erupted. Monsters had devoured the neighboring village's grain fields, so they insisted they had to take the job there. Klein grins at the men around the table as a rush of memory hits. Her old squad huddled the same way, arguing where to go, which tasks to take, and what reward would await. She shot to her feet, barreled to the reception and called the old woman over, jabbing at the map and demanding how long the road would take. The woman said about a month, and if someone went alone, it would take even longer. The situation clawed at the sorceress. She'd expected this route to be quicker than going to Nultende, yet fate offered no shortcut. She would have to go there to reach her goal. Klein strides out of the hotel, grinning as he thanks the hostess for her care while she says goodbye to her. And at the same time, the Count's mercenary watches the sorceress from behind a wall, his face hidden beneath a black hood. He aches to know where Aldred, the dragon slayer, ran off to. Aldred vanished without a trace, and now the whole kingdom hunts him, while Zoek is on a lone mission to shadow one person. Zoek must tail his ex-squadmate Karun, a magician blissfully clueless, if he ever wants to catch Aldred. Surveillance flashes slammed into him, and from the route she carves and every deliberate step she takes, it's highly likely she's heading straight for her former companion. Zoek slips from the shadows and hangs a few paces behind Kirune, a sly, knife-edged grin slicing across his face. While the girl stays blissfully unaware, the mercenary burns with impatience to finally reach Aldred and carry out his orders. The next morning, Flora throws herself into back-breaking garden work, yanking out stubborn grass and planting seedlings with laser focus, while the main character creeps up behind her, steps nearly silent. A young man hatches an insidious scheme, a grin blooming on his face all on its own, and he stretches his hands toward the unsuspecting girl kneeling in the garden beds, harvesting. His palms slam over Flora's eyes as he demands, "Who is it?" She freezes, screams, and tumbles, landing squarely on top of him. Flora pouts, lips jutting, cheeks sulking, and snaps, "Don't sneak up on me like that!" Aldo bursts into laughter, admitting he only wanted to see her scared face. And when she realizes he turns away in a huff, the main character just gets more entertained. He breathes a hurried apology to his beloved girl, grabs her hand and pulls her to her feet, while his other hand shields her straw hat, tucking it into cool shade away from the sun. They crane their necks toward the blazing sun, squinting, and he says he first arrived in spring. Life hurtles on so fast you barely notice it changing. At one of the beds, Flora laced her fingers with Aldo's and murmured that only a few remained. Soon they'd be harvesting beans and carrots. He nods, counting off. "About 2 weeks left," he says. She sweeps her hand across the beds and declares that in 3 weeks they'll harvest the herbaceous plants and onions, then move on to the other species. The man declares a change of season will follow. Autumn is coming. Flora flushes with embarrassment, squeezes someone else's hand tighter in her own, and murmurs that the long-awaited event will happen at the Autumn Harvest Festival. She dropped the last word like a bell. Come autumn, at the holiday, they'll finally be officially husband and wife, and her chest swells with unstoppable joy. She gathers rations for his hunt, fires him a fierce good luck, presses a tiny pouch into her lover's hand, and he grins, thanking her. Just as Aldo was about to leave the house, the girl lunged forward, cupped his cheek and planted a loud kiss, her face flaming scarlet with embarrassment, and Aldo froze, stunned. His hand flew to his cheek. Then he yanked it back in surprise. Flora smirked, closed one eye and stuck out her tongue. Laughter cracked between them, their eyes snapping together, and Aldo barked a playful grumble. His beloved had just stolen one kiss. All this time, the main character's friend stood outside the door, grumbling about the brutal morning heat. Then his gaze snapped to the picture pinned to the house door. Aldo and Flora cling at the door, locked in a kiss, while Toke explodes, yelling there's nothing to be nice about and it's high time they left. Toke clenched his fist, displeasure coiling through him as he snapped that this couple always behaves like this. And the guy's mind jolted back to a few hours ago, to what happened to him while he was having breakfast at his place. He bites into the bun, the taste of those delicious eco sandwiches exploding on his tongue as a warm pride reminds him how cool it is to have a wife. And now he wants to find someone like Flora, kind, economical, sweet. Only Aisha's face fills his vision. His eyes snap wide, he gags on his food and frantically tries to slam the thought out of his head. Toke explodes, accusing a pair of newlyweds of making him like this, then bolts. The main character's friend runs off too as Flora and Aldo gape at him in stunned confusion. Aina lunges across the sheets, shakes her sister by the shoulder and roars for her to get up. Everyone's already out in the fields while she's the only one still asleep in bed. Aisha cracks one eye open and insists she's already up. then promptly flops back onto the soft pillow and dozes off again, driving her sister crazy with annoyance. The younger sister clings to the blankets, grumbling and refusing to get up, pleading that her sister can't leave her behind. Ayana screams that if so, Aisha won't show up for work at all today. She yanked her sister out of the house, filled a wooden basin with water, and barked at the still sleepy girl to wash up immediately. Aisha, eyes half-lidded, drags a bar of soap across her face and mutters it won't lather. As a sister screams, the littlest is smearing tooth powder on her cheeks, and the oldest lunges in to wipe it away with a towel. The younger sister fumbles with her clothes, slipping an apron on upside down over her pants as Ina screams it's all backwards and has to be the other way. She snatches a quick bite while her older sister's yelling rips through the kitchen, but drowsiness pins her eyelids half closed. The younger one crashes face first onto the table and instantly conks out. Inette hauls her back, slows her down again and barks, "Gather your strength." The action crashes into the forest. 3 wild deer stand by the foliage, utterly unaware they're moments away from becoming the hunter's prey. He draws the bowstring tight, locks his aim on a deer, lets his fingertips go, and the arrow screams into the bullseye, toppling his target. He crumpled beside the lifeless creature, thinking it's been a whole month since the red bear attacked Flora. Every animal bolted at first, then slowly slunk back into their habitat. A swarm of tiny magical creatures poured in with them, but Aldo crushed the problem in an instant, muttered he never wanted the red bear to show its face again, then strode off. He spots Karina crouched in the bushes. Exposed, she huffs that she was trying to hide, and he cracks a smug grin. That trick won't fool him. Pouting with bitter resentment, the girl snarls that the young man is tapping into his feral instincts again. Karina bolts 30 meters away, but it doesn't help. The main character declares everyone can tell a human from an animal. Karina seethed, convinced Aldo wasn't some ordinary adventurer after he'd single-handedly felled the red bear. Aldo laughed and told her to press herself against the wind. Scent will betray anyone. The girl reels in shock and asks again how that's even possible. And peering into the forest's depths, the guy says Lauren, for example, is now coming from the north side. He grins, his hunch nailed, and declares Lauren's already here. Karina doesn't even notice him, so the main character volunteers to slip into the bushes alone and flush out the hunter. Karina snaps upright into the wind, ears hunting for any whisper, then tilts her head and sniffs the air, chasing a faint scent. She nails it, asks where the smell is coming from. He smirks and tells her to go check it herself. So Karina scoops up pebbles and aims to pelt the spot she suspects. The 5 stones slammed into the bushes, and a man's agonized scream ripped out from within. Each blow drove sharp pain through him. Hidden in the bushes, the hunter snarls as the couple slaps a victorious high five over their successful prank. Lauren strides up and demands, "Did you teach her that?" He shrugs and says he only offered advice. Laughing, Karina boasts she found Lauren by the tang of ale. The wind carried him to her, and she knew exactly where the man hid. Caught red-handed, the hunter rubs his temple and owns up. He ate ale, and rotten luck that the wind blew right then. Karina stares at the main character in awe, and thanks to him she now has a new skill. He tousles her hair, grinning, and says she could act whenever she wants and that her nose is keen. Only graduation remains. The hunter says the north is clear and urges the heroes to move on. He skids to a halt, not sensing a monster or animal, but struck by a brutal, overwhelming surge of magic. He snaps his head up, spots Karun tangled in the foliage, and gapes at the girl in stunned disbelief. It feels unreal. Where else could the sorceress have come from? She flushes, mortified at being spotted so quickly, and admits the main character was right. She'd scrambled to hide, but her cover collapsed the moment they found her. He blurts in shock, "Why is Karun here?" And Karina and Lauren turn from the main character to the stranger, eyes wide, no clue who stands before them now. Karun and Aldo sauntered down the village's charming streets. Delight exploded in Karun's chest as she paused to admire the neatly stacked houses, and Aldo, a step behind, watched her light up with a quiet, knowing smile. They plunged deeper into an alley erupting with magnificent blooms. Kirune turns to Aldo, eyes shining, and confesses she finally understands why he settled in this picturesque corner. And Aldo nods, approval warming his smile. They arrive at a modest, cozy house. The girl stares and asks, "Is this the hero's home?" And the guy simply replies, "It is." Off to the side, Flora froze, eyes wide with surprise as dark thoughts clawed at her, and the air itself felt wrong. Suddenly, Aisha cut the walk with an indignant roar, without hesitation telling Aldo that Karina had announced his former lover's arrival. Flora flinched as tension coiled around her, and Aldo bristled, more agitated than ever, embarrassed but buzzing with a strange thrill. Karun threw up a hand at the baffled men, flashed a grin, gave her name, and announced she used to be in Aldo's old adventuring squad to pull attention away from the rising tension. The sorceress leans forward and asks if she can learn the names of everyone standing here. Toke inhales, introduces himself, and says he repairs furniture for a living. Aisha beams, presses a hand to her chest, and says she helps tend her family's vineyards. Flora pins her excitement down, strides up to her husband, introduces herself, and proudly proclaims her father is the village head. A figure standing behind watches the girl with keen interest, a faint thrill stirring in him. Aisha crosses her arms over her chest, strides up to the young crowd like she owns the room, and declares that Flora left out a crucial detail. Confusion crackles between Flora and Aldo, then they lock eyes, go wide-eyed, and freeze in stunned surprise. Embarrassment flares across the main character's face as they stare at Flora. Flora's cheeks bloom red, and silence hangs heavy with awkwardness. Karun froze, breath hitching, caught between electric expectation and raw bewilderment, utterly unable to fathom what was really unfolding between the two. Finally, Aldo flashes an uncertain grin, cheeks burning as he scratches the back of his head. And in perfect sync, Flora bows her head, crimson with embarrassment, as they both blurt out that they're getting married soon. The sorceress froze, disbelief knocking the breath from her, and she mumbled on and on as pent-up emotions burst free. Toke explains that since then the hero and his girlfriend have been living in quiet, blissful peace, and Karuna replies that after the Red Bear incident their bond leapt to a whole new level, and even led to a wedding. The sorceress remembers the old days. On squad missions he sealed his mouth, stone-faced and all business. Opening up from the heart, he never did. Aisha choked out, "I can't imagine you like this." And he flashed a crooked smile, admitting, "Talks like that about me make me squirm." Flora locked eyes with him and said his aura once summoned trouble. Yet she'd always known he hid a fiercely kind heart. Karuna's brow tightened, as she wondered if Flora and Aldo had ever spoken before. The girl replies she first glimpsed him in this village 9 years ago. She was 9 then. The sorceress scowls at her friend, and he snaps that her guesses are false. The table sat perfectly set, overflowing with dishes, and everyone gathered at the meal called out wishes for a pleasant appetite. Karun snatches a spoon, plunges it into the steaming soup, lifts it and savors each bite as Aldo leans in and asks how it tastes. Grinning wildly, the sorceress gushes that tomato soup and radish stew are out of this world. Those fresh vegetables don't exist in the capital. She spins to Aldo and beams, "Isn't this life change incredible?" While the main character swears it's all thanks to his friends. Flora snatches a plate and thrusts it at the guest, boasting the meat came from a deer Aldo single-handedly took down in the forest. "It's insanely tasty, sorceress. You have to try it." The magician skewers the meat with his fork, eyes gleaming with ravenous hunger, then lifts it to his mouth and chews with slow, deliberate bites. Karun lets out a satisfied grunt, declaring the meat irresistibly tasty, tender and dripping with juice, while Flora, thrilled by the praise, urges her to eat even more. He dunks the piece into the sauce, proclaims it'll be even better with a sweet and spicy kick, then bites down and savors every mouth-watering hit. Aisha steps forward and declares that stuffing meat and sauce into a sandwich will make it even better. Karuna nods, convinced this way tastes richer. Right then, the girl, in front of everyone, sinks her teeth into a massive bite and swallows it. That was a colossal mistake. The girl gags on a huge chunk and lunges for water, only to snatch an empty, bone-dry glass. Toke thrusts a glass at the girl. She's squinting from a sore throat, but it's empty, which only makes the guy laugh harder, itching to mock me. Karuna snaps into action, promising he'll help and fetch water now. The sorceress whispers the spell, "O purest water, appear on the tip of your finger," and summons a shimmering droplet that swells and fills Aisha's glass in seconds. Finally, the girl downed the whole glass in one savage gulp and slammed it onto the table with a thunderous bang, fury crackling at Toke's joke. Lowering her brows to the bridge of her nose, the girl snarls that her friend is hopeless. But he bursts into triumphant laughter. The prank worked. Aisha hails Kirune as her savior, and the sorceress just shrugs, insisting she did nothing special. Aldo storms up to Kirune, demanding to know what happened to her teaching at the magic school and whether everything will be okay after she abruptly abandoned it all. She flushes, looks away, and begs him to leave it for later. She won't let ugly memories poison a table piled with delicious food. The main character holds up a hand. "Not now." Aisha brightens, claiming magic could draw water from the earth and make wells obsolete. Now she's wondering if she can cast it, and Flora grins, saying only those with a rare gift, like Karuna, can. The sorceress bellows that a tiny spark of magic burns in every soul. Anyone can master it, and family ties or social standing don't matter. Karun asks if the girls want him to measure their magic levels, admits it won't be exact, and they light up and shout an eager yes. The sorceress zeroes in on Aisha and tells her to stand up straight, explaining Karun's magic will probe someone else's. It may be a little uncomfortable, but she must be patient. Light blooms around the girl and she gasps in surprise. Flora stands frozen, panic in her eyes, as Karun snaps at the girl to hold perfectly still. Aisha trembles, an eerie pressure crawling inside her, and the sorceress lays a cool hand on her shoulder and closes her eyes. The calculus process washes over the girl like a rush of warmth. She crumples to her knees, trembling and murmuring, and Flora screams, eyes blown wide. She slaps a hand over Aldo's eyes, pleads, "Don't look," and gives no explanation. The sorceress delivers her verdict. Aisha's magic is barely a flicker. Practice might coax it upward, but only slightly. Next up is Flora, who shrinks in fear yet forces herself to step forward. Flora trembles, pleading with everyone at the table not to look at the girl. If she even resembles Aisha, the room will snap into unbearable awkwardness. Aisha freezes, cheeks flaming as the remark makes her sound obscene. Karun rushes in, insisting there's nothing shameful and it's not nearly that serious. Aisha snaps the protagonist's eyes shut. He, in turn, refuses to meet his best friend's gaze, who erupts in outraged confusion at being denied a look. Aisha says Karun's touch made her body react on its own, and now Flora's hit by the same impulse. She clenches her fists, lets out a sharp grunt, and snaps her legs shut in restless impatience. Flora's unbridled moan rips through the room from the manipulations performed on her during the magic assessment, and her cheeks blaze crimson. The sorceress slammed a hand over the girl's mouth, hissing for her to stop those strange noises. The guys in the room gaped, frozen and mute, and Aisha chuckled, leaning in to ask the main character, "Wanna watch?" Two voices explode at once, the guy and Toke, while Aldo drives his hands harder into his friend's face, roaring, "Impossible!" The young man's eyes snap open and he stares straight at his beloved. He watched Sora purse her lips and close her eyes as the sorceress's hand rested on her shoulder, his mouth falling open in hungry awe until his girlfriend barked, "This is enough," and snuffed the thrill. Karun announced the results with a triumphant smile. Flora can wield combat magic. Her mana reserves are massive, and Flora, like everyone else in the room, stood stunned. Disbelief and surprise plastered across their faces. His beloved bolts into his arms, breathless and saying she might, maybe, be able to use magic. And Aldo explodes with stunned, overflowing joy at the surprise. The sorceress smirks and declares she'll train the hero's girl in aerial magic. She'll be her teacher for now. And a sudden jolt hits the guy. His girlfriend doesn't mind magic. Flora bats her puppy eyes and blurts that if she learns to wield air magic, she can blast her lush, beautiful curls dry in a heartbeat. He bursts out laughing and pats his beloved on the head, totally her thing, while Tote's brow knots in confusion and he sputters, "Isn't this combat magic? Can it really be used in everyday life at all?" The magician locks onto the hugging couple, a startling smile spreading across his face as every scrap of jealousy and anger evaporates. Her mind reels at this 9-year devotion. How did Flora cling to Aldo for 9 long years, never turn to someone else? Why are they together now? Shame claws at Karun. Before she reached the village, she used to picture herself as the main character's bride. She clamps trembling hands to her cheeks, desperate to banish those past daydreams. She clears her throat and turns to Aldo, joy exploding across her face. Thrilled her former companion found a good man, she beams wedding congratulations and, smiling, wishes them happiness. The old friend's blessing landed like warm sunlight. Flora, and although beamed, thanking them with bright, grateful smiles for their kind words and wishes. He refuses to move on or test his magic. He lets out a raw scream that rips through the house and spills into the street. Contests and sweet-making filled the scene. She toted a basket overflowing with eggs as a horde of long-feathered chickens swarmed her, and she gasped, "Are we going to cook sweets together?" 2 girls on the sidelines echoed that it was true. In their village, a strict tradition says any bride who weds during the harvest festival must personally prepare treats for everyone. And today a training session has been summoned before the holiday. Confusion slammed Soku. She trembled so hard the eggs in her basket jumped. Then she blurted that Karun would be joining them, and, surprised, she asked herself again. The 3 girls charged up to the house, flung the doors wide and told Flora they'd come. And a voice from inside thundered a loud thank you for their help. 2 girls and 2 guys crowded the room. When the girls saw Karun walk in, they gasped. She replied with a clipped, "Yes," and someone nearby instantly noticed she wasn't very happy. Karun muttered that Aldo had told her to hold her tongue and avoid causing anyone trouble, and she could still see herself barreling toward the group, yelling that Aldo's ex-girlfriend had shown up. Karuna murmured, understanding, and owned up. That was me. The girl next to me sighed and declared, guys don't understand humor. Karina dropped into a deep bow, her apology small and humble over what had happened. Kurume sighed with a gentle smile and assured her she wasn't worried. Heat flooded Karina's cheeks when Karun introduced herself. Karina met her gaze with curious spark, offered, call me Karina, and smiled. Nice to meet you. A girl suddenly stepped up to Karuna and blurted, you're beautiful. Karuna's cheeks flared crimson as she blinked and stared back with a shy, questioning look. Karina gaped at Karuna, disbelief ripping through her as she demanded, you and Aldo, really nothing? A furious guy, arms locked across his chest, loomed over Karuna, and one of the girls squealed to Karina. She doesn't study at all. He clamped Karina's head between his hands, accused her of a crime, and demanded Karun say if she'd been to Elgis. The girl begged them to forgive Karina and admitted yes. Aisha saw her off, they got to know each other, and she received a residence permit. Someone blurted that she was staying at Aisha's too. I shot back yes, because I didn't want to burden the couple staying this week, and the two girls overheard and whipped their heads toward us. Flora, cheeks burning, grinned and jumped in to start. She's going to cook a lot today. The girl beside her flashed a grin and declared she was already fired up, and Flora clasped her palms near her face, flushed, and quickly confirmed it. A sudden certainty struck her. This wasn't her first time cooking as a wife. Heat flooded her face and she shut her eyes, utterly flushed, while the girl beside her, embarrassed, smiled at Flora and told her she was perfect for the role. The guy beside me shrugged he'd mind his own business. Someone nearby agreed and snapped, do you really need our help? Worry knotted his gut. Flora beamed and said she did. Men aren't allowed to take part. Crooney yelped in surprise. Really? And the other girl nodded. It's a whole ceremony for the bride. The guy swung toward the door and marched off. Alder snapped his head back and insisted that, if anything, they were calling them, and the girls brushed it off. We're fine. Karina shot a look at Flora and asked what they had to do. Folding her arms, Flora snapped that Aina, Karina, Karuna, and she would make the dough. Flora rang Aisha and declared she'd take charge of the baking. Aisha exhaled a sharp, displeased sigh and relented. Aina shouted to her sister behind her. Flora spun to Karina and Ina and handed them the job of mixing the ingredients. Flora shoved a bowl of eggs and a whisk into Karuna's hands and ordered her to whip them into froth. Karuna hesitated, awkwardly agreed, and asked, you mean the white? She held a whisk out awkwardly, staring at him and wondering if this was the side, then started kneading the broken eggs in the bowl as Karun's clumsy flailing sent the bowl careening sideways, splattering egg everywhere. Aisha strode nearby, logs clutched in her arms, eyes locked on the girl as she tried. Karina, panting with cheeks aflame, wrestled the pestle to grind the ingredients, and Ina stood beside her, smiling and wishing her luck as she sliced food with a knife. Flora barreled up, groceries clutched, and asked how the test was going. Karuna stood coated head to toe in the bowl's contents, the bowl shoved behind her back while Flora froze, painfully awkward. Kiruni scrubbed at Flora's grimy hair with a crumpled napkin and apologized, saying she'd thought one more try would set everything right, and Flora shook her head and told her not to worry. Karuna spun to the girl behind her, who was dabbing at the top of her head, and told Flora to listen as she demanded to know how Aldo had confessed. Flora burned scarlet while Karuna smiled, unable to picture him like that. Aisha strode by with logs cradled in her arms, flashing a cheeky grin as she shot back that Flora was the first to confess. And Flora spun to the girl with eyes blown wide and her face burning scarlet. Karuna flicked a wink and shot Flora a thumbs up, crowning her brave. Flora spluttered, I'm just... And Aisha, grinning slyly, revealed they had a special flower that symbolized recognition. Karuna shot up from her chair and screamed, in what sense? Flora burned with shame, covering her eyes and shaking her reddened hands as she begged the girls to stop. Aisha just smiled and asked if that was a bad thing. And before anyone knew it, they became a couple. Aisha shot Karuma a sly wink and promised she'd tell her later. Flora trembled, crimson with embarrassment, and screamed as she called out to Aisha. The guys clustered around the table outside snapped their heads toward the house as screams ripped through the street, and Karun watched them, a slow smile spreading across his face. Karun had pictured the capital as an entirely different world. Yet after arriving, she couldn't even bake a decent cake. Magic won't stir batter. And the girls chattered and laughed, reveling in the warm buzz of each other's company. Karun vowed she'd get back on her feet as soon as possible. Smoke curled from the house's chimney and wafted down the street. Karina clutched a cloth, drooling as she declared how delicious it smelled, and Ina behind her agreed. 2 men barreled into the house. The blonde purred, "You can't resist the smell." He spun to the girls and demanded, "Is it ready?" Aisha flinched the moment she heard them. Hands on her hips, she screamed that no guys were allowed in here. The blonde man demanded whether Mono was even in training, and Aldo stood behind him, awkwardly scratching his head. Flora grinned and said it wouldn't roar to life yet. It had to cool down a little, so she asked them to hang on for a moment. Aisha glared at the guy and snapped, "Don't spoil them. You don't even have to treat them." He barked back angrily. "What?" Flora, confused, said. "How so? They did a great job creating furniture today." Karun's jaw dropped. She stared at him in surprise and asked, "Did you make all the furniture here? The quality's incredible." Kirune beamed, letting her eyes close as she declared she wanted to order furniture from him, and he went scarlet, scratched his head, and sheepishly agreed. Karuna ran her hand over the table and declared it top-tier craftsmanship, the guy going beet red as he stood at her side and drank in every word, while Aisha and Ina hovered a few paces away, watching in silence. Ina's chest twisted as she watched Kirune and Toko click, panic rising. What to do? My sister will definitely be against such a charming girl from the capital. Color drained from her cheeks as she pressed a palm to her face. With her back to her sister, Aisha gave a soft sniff. Panic slammed into Ina, sure her sister had gone into shock. Aisha, utterly unfazed, rubbed her nose, shrugged, and murmured that she might have a cold. And Ina gasped before crumpling to the floor. Aisha shot past the others, eyes bright as she inhaled the mouth-watering scent and announced she'd go check it out. Ina, trembling on the floor, stared up at her sister while everyone else gaped in surprise. "Don't think about that now." 2 pies rested on the table, one crowned with gorgeous orange rings. Flora steadied a board carrying 2 more pies, and behind her, Karina watched the treats with a smile. The table groaned under several whole pies, some already sliced, wrapping paper and ribbons tossed about, and the living room couch lay buried beneath a jumble of bags, packages, baskets, and aprons stuffed with fabrics. Aldo sank his teeth into the pie and groaned at how delicious it was. Kirune devoured her slice with a grin, and told Flora she always cooks so tasty. Aisha smirked and said it's all for Aldo's sake, and Flora instantly blushed. Ayena leaned in and asked Flora how she felt. Flora pressed a palm to her mouth and stared dead ahead, jabbed at the pieces with a finger and said there wasn't enough sugar. You could toss in more spices, though that'd be tricky. Karun froze, stunned, murmuring, "That's how it is," even as he admitted how delicious it was. Someone shot back, "Then they need to practice more," and Aisha exploded with fury. Flora beamed, charming as ever, and vowed she'd move mountains with her cooking. He ate in silence, telling himself this would have to be their meal for now. Flora strode into the yard with Ohm at her side, scanned the greenery until she spotted the herb she wanted, declared she'd pick it, hummed a tune and smiled as she moved forward, then dropped to her knees and began gathering grass into the basket at her side. Suddenly, 5 figures with hidden faces loomed behind the girl sitting on the ground. Leaves from the trees blasted into the air. Her face drained to ghostly white as she stared down. Everyone in the house froze when Flora's shrill scream sliced through the silence. Shock ripped through Karumi and she screamed, "What kind of scream was that?" As Aldo shot past her toward the exit. He tore outside, shouting Flora's name with terror stamped on his face as the uninvited guests were already slipping away. And there she was, clinging to the shoulder of one of them. He lay limp and clearly unconscious. Aldo's eyes went wide with terror as he stared ahead. Flora dangled from someone else's shoulder, utterly unresponsive. A thunderous explosion ripped the air and Aldo and Karun slammed their hands over their faces to shield themselves. Flora's basket, ripped and battered, hurtled at the hero, bounced off the ground and toppled to the side as Karun sprinted up, shouting to Aldo, "What is that?" While Aldo himself, battered by the explosion, stared straight ahead, trembling. He lunged forward as the girl behind him shot her hand out, the basket lying abandoned on the ground, and Aldo seized her with both hands, urgently beginning to examine her. He trembled, eyes huge, clutching the thing with shaking hands. Teeth gritted, he forced his gaze forward and screamed, "Flora!" Flora had been kidnapped, and thick smoke from the explosion billowed around them. Flora pried her eyelids open, dangling upside down from her captor's shoulder. I sat up a little and stared at the man in stunned disbelief as she swiveled her head to the side, eyes blown wide. Flames devoured the trees, leaving many as charred stumps spewing black smoke, while the 5 kidnappers and men in black suits surged forward, carving a path of nothing but destruction and fire. She whipped around, terror clawing at her throat as she watched the chaos unfold. Shrees toppled, seared black by the fire. Who would kidnap Flora? On the horizon between the dense forests, a towering mountain loomed, its summit blazing with a bright, blinding glow. At the mountain's summit, Karun gripped a magic staff that blazed a bright beacon visible from afar. Eyes shut and razor-focused, she stood as a raincoat-clad figure loomed behind her and asked if she knew where Flora was now. She cried, "Yes!" Luck was on their side. Her raw, high-level magic flared, and only that surge let them pinpoint her location in an instant. She crumpled, head bowed and sorrow carved into her face. She breathed there was one thing, and he leaned in and asked what it was. The girl clutched her magic staff and blurted to Aldo that Flora was trembling with terror. Aldo ground his teeth and shut his eyes, sorrow etched across his face. Karune's eyes flashed as she told Aldo she'd battled this type before. He was a member of the Guild of the Kingdom of Abylonia. I think his name was Zoic. Aldo's jaw tightened as he concluded they were hired by the kingdom to find him, but it gnawed at him why they'd snatch Flora. The kingdom never negotiates with kidnappers. Behind them, Aisha and Toke barreled toward them, shouting, "Aldo!" Aisha's scream ripped through the air as she demanded, "What's going on? Why Flora?" The man whirled to face them, the others gaping at the hero and his clothes. Aisha trembling and screaming as she begged him not to stay silent, and Toke set a hand on her shoulder, their eyes meeting as he gave a quick side-to-side nod. Shock slammed into Aisha as she stared at him while the hero lingered on the sidelines, silent with his head bowed. She spun back to Aldo, said she understood and trusted him, then called his name, and Aldo looked straight at her. Tears glinting, she locked a confident stare on the guy and ordered him to bring Flora back. No question. Aldo said nothing, staring straight ahead, wild-eyed and ready to charge into battle. Toke snapped his fingers to the side, declared everything was ready, and ordered him to go there. The girls darted off to fetch Toke. Karuna demanded what was wrong with Aina, and Aisha said she'd sent her home so she wouldn't get in the way, leaving the hero alone on the mountain staring at the forest below as black smoke billowed up. They slammed to a stop. Flora dangled by bound wrists from a tree, a huge bonfire roaring under her feet as the five split off, fanning out around the watchman, wide-eyed and confused. The girl stared ahead as flames surged beneath her, then turned her gaze to the man perched on a log, sharpening his blade. A girl burst in from the side and snapped to Mr. Zoic that Mr. Clark had ordered only Aldred to be captured, so why bring this girl? The man never looked up. He kept grinding his blade on the whetstone. Flora heard Aldred, and her mind snapped to Aldo, worry clawing at her. The man finally smiled, and revealed it was a decoy set to lure out an A-rank adventurer. His words snapped Flora's eyes open, her mind racing over the A-rank adventurer. The girl at his side screamed, "Do you mean to kill him? That's royal treason!" And Flora stood frozen, watching them in stunned disbelief. With the face of a madman, Zoke stares into the fire and snarls that surviving is all that matters. Magic will help him do whatever he wants. Flora trembled, staring ahead in raw terror. The XOX partners flinched at the chaos. The girl dropped her eyes, tears gathering as panic clenched her. She had no idea what to do while they plotted to kill Aldo. She didn't even notice Zoak slide up beside her before the man glared down, fury burning in his eyes, and pressed his sword against her. Zoak grinned, drove his sword to the quivering, terrified Flora's throat and snarled that it should stop worrying about the beloved. "Wouldn't it be better to think about yourself first?" he snapped, pressing the sword to her throat so close her chin tipped back and she trembled harder, and she shut her eyes as tears slipped free. The man bellowed they had big plans for her. She was Aldred's bait. The girl screamed, terror ripping from her throat, while a Zoic supporter watched from behind, his hand clenched on his sword. Something tore into the guy's chest and he toppled backward. The mage girl gaped in shock. Zoat's grin widened, and a razor-tipped arrow screamed toward them at breakneck speed. A storm of arrows tore into Zoax's companions. The magician girl conjured a shimmering barrier to save herself, but the hooded man at her side had an arrow drive clean through his chest. Arrows screamed down, one battering into the chest of the adventurer who'd come with Zoic. Zoic ripped his blade from Flora's throat and slammed his hand over his head as an arrow snapped cleanly in two against his palm. The man pulled back, gripped his sword and lifted his head, flung his bow aside as a shadow swooped at him with a blade thrust from above, and enraged Aldo launched into the air. Zillick, despite the threat, grinned maliciously. Hands clamped on the blade before his face, the adventurer froze. The impact detonated a massive blast, and a gale born from the men's collision whipped Flora's hair into wild tangles, forcing her to slam her eyes shut. As the smoke rolled away, two warriors slammed blades together. the hero's voice snapping with rage as he demanded why, and Zoak sneered that he'd done it to win another chance to fight him. Aldred wrenched his sword from Zoak, hoisted it to strike, and roared that the Flora had nothing to do with it. Zoak grinned and vowed that if Aldred wanted her back, it would be over his dead body. Flora moaned, hanging from the tree, when a mage girl sprang from the bushes beside her, clutching a staff. Teeth clenched, she wove a spell and black, slime-like goo oozed from the staff. Flora caught sight of it. Her worried eyes snapped wide as she looked toward her, and the mage's projectile screamed past her, hurtling off in the opposite direction. She snapped her head that way as a black, oily mass crept toward Aldo, lunging for his back while he battled Zohak. Flora screamed at Aldo, warning him about what lurked behind her. Teeth gritted. Aldo snapped his head back to see a swelling, light-blazing mass nearby, burning itself out and ready to detonate. A deafening blast ripped the sky, smoke swallowing the scene until the explosion was a blind roar. What happened to Aldo after that attack? A huge, transparent dome suddenly formed around the blast. Flora hung tied to the tree, wreathed in smoke and rising dust, her scream tearing out as her eyes stayed clenched shut. Smoke snarled into a vortex at the very epicenter, and as it cleared, a colossal magic circle erupted, shielding the two figures behind it. Flora's eyes snapped open and she screamed, "Karun!" A girl with a magic staff guarded his back, even as he stood with his back turned to her. Magic circles ringed the couple like an unbreakable cage, while Zoak pressed himself against the stones, watching from the shadows. The man's thoughts churned over the woman as he peered out from behind the rock at the hero and the girl. Zoak yelled to the mage girl from his team, and she flinched as he tossed Karun into her care, her teeth clenched with raw nerves while Zoak streaked past her up ahead. He tore through the trees when a hero slammed out of the undergrowth at his flank, blade whipping toward him, and Zilak grinned like he'd been waiting for it. 3 razor blades erupted from the man's palms and flew at the hero. Aldo threw up a hand to shield his face and the blades bit into his palm. The two men hurtled at each other, weapons raised, while the Zoaka mage blasted a surging stream of magic from her staff Karune and conjured a protective circle that effortlessly deflected her opponent's blow. The magician froze, panic tightening her chest. She knew she wasn't Karuna's match. The girl closed her eyes, thrust her staff forward and whispered, and with the staff raised she conjured dozens of magic circles that hung in the air. Blinding lights ignited at the heart of every circle, and colossal beams thundered toward the magician as Kirune leveled her staff at her. The hooded girl conjured a crackling ward to block the blow, clamped a hand over her face against the choking smoke, then whipped her staff toward Karuna, and only then realized it was broken. Karune grinned, bathing in the glow of the magic circles around her. Zoaka's mage ground her teeth, certain the gap in their strength was too great. A cloth hid the girl's face, but her confusion still showed in her eyes. Alda unleashed a flurry at Zoak, but he slipped through every blow with a grin and called out, "This is great!" Then turned to the hero and snapped, "Is she, Flora, really that important to you?" He slammed to a halt with his back to Flora, thrust his sword to the side to shield the girl behind him, and with a beastly snarl told the adventurer no one would dare touch her. His hand clenched the sword's hilt and erupted in sparks. Zoak stared at her, stunned, as crackling, lightning-white magic coiled around the blade. The hero's body erupted in glittering light as his sword, stretched again and again by raw magic, shot out into a blazing stream of radiance. Zoak gaped, confused. Aldo slammed his sword into the ground and vowed he'd protect her. The adventurer snapped his head up, stayed rooted, eyes locked on the blinding light overhead as a monstrous impact detonated and tore outward in a deadly straight line across the vast landscape. Amazement froze on Zoax's face as he stood motionless, watching whatever was charging toward him. Kudume and the magician Zoaka gaped beside him, mouths wide open. A colossal explosion then tore through, sweeping everything in its path. Aldo's strike splintered the trees into charred stumps. Columns of black smoke blasted skyward toward him, and where the hero's blow hit the earth, it carved a long moat with Zoak kneeling inside it. He gaped at the ground, stunned. He snapped his head up and turned away with his teeth clenched. The impact smashed the mountain behind them in two, carving a scorched, deep pit straight through its middle. Zoak froze atop the newly formed cliff, watching the chaos behind him as the hero strode in. He spun around, heart pounding, and felt gut-freezing horror. This was A-rank power as the hero glared down. Ashes burst from the charred mail and blackened plants, whipping through the air. Aldo flicked out a small blade and sliced the ropes from Flora's arms. The freed girl sobbed, clinging to the hero and screaming for Aldo, while a worried guy, sorrow written on his face, gripped Flora by the shoulders and called her name. The hero's apology tore from him over what had happened. She shot back at once, brushing it off and declaring she trusted he'd save her. Karun beside them exhaled, a faint smile curving his lips. The couple squeezed hands while a man asked Flora, "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "I'm fine." The three of them spun and peered over the cliff they stood on, and Aldo wrapped his arms around Flora as she clung to him. From below, the last magician and Zoic bolted, clawing as much distance as they could. Karun crowed they'd escaped, but the hero snapped to the girl that wasn't true. He ordered them to rush a message to the king. Karun locked eyes and demanded if he really meant to parley with the king. He barked that he would, swearing he'd make sure it never happened again. Aisha, tears streaming, barreled toward them with a frantic toque on her heels as she screamed, "Flora!" Flora spun around, shouting Aisha's name as they collided into a tight hug, Aisha trembling with relief and repeating how glad she wasn't hurt. Tears glinting in her eyes while Flora smiled and murmured an apology for making me worry, and Toke lingered behind, sighing with a soft smile. Aisha scowled at Aldo, who stood by Karun watching from the sidelines. She clamped her hands on her friend's shoulders, leveled a knife-sharp glare at the couple and demanded they explain what had happened, then called out to Aldo. Taka looked at the angry girl, confused. The hero snarled they were thugs from the kingdom of Abylonia who'd come for him. Toka yelped, eyes wide, repeating, "Abylonia," in disbelief they'd come so far. Aisha crossed her arms and snapped, "Why did you attack?" The hero froze, staring at Flora standing before him. She kept her gaze lowered, and the guy finally spat the truth. They'd come to kill the A-rank adventurer Aldred. That's his real name. Aisha gaped and blurted, "Alda's really an A-rank adventurer?" Talk collapsed into a stupor beside her, echoing the same stunned question. They pressed on whether Karuna was A-rank too, and the girl snapped back a quick, confident yes. Aldo barked that Zoak, the man who kidnapped Flora, had come here with one purpose: haul him back to the kingdom. Aisha's face darkened, her eyes swallowed by her bangs, rage crackling as she snapped, "Did you kidnap Flora to lure him out?" The hero spat that he thought they were using her as bait. Aisha's fist tightened. She rocketed at him and smashed her fist into his chin while the others gaped in shock. She yanked him by the breasts and bellowed that because Flora was kind she wouldn't hit him. This is for him, not for her. An A-rank adventurer who killed a dragon, right? Yet he failed to protect his beloved. Karun collapsed into tears, frantically rubbing them away with her hands as she wailed that everything was wrong and it was her fault. If she hadn't come to North End, none of this would have happened. The hero dropped his head, voice cracking as he said, "No, it's not your fault. I'm the one to blame for everything." Talk scratched his head, baffled, and shot back. "Is there any benefit to returning a former A-rank adventurer?" Tears in her voice, Kurume declared that adventurers of this caliber command the people's praise and sway the halls of government, and a powerful patron trailed Aldo to present him to the king, winning trust and authority. Aisha snapped that Aldo wasn't some kind of thing. Talk shot her a skeptical look, grinned, and asked if people like that even existed, then turned to the others and demanded who it could be. The hero declared it was Earl Clark Raymond, the most influential and powerful of them all. Aisha folded her arms over her chest and asked if that meant they could come here again. The hero snarled that he'd already sent a message to open negotiations, but if they tried that stunt again then, he told her to worry about it, vowed he'd handle it and wouldn't be going back. Flora stood with her arms folded behind her, silent and staring at the ground as the wind whipped her dress and hair. A little later, at Flora and Aldo's house, the girl stood right behind the hero and admitted that when he came for her, it felt like he'd materialized out of thin air. She demanded to know how he'd done it. He grinned, explaining Toe had built a catapult and Karun had drenched it in magic. The girl whooped that it was awesome, then froze when she spotted a wound on the guy's arm and shouted, "You're bleeding!" He stared at the torn skin, stunned. Once his arm was finally swathed in bandages, envy laced Flora's voice, as she confessed she wished she could heal like Karun, and he gave a quick, grateful thanks for the dressing. Silence swallowed them on the bed. She stared at her hands in her lap as he absently traced the fresh wound on his hand. Then she shattered the hush and demanded, "Why didn't you tell me you were an adventurer?" He dropped his gaze, guilt and frustration twisting his voice, as he confessed that during his adventuring days he'd carried out numerous missions, slaying monsters, hunting down bandits, and even served as a knight in war, where he killed people. He burned to start a new life and bury those memories, terrified she'd hate him if she ever found out. So he hunched forward with his head bowed. She admitted she was terrified of losing him, and his eyes flew wide at her confession. She bent forward, and he turned, laid a steady hand on her shoulder, soothed her with her name, and breathed an apology. She said today everything finally fell into place. She turned to him, tears shimmering in her eyes, and confessed he was her first love. Her wish for him to return alive and unharmed had come true, and she burned to pour her grief and joy into him, to learn everything about him, and vowed she'd never hate him. At the sound of her fishing, Aldo's face flamed crimson. She begged him to let her be with him. He, tears streaming, lunged into her arms, called her name, and they clung together, weeping. He clutched her to his chest and vowed he'd protect her, and the whole village, no matter what. They locked eyes, each cupping the other's cheek as sobs shook them. While a gust of wind whipped the street flowers into a frantic scatter, the lovers sat on the bed, locked in each other's arms, and kissed. By the door, the hero and Flora stood, his fists coiled with tension, his gaze faltering ahead, and Flora slid her palm to rest on her lover's tense hand. Mortified, he shuddered with surprise and his cheeks flamed. The couple locked eyes, hands entwined. Flora smiled at him while he, hesitant, lifted his hand to the door to knock. A girl stood beside me, clutching a basket. A little later, 4 people sat in suffocating silence around the table. The hero's head bowed taut, refusing to meet Flora's parents' eyes. The truth slammed into Flora's father. Aldo was an A-rank adventurer, and he met that news with an eerie, controlled calm. Guilt twisted his face as he choked out an apology for staying silent so long, then apologized again, insisting that if he hadn't become an A-rank adventurer, Flora would never have been hurt. The man kept his gaze locked on the bowed figure, silent. The woman beside him fidgeted with worry. Flora dropped her head into mute stillness, and the father stared at his daughter, then lowered his eyes and sank into thought. Finally, the man told the hero why he'd kept silent. There had to be a reason. And when Flora's father snapped for Aldo to raise his head, Aldo, guilt burning in his chest, locked eyes with the man before him. The man's face split into a stunned grin as he told the guy, "Thanks to you and your skills, Flora's been saved 3 times already." The man didn't judge the lone adventurer. Bent under that load, he doubted whether coming here alone was wise. Unprepared, he was swept into a maelstrom of events, and in moments like this, his thoughts drifted to the flower field up north, leaving him glad he'd come. He confessed the incident had terrified him, but Flora, he, and every villager swore he'd done nothing wrong. His words cracked Aldo open, tears welling in his eyes. Flora's mother flashed a knowing smile and winked, declaring it true. They're family, so he simply must trust them more. The man smiled, brushed tears from his eyes, nodded, and thanked them. Flora locked eyes with the hero and smiled, her cheeks flushing and tears of joy welling up just like the guy's, while her mother gushed that their Flora was marrying an A-rank adventurer. How honorable. The man threw back his head and laughed, admitting that if he'd known the whole truth from the start, he couldn't have spoken to him as an equal. Aldo flushed and fumbled, asking to speak with him as he always had. Flora clenched her fists and snapped, indignant, as she remembered how hard things had been for Aldo. The girl's mother sidled up to her husband, grinning with satisfied glee as she told the man that he would look. She was already talking like a real adventurer's wife. He urged her to keep it up, and the girl flushed bright red. Flora's face flamed scarlet as she screamed for Mom and Dad to stop, tearful Aldo smiling at her through wet eyes when a woman called out, asking how the preparations for the holiday were going, and the girl shuddered. The woman gasped, admitting the final result was still far off and a mountain of work remained. "That's how it was," she said. The girl laid the parcels on the table, smiling because today she'd brought sweets and urged them to try one. Someone pressed a package of desserts into the man's hands, teasing that he eats them every day. He flashed a smile and said he already had the same thing. Then the girl invited everyone to drink tea while her mother clapped her hands happily. A vast field of vines bowed under ripe grapes as Ina passed with a basket brimming with ripe berries. She snapped her head toward the voices when someone taunted Karun. "Going to wander around with that sour face for much longer?" She crouched behind a bush and watched the 3 at the table as Karun blurted an apology, admitting the whole mess sprang from her thoughtless act. Aisha soothed her, saying it was fine. Yet an excited Karun still fretted over their friendship with Aldo. Toke's smile steadied her as understanding clicked into place. He insisted she had nothing to fear. She hadn't struck him out of hatred. Aina slapped a hand over her mouth, stunned when she heard about the blow. Aisha leveled a skeptical stare at the guy, sighed, and asked if he'd decided to flip into best friend mode. Even Korn felt the sting. She motioned for them to end the conversation, and just as she moved to protest, Toke's hand lunged toward the girl. He planted his hand on the crown of her head, smiling as he told her not to worry. Karun flinched and blushed, her mouth and eyes flying wide in surprise and embarrassment. Ina froze to the side, eyes wide and questioning. Aisha's expression flared with anger. He raked a hand through his hair, pinched the insect between his fingers and explained it was a fly. Karuna watched him, cheeks flushing crimson. Aisha slumped at the table, face hidden, and the couple snapped toward the side where Aina lay. Tok blurted, "What's that?" and Karun stared. Aina was stunned too. The girl burst into laughter. Tok hauled Diana to her feet, spun toward the sound and asked, "What's so funny?" Aisha glanced at Kirune, cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Burying her mouth in her fist, Aisha cleared her throat and forced an awkward grin, saying that if you really think about it. Flora was insanely lucky. She'd married an A-rank adventurer, and then asked where she could find someone like that, while Tok stared at her, puzzled. Karun shot the girl a questioning look and blurted that Aisha was getting married too. When she spelled it out, the couple went pale, Aisha choked, and the man's face drained corpse white. Bodies trembled and scowls twisted their faces as Aisha kept grilling her. A guy clutching his head demanded why he could hear bells, and Aina beside me was moved, convinced Kirune was doing well. He shot back a denial and fired a question in the same breath, then fixed Aisha with a stare and declared Karina was better. Aina collapsed at the words while Aisha's face flamed with anger. Staring at the body, she screamed that he'd said it. The girl spun on Tok and demanded, "Are you really one of those?" Someone called out, "Aina, are you okay?" Tok shouted to Karuna, begging for help. A little later, at Flora and Aldo's house, the guy turned to me and thanked me for today. He'd finally found the guts to speak from the heart and swore it was all thanks to her. She just denied it with a smile. A guy with a band-aid on his arm lifted a glass and took a sip of water. The girl zeroed in on him, asked the hero how his wound was. He said everything was fine, and she asked if that was accurate, then told me to let her see. She zeroed in on his hand, tracing the skin with careful fingers, then pushed her touch deeper. He shook and burst into laughter, shouting that he was ticklish, and she shot back that she had to check every inch. Light erupted from her hair. He sniffed and snapped his eyes to the glow. She clutched his hand, trembling. She suddenly burst into tears. The guy sprang from his chair, dropped to the floor beside her, thrust his hands out, and, voice crackling with excitement, asked, "What happened?" Flora sobbed, stammering apologies for bursting in so suddenly. He cupped her face, his hands trembling in confusion, wordless. She confessed that each time she touches him it jolts her with the truth. They're alive. Sorrow carved into his face. He called to Flora, eyes locked on her as a cold question burned inside him. Was she really that scared? Still seated on the floor, he crushed her to his chest and swore he'd never give her cause to fear. Neither for him nor for her life again, and they stayed there, clinging to each other. Sheltered her whole life, Flora can finally stand beside the one she loves, the very man who saved her, and for his sake she might at last prove useful, vowing from now on to be his unbreakable support. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the house and walked forward, grinning at each other, then perched on a high cliff and stared down at the spread of buildings and the tide of people busy below. He stared ahead with a peaceful smile as the wind whipped his hair and sent leaves swirling, and he beamed that it felt like a dream while Flora beside him smiled back. She turned to him, gripping his hand, and declared it wasn't a dream. He swiveled, looked at her tenderly, vowed she'd be his wife, joy flooding him, and she flushed as she met his eyes. She clung to his hand, a contented smile settling as her eyes drifted shut. When she opened them and fixed her gaze ahead, she murmured that it truly looked like a dream. He stroked her head, closed his eyes, and kept smiling at her words. It felt like a wonderful dream for the two of them. She vowed she'd start practicing for the festival the instant she got home. "I need to run to Aisha's for raisins. Raisins are great." Karina, bow clutched in her hands, sprinted through the trees surrounding her toward a massive, towering cliff whose crevices were packed with trees. Her foot snagged on something hiding in the grass. She screamed, pitched face first with arms stabbing out, and Karina tumbled into the pit. She hit her knees, head bowed as a raw groan tore out of her. Then she snapped her head up in shock, Karina dazedly staring at the towering cliff she'd plunged from into a yawning pit. The drop had been brutally high. A colossal monster slammed into existence beside her and barreled straight at her. She snapped sideways like lightning. Her mouth and eyes snapped open in fright as she glanced sideways. A massive boar-like monster stood there, steam pouring from its nostrils with every exhale. The boar pounded the ground with its hooves like a war drum. The girl curled in a pile of leaves, hands clamped over her head, trembling and frozen. When nothing happened, she forced her hands away and stared ahead. Fear plastered across her face. Cabana froze, eyes locked ahead as a blinding glow erupted from the cliff directly above the girl. The monster with an arrow lodged in its forehead tilted its head in puzzlement. The light was a storm of arrows that screamed past Karina and hurtled for the boar. A hail of arrows from many of them struck the beast squarely. Riddled with wounds, it collapsed onto its side, dead, while Karina, tears streaking down her cheeks, looked up as two shadows fell to either side of her. Two men loomed at the cliff's top as Karina's voice ripped across the wind, screaming for the master and Mr. Aldred. And both men panted, eyes fixed downward with worry etched into their faces. Aldo knelt and cinched a bandage around Karina's ankle as she sat on the ground, while Fiona's father stood at the sidelines, watching in dead silence. He clutched his head, squeezed his eyes shut, and, voice breaking, begged, "I should have looked after her. Please forgive me." As Aldo turned his head toward him and stared at the man. Guilt clawed at her. She dropped her gaze, eyes wide and round, and he watched her. He demanded whether she had any idea how dangerous it was and why she'd plunged so deep into the forest, alone. She guiltily bowed her head to his reproaches. Still sitting on the ground, she averted her gaze and started insisting she could snare prey with the contraption she'd just bought, her fingers toying with a broken stick tied with rope. They slammed her with the question of why she'd bought it. She went mute, unable to find an answer. Then the man cut in. "When did you buy it?" And she muttered, "This morning before the trip." Aldo gaped at the man, baffled, while the man shrank back, eyes wide with terror. He asked why she had looked away and pressed about the morning. The girl said she'd been watching them with Aldred's tracking technique. The man whirled to a trembling Aldo, and both went ghost white as they stared at Karina standing there, their thoughts snapping to the child. The girl's father sighed. He snapped, "Didn't she know hunting wasn't a solo job? Buying anything from strangers is a dangerous gamble. Who knows what they'd slip her?" The girl dropped her head in confusion. The man barked that it didn't matter what was at stake. Aldo believes she assumed she could pick him off from afar with an arrow. She'd been warned, get close to winded demons and they snap into savage, bloody violence, just like the boar that lunged at her. Even with her skill, landing an arrow on them was brutally hard. The boar she was fighting sidestepped every shot, and the traps were useless. Aldo warned her. Some demons strike from afar. Never forget that beasts and fiends will barrel at her, hurling themselves recklessly to force her out of the way. The fight erupted into a savage melee. The demon charged. She hurtled forward, head bowed as she admitted it had happened to her then. Courage gone, she bolted from the battlefield like a coward to save her life. Hidden ropes snared her foot. She stumbled and tumbled off the cliff, dragging him with her, flashed back to hurtling into the pit with the boar, and watched the men exchange baffled glances before forcing awkward smiles at Karina's father. He pressed his eyes shut and asked if she understood what he was saying. She must exercise extreme caution whenever she buys anything. If he leaves his purchases unattended, an accident could happen. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, guilt burning in front of both of them. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head, looked at the child, laid a hand on her crown and said he was just glad she was okay. Visibly shaken, Karina choked out a trembling, "I'm sorry," and apologized for being so stupid. Not long after, the men hunched in the forest, stuffing the last of their gear into bags, while Karina sat on the sidelines, watching in silence, and Aldo brushed past her, saying, "Everything's fine." Aldo confessed to Karina he'd been young and inexperienced, and once failed to catch a demon. As a boy, he'd wanted to slay a monster, but it wasn't that simple, and in his homeland, he was revered as a sacred beast. Desire devoured him, and he lunged at Aldo. When the villagers learned he'd been hunting him, they dragged him out, tied him to a tree with torches poised to light the stake. Only his companion's desperate pleas tore him from the flames. Karina's smile sharpened as she pointed out he'd known failure too. He nodded, confessing he'd made plenty of mistakes. He declared that learning from your mistakes was everything. The girl agreed, and the man swiveled his head their way, grinning as he listened and held his tongue. He snapped his head away again and exhaled as calm settled over him, then strode up to Karina and Aldo and vowed to teach her how to hunt monsters. They'll have to start cooking before the harvest festival. Ask Aldo about cooking. Hunters descend on the harvest festival, honoring a time-worn tradition by cooking only with ingredients they've hunted and gathered with their own hands. He knew Lauren could cook, but the man insisted cooking was one of those skills every hunter had to master. Aldo leaned in and asked what they had. The girl dropped her eyes and told me a pot was simmering with wild boar meat and mushrooms cooked with rice were in high demand. Roast beef and venison flank a steaming stew of rabbit, while hearty gut dishes crank every round of drinks up a notch. They roasted whole hares over an open fire until they crackled, surprisingly packed with nutrition, but the girl sniffed and said the smell was, of course, awful. Aldred urged, "If that's the case, use the herb sand soup. It'll strip their smell right off." and the girl admitted she didn't know that. One day her master's wife served her a plate she'd prepared. Snow rabbit meat glazed with jam that tasted incredible, and the man snapped it wasn't a hunter's dish. The guy leaned in and asked about the jam. He couldn't even picture the flavor. The man scratched his head and declared it far too sweet. It's a northern specialty. Karina beamed and confessed she adored him. The girl glowed, pleased as she remembered him. A flash hit him. They sometimes dry meat. When Karina said monster meat could be turned into an unusual dish, she got it and threw herself into today's effort, and the guy smiled. The men snapped their gazes to the girl, who again stood with her head bowed, clearly upset. She'd always written off her mentor as an irritating pest, his endless pleading wearing on her, but today his words hit hard. The man stepped forward and pressed her about that relentless importunity. She swore she'd try her hardest and begged me not to leave her. Lauren couldn't tell if she was apologizing or trying to offend. Karina spun to Aldo and called his name, thanking him for always watching her back and apologizing for the trouble she'd caused. Aldo waved it off, saying the only thing that mattered was that she was okay. She grinned and admitted she'd actually caught it herself, reached back, snatched her bag with both hands and thrust it at the guy. "Hold this, it's my wedding gift." He stared at the bag, mortification burning through him as he grasped it in his hands. Lauren's eyes went wide and she blurted, "So that's it," while the girl, baffled, shut her eyes, her cheeks flushing as she bowed her head. Lauren and Aldo gaped at the bag's contents, smiles cracking as they blurted, "Is that a turkey?" They cheered Karina for doing great. Aldred beamed, declared he was overjoyed and thanked her, said Flora will be happy too, and the girl looked at him with admiring eyes. She beamed, drinking in his praise and grateful he cherished the gift she'd given. Lauren declared she had a charby, saying finding a turkey in the woods near Norland wasn't easy, and Aldo fixed his gaze on the man. He dove down, shouting, "Karina!" and she looked at him. He crouched, reached his hands back and urged her to climb in, and she stared at him, stunned. He grinned as he watched them, but Lauren whipped his head back, saying she could barely walk. The girl stared at him with wide eyes. Karina declared she wanted Aldo to carry her, and Lauren froze, stunned by the request. Aldo crouched, hoisted the girl onto his back, and pushed forward as she laughed with bliss and confusion furrowed his brow. Behind them Lauren Lote loomed, menace radiating and fury etched across her face. Karina rang Aldo and pressed him to listen, daring him to catch a red bear. Do it, she vowed, and the holiday's main dish would be hers. She'd make jam. Lauren loomed behind Karina, shouting. You'd think she'd be ashamed, but Karina just smirked, clearly amused and utterly unashamed. What a little menace! Lauren bristled with annoyance. Karina exploded into laughter, declared it had begun, jabbed a finger forward and told Aldo to go. He shot her a questioning look. Obeying the girl's command, Aldred bolted forward to the girl's cheers, and Lauren, racing up from behind, burst into a run, shouting that they mustn't dare leave someone older than them. Aldo, Flora, Ayesha, and Toke stood gaping at the two-story house. Ayesha craned up and blurted, "Is it too big?" It dwarfed even the magic room. Karuna waited at the entrance, beckoning them in with a flourish and a bright welcome, then revealed why. Aristocrats once called this palace home. She rubbed her head, cheeks flushing, thanked them for pitching in to clean up, and they all warned her that trying to keep the palace spotless by herself would be a losing battle. Flora thrust the simple bundle into bewildered Karuna's hands, declaring it a moving gift, and insisting she hold it. Karuna thanked her, but they'd come to help anyway, so the present felt unnecessary. Flora flashed a grin and jabbed at the basket and the hands Aldo offered, then declared they'd brought bento too and everyone would eat together. Kiruni slid aside and waved them through. The four poured after her into the house's yawning depths, mouths dropping open as they drank in the grand interior, then came to a halt before the long staircase in the corridor. Flora gasped, calling it massive and snapping, "How many rooms are there?" Aisha's eyes popped as she gushed, "He's so cool." Talk, utterly confused, asked if they'd have to clean it all up. The moment he finished, everyone except Flora watched their admiration for his grasp of the colossal task drain away, and Karuna roared at the guys not to lose heart. They hadn't even started yet. Karuna's eyes lit up as she declared the mansion has a huge bathroom, asked if she could wash up there, and announced that's how she'll thank them today. Aldo sprang upright, stammering about the bathroom. He remembers hunting for a place to live when all he wanted was to take a bath. And Aisha shuddered, staring at him. She shrieked she wanted to swim. Karina grinned contentedly, promised they'd have a blast after cleaning and urged them to start now. Aisha tossed a well at Toke, and the guy, tying a handkerchief on his head, looked at her. She grinned and declared the headscarf made him look incredible, then teased, Want to be a janitor? He smiled and confessed, well, yes. And the scarf utterly betrayed her. She looked like a grandmother tending her garden. Toke and Aisha crossed their mops behind them and glared at each other, annoyance crackling between them, while Stretch lounged beside them, utterly indifferent. Aldred swung his gaze forward and caught Flora with her back to him, snapping her long hair into a ponytail. Hairband pinched between her lips as her fingers smoothed and gathered the strands. Then she tied a headscarf over her head. Embarrassment crashed over him, his whole face burning with a thick blush. Flora turned to him, smiling, and asked, "What is it?" He exhaled a shower of hearts, eyes glued to his beloved as he swooned over her cute hairstyle. Behind him, Karun's tail started thumping and she called out, "If I tie my hair in a ponytail, will you find me cute too?" He brushed her off, strode ahead and snapped that it suited her too, launched into talk about cleaning, then marched on while Karun seethed in his wake. Aldo flung the window wide, grinning, planted his hands on the frame, and drank in a breathtaking sweep of trees and mountains stretching out before him. Flora stormed over to Aldo, slammed the brush into his hand, and gaped at the avalanche of windows. If every room's this massive, they could be here until morning, so they'd better scrub the whole place until it sparkles. Karune shot the toque beside her a sharp look, and asked that once they finished cleaning, they'd decide where to place the furniture. The guy agreed and grabbed his measuring instruments. Aisha stood in the corner, brush thrust out like a desperate flag as she cried to Karun that she couldn't reach her wand and begged for help. Karuna said yes and told her to wait a moment, and Tokaka at his side quickly offered he'd handle it. Karuna slipped into the corridor, called Aldo and asked if they had any rags. He spun to her, said they did, and told her to wait a moment. He thrust a bundle of rags at his girlfriend. Flora stared, puzzled, and demanded, "How are we supposed to wash the ceiling with these?" The guys stood in a tight circle as Aldo barked, "Watch!" And Kirune began to chant a spell that ripped her thoughts into reality, unleashing telekinesis as the rags in her hands shot into the air. Everyone except Aldo, who was probably already used to it, gaped as the rags shot up to the ceiling. Aisha watched skeptically and scoffed. What a surreal landscape it was! Rags catapulted up and clung to the palace's filthy ceiling, the fabric springing to life as it scrubbed the grime away, and Flores gasped, "They're cleaning up!" Toka fixed his gaze and barked that was how it was. If she had that convenient magic, there had been no need to call them here, and the girl spun to face him. She blinked, flustered, but eager, promising she'd gladly clean everything with magic herself. But juggling several objects still overwhelms her, so she can't deep clean some corners with magic. There are things she simply can't do with magic, someone agreed, saying there are lots of things magic just can't pull off. And Flora craned her neck, eyes shining as she gushed at the ceiling that they were so cute, like little caterpillars. Kiruni insisted he was nearly finished and urged them to keep cleaning, but the rags kept scrubbing the ceiling on their own, flinging grime away. Flora tied another handkerchief over her nose and mouth, and attacked the dusty surfaces with a brush. Dust blanketed the walls, and Aldo, swallowed by a choking cloud of it, felt his stomach flip and his head spin. Buried in dust, Toke erupted into a violent sneeze as clouds of grit shot through the open window like smoke. He clutched and kneaded his forearms, protesting he'd only worked with a broom, but his hands were already exhausted. Flora popped up behind them, clutching rags as Aldo hauled in 2 buckets of water and snapped, "We need to clean the floor now," leaving Toke blinking in disbelief. Toke rested his hands on the railing, leaned over and called down to Karun, asking if she could clean the floor herself with magic. She shot back, annoyed that she couldn't. Flora grinned and rallied them. One last push for Karun school. Down below, the clearly moved girl looked up with huge pleading eyes and cried out for Flora to look. He scrubbed the stair railing with a rag, eyes fixed ahead, then stooped and asked if she thought they needed a sign to let people know a school of magic stood here. Aisha shot a quick nod of agreement. It didn't feel like magic was being taught here at all. Karuna asked if that was really true, and the guy flipped open his notebook, sketched a design and asked what kind of sign he should make for her. He slammed a sketch from his notebook onto the table and muttered something like that. The girl's glance immediately tore it apart as awful, so he whipped up another version and held it up. Karun narrowed her eyes and asked if she was in it too, because if she was, no one would dare come near them. She waved off the sign as a later worry, turned to him and tasked him with plotting where to set the chairs and tables. "We need room for 10 people. He whipped out a different sign and snapped, "What'll you do if 20-30 people show up?" She definitely needs a sign. The irritated girl urged everyone to ignore him and keep cleaning. She listened to him. He's a fool. Silence wrapped the place as Aisha scrubbed the door. Aldo and Flora attacked the windows and scoured the floor, and Karun smiled, watching her friends help her clean the cavernous hall. Karun jabbed a finger at the empty space and told Toku they'd have to line up chairs and set out tables here for the students. Aisha swung to face the couple. Swung too. Flora and Aldo lingered on the sidelines and locked eyes. Flora grinned. They'd be needing baby chairs soon. Aldo nodded. There was even a children's room, and Aisha watched them from the side. In one room, Toke demanded more boards be hung, and Karun nodded in agreement. In the next room, Aldo insisted a baby bed had to come first, and Flora tapped his shoulder and chided him for rushing. Aisha tossed her hand aside, snapping that Flora and Ard are already a couple, so everything's fine. But these two are acting like lovers. And the girl clutched her heart, staging a melodramatic faux collapse. A sharp pinch seized her chest. Cheeks flaming, she slapped a palm over her face to hide her eyes, because every time she looked at them, her heart sank like a stone. And she stared at Toke and Karun, breathing ragged, heavy gasps. Their smiles hit her like a verdict. She knew in her bones it was a heart attack, and the girl sagged, utterly exhausted by the thought. After a long push, the palace stairs and walls gleamed and the second floor sparkled like new. They threw their hands skyward and whooped that the cleaning was finally finished. And Flora clapped her hands with pure joy. Drooling? Totally fine. Everyone was crammed in the bathroom when Aisha smacked him and told him to wait, and the annoyed girl challenged everyone to rock, paper, scissors to see who'd go first. They asked Flora if they'd clash before the first victory or calmly parley afterward. Flora shrugged, said he knew her. She wouldn't insist. And they all fell in line with her wish. Toke and Aisha shot their hands into the air and kicked off a frantic game. Whoever wins bolts to the bathroom first. Flora's eyes shone as she clenched her fists to her chest. Karun stared at the massive bathroom. Aisha laughed that you could practically swim in it, and Karune insisted they needed a proper wash here. The girls splashed water over themselves. Aisha glanced at Flora as she passed, yanked the towel off her, snapping she couldn't come here like that. And when the cloth fell away, everyone stared at the girl in stunned shock. Her hands dove in, grabbing the girl's chest as she crowed. "They're definitely bigger." Flora gasped and shouted for Aisha, who called Karune over, slapped a hand to the girl and grinned. "They're soft and huge." Flora snapped it only held her back. She wanted a body as beautiful as theirs. Karunai glared, sneering she'd trade places for those problems, and Aisha demanded she be punished for her greed. The girls exploded in the bathroom as Flora, tears stinging from humiliation, decided to strike back. The guys pressed against the door, Toke doodling in his notebook, and when noise spilled out, Aldo snapped his head toward the door. After a while, the guys burst into the bathroom and came out beaming. You shouted, "This bathroom's huge!" And he insisted he felt better the instant he stepped out. The girls sat on the floor waiting. Karun bowed and thanked the two of them for today, apologized for making them the first to use the bathroom, and Flora pressed a snack into their hands. Karun winced and apologized for having to eat on the floor. Tok shrugged and said it was fine. Then Aisha gasped that she'd had a heart attack after using the bathroom, and Tok froze, staring at her in baffled disbelief. Aldo's eyes flicked to Flora and found her hair already dry. Flora grinned, saying Karuna had dried it with her magic, and Karuna watched the couple as Flora handed over the food. Today she'd made crispy sandwiches fried on both sides. Toak and Aldo tore into their food with ravenous gusto. Someone grinned and told the girl the mustard oil spread on the bread gives it a sharp, unforgettable kick. Delicious, and I agree. It's delicious. Tok whirled to Karuna and announced he was sure her school would soar. And Karuna lit up, telling me several children were already asking about her. That seals it. Everything's fine. Karun insists magic isn't just for battle, but for everyday life. And Flora chimed in with a wild example. You can zap your hair dry with a spell. Aisha choked a cough into her fist. She'd just blasted forward toward the new Karun school. She hoisted her glass with a wide grin and screamed as her friends laughed and raised their own. Flora beamed and said to speak up if she ever needed more help. Karun stared, face reddening, and the girl lowered her head and asked to be called Flora. She announced she'd call her Karun. Flora gasped, cheeks burning and eyes wide as Aldo grinned at them, and the girl beamed, insisting Karun was thrilled. 5 friends sprawled on the floor, grinning and howling with laughter. In that electric moment, their bond ignited, and just like that, they became best friends. Karun barked to everyone, "Ready?" Then jabbed a finger at the huge, thick tree and declared its trunk would be their blackboard. Toke gaped at her, eyes wide with shock, and asked again. Behind him, someone beamed with delight, declaring this tree will also become furniture for their magic school. And she snapped, asking why they thought she had brought them to the forest. Tok stared at his friend, bewildered, and demanded what they thought he should do with him. Aldo flinched at his friend's expression. Frightened, Karun jabbed at the tree again and cried, "Can't you make furniture from it?" Tok's gaze snapped to the girl. Tok snapped to attention. They're urban after all, and barked that wood must be seasoned for years, or that tree won't make furniture. She won't allow anything to come out cracked and crooked. She shot him puppy-pleading eyes and said she thought she'd just cut down the tree. Tok blanched, met her gaze, and unnervingly wore that exact same pleading expression. He exhaled sharply, planted his hands on his hips, caved to their pressure and snapped, "Fine, do you want to cut down this tree?" He stepped forward, said he'd fetch the tools right now and asked them to wait a moment, puzzled why these city people were so eager to cut down the tree, while the two behind him threw their hands in the air and grinned with pure glee. He reforged the axe and thrust it into her hands, told her to hold it. She thanked him as she gripped the tool. Then he drew her arms back with the axe pinned behind her, and she lurched, leaning heavily under his weight, while the guys watched, mouths wide with excitement. She sighed and slammed the axe into the tree, but the trunk didn't budge and she quickly lost patience. Aldo braced her from behind, telling her she could do it. She swung the axe back, shouting that he was too heavy, and the axe slipped from her hands. The blade screamed toward the standing Tok, his eyes round. As steel whipped by his surprised face, the hero grabbed its hilt and stopped him. Tok went ghost white and froze in place while the hero, grinning like it was a joke, casually asked Karun if she was already exhausted, then laughed and said that now he was. He chuckled, eyes narrowing as he studied the tree beside him, then clenched the tool tighter and struck the target. The strike shot along the plant like lightning. A second later, the massive tree cleaved clean down the middle, splitting into two as the two behind gaped in disbelief. The girl beamed and cheered him. "You're doing great." Tok at her side shook like a leaf, muttering that one blow had snapped a 60-year-old tree, and with wild confidence, claiming that would be enough to get them aboard. The evil Tok behind him snapped, "Enough for what?" Indignant, he shot out his palm and demanded the axe. He'd chop it down himself. When the girl, calling him a carpenter, asked if he'd cut a tree for furniture with them, fury snapped and he grabbed the axe. Thuds tore through the forest as Tok hammered the instrument dead center, the couple staring from the sidelines. He swung the axe with laser focus, every strike proving he'd done this before. His friends gaped, mouths open, as the tree shuddered. He slammed his hand onto the felled trunk and shoved, and they craned their necks as the whole trunk thudded to the ground, intact. The girl lauded Tok, saying he'd done great. Aldo chimed in, amazed at how quickly he'd cut it down, and Tok exhaled, pride simmering behind a suddenly serious face. He wouldn't have become a carpenter if he didn't know how to do it. He dared ask Aldo if a former adventurer wouldn't find it simple, and Aldo shot back that it was not at all. He confessed he'd snapped up every piece of furniture in the city, so when he felled the tree, Aldo froze. He didn't even know what to do with it. Tok snapped that to become a carpenter, he has to scout out and fell trees fit for furniture, and sometimes even raise them from saplings, depending on the case. But he reckons the city worker probably couldn't learn it. Karun declared that felling trees and carving his own furniture would make for a wonderful, thrilling life. The guy looked away, scratched his cheek with a finger, and then rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. Ask her if she thinks so. She looked up and asked, "What's next?" He said they'd have to fell the tree and leave it to dry for several years. The hero blurted, "Several years?" The girl locked down the timeline and then stared in disbelief. "The tree's already there, but it won't be ready for another 2 years. He barked that you must rip out the insect-made sections and bring every board to the same color and size. Only after that would the tree be fit to become furniture." And Aldo felt it click. Tok was stone-cold serious about his craft, the girl said. That's why the furniture costs a fortune. A little later, they burst into the workshop to pick boards. The girl gave a thoughtful moo and snapped up the exact one she needed. Her eyes flared the moment she spotted the perfect piece. She snatched a blackboard and declared they'd turn this one into the real thing. The wood's sturdy enough to make chairs and tables. Aldo's grin split his face as he shot. "Not a bad board, huh?" Tokay jumped in, asking if they'd make the bulletin board from the same material. She shoved the board into his hands. "Hold it!" Tok blinked at her. Aloth asked if something was wrong, and the guy ran his palm over the wood, declaring it still wet and snapping. "You need to dry it with steam." When they asked again if steam would dry them, Tok snapped that steam would only make them wetter. They weren't wet from water, but from juice, and they'd be able to vaporize that juice. Karun zeroed in on steam drying and declared she could generate heat, conjure water, and unleash pressure. Tok gasped, "That's for sure," and demanded how the magic worked and how long it would take to dry. The girl warned it would take quite a while, but said stacking all the boards together should speed the process. They hauled the boards outside and stacked them in offset piles with tiny gaps so they never touched. When everything was ready, Toke asked if it was okay, and the girl stood nearby clutching a magic wand. He snapped that it was fine. Raise it a notch and it'll be far easier to crank up the heat. Magic surged from her staff. She launched a spell, forcing fire and water to obey and fold into one, eyes shut as every ounce of concentration pulsed through her. She unleashed several massive elemental whirlwinds from her staff, blasting into the boards before her. When they slammed together, they swallowed the wood in a churning cloak, steam hissing off them. She kept the spell humming and asked the guy roughly how many to dry. He jabbed a finger at the board and barked. "When those cracks are twice as large, we can finish." She blurted, "Is it normal for them to crack like that?" And he grinned, saying the cracks actually announce the tree's readiness. They only form along the board's edges, so everything's fine. The tree began to splinter slowly. Then the cracks suddenly gaped wide. The guy whooped. "Great! That's enough!" He told her to ease her temperature down slowly. Steam exploded from the boards, billowing into the sky, and Toke ripped the top plank free, snatching it into his hands. He slammed his fist into the wood. A flawless, instinctive move only a first-class adventurer could pull off. The girl, awkward and stammering, said he told her what to do, so she obeyed. Aisha waved like a flare. Flora cradled a basket as they strode toward the trio, and the guys whipped around. Aisha strode toward them, waving, and one friend gasped, "Flora and Aisha!" Flora announced they'd brought food, and Karun leapt with joy, exclaiming it was amazing. She was ravenous after the sorcery. Tok shot the girl a bored, icy look and demanded why she'd come. Aisha snapped, "Shut up, this isn't your business." And Flora declared she'd helped pick her dress for the harvest festival. A little later in this workshop, Tok hunched over the table, sketching into his notebook and lost in thought, while 4 other guys filled the doorway, watching him without a sound. Karuni burst out first, gushing that Toka was unbelievable. He felled a tree in a heartbeat, and Aisha curled a skeptical smile and shot back, asking if chopping down a tree really struck them as impressive. Karuna forced a crooked smile, clapped a hand over her mouth and said they couldn't cope with this task, while Aisha stared at them, bewilderment flashing across her face. The girl sighed, pointing out he was the same age as her, and already crafting with his hands and trading, actually doing useful things. Aldo confirmed it. When he searched for a place to live and asked about the carpenter, the whole village talked about him and trusted him. Aisha's doubt collapsed. She believed him, but wouldn't admit it or praise him, so she snapped a curt, "Could be." All eyes snapped to him as they called, "Is it time for you to take a break?" He assured them he understood and begged for a moment to finish one thing before he could finally rest. Flora and Aldo spun on their heels and strode away, leaving the 2 girls alone as they kept their eyes glued forward while the man ahead sat with his back to them, buried in his work. Admiration lit Karuna's eyes as Karun praised his devotion to his work as utterly wonderful, while Aisha stood at his side, watching with a stone-cold, impassive face. She wore an indifferent mask as she watched the guy's intense profile at work. Then in a heartbeat the mask shattered and her eyes flooded with adoration. Her admiring gaze waned, but a bright spark still danced in her eyes as she sipped, tea trickling down past her lips. The couple shot worried looks at her as Flora asked if she was okay, and at her friend's question Aisha spluttered, choking on her tea. She slapped at the tea dripping from her chin, gave a shaky yes, then pivoted to the harvest festival and nervously asked who would be the main princess. Her face flamed as she kept rubbing at it, mortified. Karun snickered softly at her. Aldo fixed Flora with a questioning stare, utterly lost. Karun practically swooned, eyes shining. Only 3 days until the festival. A harvest festival wedding is pure, heart-melting romance. It's her first harvest festival, so she has no clue how wild the fun can be. Someone urged Ard to join the festival as a hunter, but he immediately snapped that he'd be busy. Flora beamed that the sweets she'd prepared for Karun would be finished there. Karun and Aldo froze at once, horror crashing over them as they realized they weren't finished. The guys at the table roared with laughter and shouted over each other. Behind the open doors, Toke hunched over his work, hammering away. Aisha's cheeks flamed as she sat with her back to the guy. Karun giggled softly while nibbling the sweets. On stage, the man roared that, thanks to everyone's help, they'd pulled off an incredible harvest festival this year. The tents hold anything you can imagine. Jump in and have the time of your life today. He kicked things off by calling for a new gate where brides and grooms would stand to have luck poured over them. Flora and Aldred stood in wedding finery as the crowd roared blessings and thanks, shouting for a bountiful harvest. Sharp-witted Karina, Ina, Karuna, and Aisha in the crowd, dresses swirling, clapped with beaming faces, while Flora and Aldred, both in their wedding dresses, locked eyes and burst into delighted laughter. The crowd erupted in thunderous congratulations for the three couples, shouting blessings of fertility, and one voice from the throng bellowed, "Seal your alliance now!" The rest of the residents echoed the wish, shot questioning glances at the people, and snapped their attention to the commotion erupting on the sidelines. Beside them, a couple were locked in a kiss as the crowd shouted. Aldo spun, surprise widening his eyes, and turned to Flora, who stood before him with her hands pressed over her eyes. Aldo's hands trembled as he lifted the wedding veil, his cheeks burning crimson. When it slipped away, Flora's eyes stayed shut, and her lips pushed forward in a hopeful pucker, waiting for a kiss. He edged closer and sealed a kiss as the crowd exploded in cheers. Flora's father proclaimed that with these couples united, the sun would now shine on them all, thanked everyone for their support, and behind him, Aldo and Flora stood with cheeks blazing from embarrassment. When the stage ceremony ended, the couple wove through the buzzing festival, and Flora's mom gushed about how great it was that they'd decided to come. The woman beamed, declared they were doing well and that it was time for gifts. Karina, standing with the other girls, hoisted her basket of treats and cried, "The sweets are here!" A sea of festival-goers swarmed between the stalls as a pair of newlyweds strode up front with baskets swinging from their hands, the other girls trailing close behind. Flora jabbed a finger at the maze of tents and grinned at Aldo. "Did you know they're split into sectors, each one representing something different?" She pointed to a tent. The winemakers were there. The cheesemakers camped on the opposite side. Aisha tore her gaze away. Karun zeroed in on the girl and urged they circle around each one. Flora nodded in agreement. The friends surged toward the winemaker's tent, huge barrels bulging with fresh grapes and wine bottles gleaming nearby as villagers shoved baskets of treats into the couple's arms, and they raced off to the cheesemaker's tent. Vendors thrust a basket of treats into their hands. Tables brimmed with cheeses to sample. So Aldo and Flora each snagged a slice. Then they split up, slipping into different tents to explore. He pleaded for forgiveness. A friend who recognized him shouted his name, and Toke strode up, declared it a blessed harvest day, and asked to thank them for joining the holiday, while the couple thanked everyone for their gifts, until those lingering at the sidelines turned back. Aisha froze, confused, when the guy sneered. "What kind of horse outfit is that?" The girl snapped. "What? Did you think he wasn't? He always wears dirty rags." They glared at each other like duelists about to draw. I held my tongue and didn't call out to her sister while Karina and Karune lingered on the sidelines. The couple had slid back into their old explosive routine, but he still threw up a dismissive wave, telling everyone to leave. Karune speared a bite on her fork, slid it into her mouth, and gushed about how tender the meat was. Lauren laughed, asked if it was really his signature recipe, and demanded she eat faster. Lauren whooped. He'd snared a rare beast. Its meat was a touch tough, so he planned to glaze it with fruit and honey. The cut was superb, and he still couldn't believe he'd hauled in something like this. Karina zeroed in on the man and barked at the master. "Is he hurt?" The man shot back a denial, insisting he'd only nicked himself. He roared he'd warned them out. Someone shot back he'd say the same. Karina declared Aldo her master. The furious man demanded answers again as everyone else burst into laughter. Flora's mom strode in front of the couple, eyed the crowd, and declared they'd greeted everyone. Aldo shot back. "Yes." She apologized and urged them to head back. The bride and groom needed their first night rest. When they'd finished circling the tents, she had to shepherd them back. Aljo snapped, frustrated, that that's how it was, while Karina, trailing behind, tore into a chunk of meat and gushed over how delicious it was. Flora thrust the basket forward and declared they could take it before they left. Karun, stunned, blurted out what it was for. Flora grinned and admitted she owed them a favor. Aldo thanked everyone for the day. The girls waved and told them to come back next year. Karina ripped open a bag and pulled out a cupcake and cookies. "If you get treats from a couple blessed on the day of the great harvest, you'll be lucky." Karune mocked the unmarried girls with razor-sharp sarcasm, lashing back at every word. Aisha stared at the bag, sure whoever claimed it would be blessed. And when Toke sprang to mind, her cheeks burned as she snapped a denial and put on a show of disgust. They climbed the hill away from the festival when Flora suddenly faltered. Aldo yanked her steady, demanding if she was wearing a strand. She blinked, confused, and said her foot had snagged on her dress. After one long look, he scooped her into his arms. She blinked, bewildered, asked if she was heavy, and he burst into laughter, saying she wasn't. At last they were home. He still cradled her in his arms, and once inside, he finally lowered her to the floor. She beamed, thanked him. They laughed. Then Flora called Aldo, and he looked right at her. She clung to him, eyes shut, voice shaking as she cried she was insanely happy. His face burned with embarrassment. Then he hugged her back, murmured "me too," cupped her cheek and kissed her. They tore apart. He ducked like lightning and slipped under the wedding dress, the girl catching him off guard. She looked down in mortified embarrassment and screamed, begging him to at least let her take the dress off.